which I think are what make us really happy. I'm always interested in brands and service businesses which like benchmark or even under benchmark on 10 conventional dimensions and then massively over index on one. Have you ever stayed at a Moxie Hotel?
No.
It's a category of hotel which is called something like boutique. I don't know, what is it premium? It's like premium economy. Okay. But what the Moxie Hotel chain is, they're generally in very good locations. So they're not in an industrial estate, outskirts or whatever. Okay? So the one in Manchester is in a really good location in Manchester. And the one I've stayed in about 3. They're well located. So that's the first thing. The rooms are really small. There's no room service. There's no laundry service. I think you can borrow an iron. Or there might be a laundry room. The rooms are pretty small. There's very good flat screen TV. There's good Wi-Fi. There's no cupboard. You just hang your clothes on the wall. Very, very basic room. Mm-hmm. And what totally sets it apart is the ground floor is basically coffee shop, restaurant, bar, which runs 24 hours a day. You can come down at 3 o'clock in the morning and say, I want a flat white. I just had an operation. I was in Lausanne, I had to have an eye operation. So I was heavily sedated and actually wandered downstairs in my underpants at 3 in the morning under the influence of fentanyl or something and asked for a coffee, which my wife was absolutely mortified about. And also you check in, okay, and you turn up, you check in at the bar. There's not one of those weird check-in desks. There's no weird concierge person, the function of which I've never fully understood, okay. Check in just at the bar, and they go, would you like our signature cocktail? And they give you a cocktail, which is usually fantastic. And the great thing about that whole ground floor is imagining that it's a bit weird. It's got like 8-foot teddy bears and weird things dotted around the place. But the great thing is you can basically just hang out there all day. They'll bring you food, they'll bring you drinks, they'll bring you very, very good coffee. And actually, to be honest, yeah, after you've checked out, okay, normally after you've checked out of a hotel, you feel kind of homeless. Yeah. After you've checked out of that place, they'd be totally chill for you to stay there for another 5 hours, using the loos. And if you imagine something like a weirder version of a WeWork, the whole ground floor is like that. And it's a brilliant thing because what you do, it's a great marketing trick, is you focus people on the one thing where you're amazing, and then downplay everything else. And what they remember is the amazing thing. I talked to somebody who ran a hotel in London, which they said, we haven't got room for a really good kitchen. And so our food's, it's okay, nothing wrong with our food, but we can't produce really exciting food. So here's what we do. We don't talk about the food. We don't raise any expectation about the food. Instead, what we do is we have like London's best mixologists, and we talk about the drink, and we make amazing cocktails, and they're incredible. And while people are focused on the cocktails, they order some chicken wings, and chicken wings are perfectly good. Nobody complains about them. I'm not saying you can get away with being crap. You've got to hit the basic threshold, okay, across things. But you can play these really interesting games where you just do one thing amazingly, and everything else is pretty basic. And actually, what's interesting about that, judging by the expansion, it's privately owned Marriott. I think the president of Marriott is still Bill Marriott, actually, would you believe it? So Moxie's one of the many brands under that kind of Marriott aegis. And what's interesting is it seems to be really, really popular. It's expanding really fast. And I wouldn't stay there for, right, okay, the room's a bit small, etc. But if you want to stay in a hotel, in a good place, in a city, for 1 night, 2 nights, maybe 3 nights, okay, it absolutely hits the spot. Because it's really good at the one thing you care about, and everything else is basic, but even at the same time, you get a reasonable price. So I think the psychology of what you might call where you focus as a business is really, really interesting. Is there a way a business can create some peculiar distinguishing feature like the Popsicle helpline? And in order to do so, I think you've just got to be prepared to be silly, and you've also got to be prepared to ignore your finance director who will say, it is not in our service level agreement to provide free ice cream or something like that. I think there's something very interesting about basically building in salience to what you offer, focusing the attention in the right place, surprising them in the area where they're looking, and then just satisfying everywhere else.
You spoke about loss aversion, and it felt like you were talking a little bit about like a recency bias towards the end. So what other biases when it comes to selling and marketing do we have to be aware of that we can lean into to help us sell more, or we can try to combat when it comes to selling?
Weirdly, what's so fascinating about this is that psychology clearly sometimes is a contradictory science. So if you look at Cialdini's principles of influence and persuasion, there's like social proof. Everybody's got one of these. Or everybody, and then there's scarcity, which is not very many people have one of these. If you think about it, there are 2 ways you can sell things. You say, this is so good that very few people can have it, and this is so good that everybody has it. And I think if you look at brands, by the way, the French have been masters of the scarcity thing, and the Americans have historically having a much bigger market. Coca-Cola is the absolute masterpiece of it's great and everybody should be able to have it. It's cool. And historically, the Americans were never very good at luxury brands because there's something fundamentally un-American. This is going back for a long time. They've learned since, obviously. But Americans, I suppose, the opportunity to actually sell to another 100 million people. And it's worth noting that Cadillac in the 1930s was a brand on a par with Rolls-Royce. It was super, super premium brand. And what often happens, I think it happened with Cadillac, is they get tempted to offer a slightly cheaper Cadillac in order to achieve volume sales. And the French have always resisted that, where unsold handbags are actually end up in landfill, but to maintain the scarcity of the thing. I mean, that's a generalisation, but there's a kind of French approach to branding, or the American approach, you know what I mean? And that's in keeping with Cialdini's principles. And so quite often things are undoubtedly only 3 left at this price works. I bought something this morning because it said only 1 left, okay? I might have bought it anyway, but when I saw only 1 left, I had to buy it. That undoubtedly works, to an extraordinary degree. Sometimes, there's sunk cost bias, obviously. I mean, there are an awful lot of... One of the reasons why it's going to be really difficult to unseat Apple, okay, is that people are so invested in the ecosystem. You could produce an Android phone which is better. Some people would even argue that the best Android phones are better now. But you've got your whole ecosystem of the earbuds, and you've got the charging cables and everything else. That's a case of undoubtedly sunk cost bias, which is, I'm in now, in for a penny. A great one, which is sometimes called foot in the door syndrome, which is if you sell people a small thing, it's then easier to sell them a big thing. Actually, you learned a brand that more or less understood all of these principles, whether accidentally or on purpose. Well, I like to say it was on purpose because Ogilvy was quite heavily involved in the creation of it. American Express is a fantastic brand. Everything from the member SIN state on the card. Why does nobody copy that? Okay? Because if you think about it, no one wants to cancel their American Express card, because then if they get another American Express card, it won't say member, mine say member since 95, I think it is. Okay? Mine will then say member since 2024. I don't want that, right? Looks like some Johnny come late. Okay? And it understood the whole scarcity principle. The most famous successful sales letter for American Express, I can't remember who wrote it. It was written by someone in Ogilvy, and it just outperformed everything for years. Started with the letter opened, "Dear Mr. Sutherland, quite frankly, the American Express card is not for everyone." Which is exactly the same as your website, which is why you shouldn't work with us. And it basically said, not everybody wants to pay for a card, da-di-da-di-da. Every single, in that letter, it's an what's interesting is that letter was written long before there was a kind of discipline of behavioural science. It was an instinctively brilliant copywriter who understood every trick in the book. People want to identify as the kind of person who pays for quality, not the kind of person who buys on price, da-da-da-da. They want the fact that the card is exclusive. I think it was Ogilvy who had the idea of putting the member SIN state on. I think that was Ogilvy. What's strange sometimes is, quite often you have a brilliant idea like that member SIN state, because that's a kind of sunk cost bias. I've established this relationship with them. There is a small practical use of the member SIN state on the card, which is sometimes it can be used to detect fraud. Because if you get some 19-year-old comes in and it says member since 92, you can reasonably suspect they've nicked the card, okay, because they weren't born then, right? But basically it's an acknowledgement of the relationship. We did something with British Airways where one thing that provides reassurance to a customer is that I, the customer, know that you know that I am a reasonably valuable customer. So quite a lot of loyalty programs partly work not with the rewards mechanism. It's the second order kind of knowledge that the consumer knows, that the company knows that they're quite a reliable long-term customer with some, therefore, likely future lifetime value whom you wouldn't want to piss off. So one of the things we did with British Airways is it was a very simple change. It cost nothing. But if you get your Avios statement on BA, it gives you your lifetime tier points. Now, if you remember, you can redeem your Avios points, right? Because you might want to go and fly to Dubai for 4 days or whatever, okay? And that sets your Avios points back to 0. Your tier points, which determine your status within the program, they reset to 0 every year. So when you start a year after you've redeemed your Avios and you've got, 20 tier points and you've got, 5,000 Avios left, you're going to have that anxiety that goes, well, as far as BA are concerned, looking at me, I'm just some random tourist. I'm not a serious business traveller, right? I'm just some random backpacker who's been on BA once, right, with his parents, right? Now, once it says lifetime tier points 15,000 or whatever it is, and that's there, it basically says, we know, okay, you're a serious traveller and you've brought us a lot of business in the past, therefore we're disproportionately disinclined to want to piss you off. Right. In other words, you have the feeling, which may be erroneous or accurate, but nonetheless it is a feeling that if there's some massive thunderstorm or whatever, and there's only one seat left on the last flight back from Boise, Idaho, or whatever, they're going to try and get you on the plane, not the random backpacker guy.
Yeah.
And so quite a lot of loyalty programs are actually the consumer signalling their loyalty to the organisation in the presumption of slightly more favourable treatment, or at least the benefit of the doubt. So an example would be, I bought, let me get this right, I actually was a customer of Amazon before it was called Amazon. It's called bookpages.co.uk. Wow. Back in the 90s, sometime in the mid-90s, there was a company called bookpages.co.uk, which is an online bookstore in the UK, which got bought by Amazon. So I'm actually an Amazon UK customer, before there was Amazon.co.uk. So as a consequence, I bought literally thousands of things from them. I mean, it is literally thousands of things. Bear in mind, that's, 28 years, right? And maybe a little less, certainly 25 years. And occasionally, very occasionally, something from Amazon doesn't turn up, and I ring them up or contact them, and they say, don't worry, send me another one. Now, part of the reason they do that is because they can see I've bought a few thousand things, and I've only returned 0.3, or claimed that 0.38% of them have not arrived, so they can basically afford to give me the benefit of the doubt. If I'd never bought anything from Amazon before, and I ordered a massive flat-screen 85-inch TV with 8K, and I said, no, never arrived, okay, they would be, to a great degree, more suspicious, okay, and not unreasonably so, okay, right? And so part of the way in which loyalty programs work, I genuinely think, is that consumers like businesses to know. It's like a pub, okay? Yeah. If you're a regular in the pub, you want to be recognised as a regular. Very weird one, actually. When we were students, this was me being an arsehole, actually. When we were students, the college kitchens were closed every Sunday lunchtime. They didn't open. And so a load of us just got into the ritual of every Sunday we went to Pizza Express. Okay, it was just practically every Sunday in term time. And after we'd been doing this for literally 2.5 years, okay, every Sunday in term time, I kind of went to my friends and said, one thing that slightly pisses me off, okay, if we come here every Sunday, they've never even given us a free garlic bread. They've never acknowledged the fact that we're regulars. Now, the reason I say this was me being an arsehole is, of course, what I didn't realise is they knew perfectly well we're students, right? We're there for 3 years, then we fuck off, they never see us again, okay? Actually, I was there thinking, I'm a stalwart of the local Pizza Express. To be honest, they were right, because why make a fuss of these people? They're only here for a few years, okay? I'm sure if I'd been like a local family, it might have been completely different. But fundamentally, people like their loyalty not only to be rewarded, which is nice, but that all makes sense economically, they like their loyalty or their frequency of custom to be recognised. All transactions to some extent, not quite all, but there's a degree of social exchange alongside the economic exchange. And I think economics, a lot of finance people try and pretend everything's just about the money, and it's never just about the money. There are all these other variables, I said, like trust, for example. Fundamentally, is the person trying to sell you this car, they don't care about the next car, or I think that's probably the most wonderful heuristic for a salesman I've ever come across. What can I do now that makes it absolutely certain that even if they don't buy a car from me right now, or even if I don't sell them the most expensive car they're capable of buying, they're bound to come back to me in 3 years' time when it's time to replace their car. Brilliant thing to think. Fantastic.
Where does status fit into things? I mean, from a standpoint of I want to be seen with the designer brand. How does that work?
Okay, very useful. It's not exhaustive as a list. It's a very useful piece of sort of light neuroscience done, but I think it was first developed by a guy called David Rock, who's a Kiwi neuroscientist who's based in New York, and it's called the SCARF model of things other than financial incentives. Okay, it's things people care deeply about that don't factor in economic models very well. And SCARF is an acronym, and it stands for status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, although I'd say something like reciprocation or something. Relatedness is R, and F is fairness. So fundamentally, one thing every business has to be alert to is, okay, you might be optimizing for short-term economic value, but if you're doing that at the expense of status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness, be really, the Oasis tickets thing is really interesting. The one thing I don't get, the one thing I think was wrong there that really violated fairness was the jump from, was it 135 to 315? Now, to me, it's a bit weird they didn't have an intermediate jump around about the 200 and something pound mark. Because that's the difference between an oh shit and what the fuck. Okay, right, okay, 100 whatever it is, 135 to 240 is, oh shit, right? 315 is, well, here was I planning to go, and now I can't.
Yeah, exactly.
There was a bit, it's really, okay, the arguments about price discrimination, the arguments about differential pricing, yield management pricing, EasyJet pricing, whatever you call it. Oh, God, it's a kind of really interesting discussion area. Broadly speaking, I'm in favour of price discrimination because generally it's overall value maximising. So if you take an example of really clever price discrimination, it's the McDonald's wrap of the day. Okay, so you go into Mucky D's. I actually know someone who was in the room when they came up with that idea, and it is apparently very, very successful. The basic deal is 3 times. What do they have? They have 5 wraps of the day. Was it 4? They recycled, don't they, according to the day of the week? And basically, the deal is that if you want the wrap that is in your preferred flavour, well, 4 times that 5, you pay £1 extra for it. Or if you want to save £1, you sacrifice specificity of flavour, and you save £1 and you get the wrap that they've probably pre-made in advance because they make more of them. It's kind of like a win-win, okay? In other words, the people who are more concerned about flavour than price pay for the flavour. The people who are more concerned about price than flavour, it's the other way around. If you look at that, the guy who's an expert on this, who, by the way, is quite a left-wing economist in some respects, called Robert H. Frank, is a very, very big fan of price discrimination because he thinks it actually delivers, the most value for most people. If you think about cars, when more cash-constrained people buy a car, they're paying for transportation. When richer people are paying for a car, they're paying for status to a degree, or what I call L'Orealism, which is because I'm worth it. And not all status is about showing off to other people. A lot of status is about showing off to yourself. Okay, there's a certain thing we do, which is not really because we're showing off to other people. It's kind of reinforcement of our own identity and self-worth by spending a bit more on things, even if nobody else notices. That's the sort of Versace underpants school. Oh, by the way, do you want the funniest story? I absolutely love this. Talk about underpants. Okay. Which is one of the strangest problems of the rich, okay? Which is Calvin Klein's daughter complained at one point about the disadvantages of being Calvin Klein's daughter with a complaint that I have to admit would never have occurred to me, which is that when you're Calvin Klein's daughter, just at a high point in sexual excitement, when you're getting romantic with a man, you're confronted with your dad's own name in high letters. The rest of us have never had to put up with that. I always thought that was a brilliant observation.
Mark
Sorry. Exactly. Whoa, but it's interesting that what a weird experience that must be. Completely bizarre. But no, the whole thing is, the whole thing about why we buy what we buy, and also what prompts us to buy it. To be honest, I think it's always a bit messy, and there are always multiple reasons going on, from one consumer to another, because people are fundamentally different. But look, the violation of fairness is an interesting one. One thing that really annoys me personally, and I will say this to the rail industry repeatedly, okay, if you buy an advance ticket and you miss your train, okay, they make you buy a full fare ticket. I think they should allow you to put something from the advance ticket towards the full fare ticket. I think what you're doing there is, generally, it is, if you want a bit of moral advice for how not to scandalise customers, anything which profits from another person's predicament is a really bad idea in terms of people morally hating it. There's a wonderful, actually, 1690 pamphlet called Venditio by John Locke, the philosopher John Locke, where it's all about the idea of the just price. And he makes the point that we seem to have a particular moral aversion to profiting from another person's misfortune. And I would argue that if you miss by 10 minutes, you're designated. So actually, Nicola Raihani, who's a very brilliant evolutionary biologist, evolutionary psychologist, wrote to me about this, because coming back from her honeymoon, the train was late getting into Lille, I guess, okay, where she had to change from the Eurostar. And because she'd missed her Eurostar, their tickets that they pre-booked months in advance to come back from their honeymoon were voided, and you had to go and pay 300 and something quid on top. I think that's a shitty thing to do. Okay, okay, I get it legally, you're totally within your entitlement to do that kind of thing. I think that's an arsehole thing to do. The other reason is I don't even think it's good business, because it will put people off travelling by train again. And people who are cash constrained, you're significantly taking advantage of them. Okay? To a point where, that could ruin the next 6 months of their life. Somebody having to shell out 400 quid when they weren't expecting it. Someone who's cash flow constrained, that's an absolute bummer, right? And I think there are certain things where what we ought to do is just... okay, one thing I think is totally shit. So when I retire from advertising, I'd like to be kind of poacher turned gamekeeper. I've always jokingly said I'd quite like to work in like consumer protection, because my experience of working in advertising and marketing for 35 years is actually, it's not very evil. Okay, that doesn't sound like a big thing. No, actually, the instances of people I've seen in marketing and advertising conceiving something that I would regard to be deceptive, morally dubious, unfairly sludgy or manipulative are pretty rare. Most people in marketing are trying to do the right thing by the consumer, for the most part, okay? But there are a few things which I regard as absolutely intolerable. For example, the fact that if you have a recurring subscription payment on a credit card, you can't cancel it through the credit card. That strikes me as just fundamentally wrong, right? You subscribe to something online with a credit card, and now if you subscribe by direct debit online, you can just go to your online bank and go, I don't want to pay that direct debit anymore. That's their problem. They don't get the money anymore. The fact that with a credit card, you have to go to the original person with whom you subscribed, and they make it really difficult for you to cancel. I think that's shit. Now, I think there is legislation coming out in Germany, isn't there, which is called something like the two-click law, that you must be able to cancel any online subscription almost as easily as you signed up in the first place.
Right.
I think there should be legislation where recurring payments appear at the top of your online credit card statement, and if you wish to query one or cancel one, you should be able to cancel it through the... Now, technically, you have to tweak something like the Consumer Credit Act to make that happen. I think that business of basically selling sludgy subscriptions to people, which is you get people in on a free trial, then you start charging them £7 a month, then it's like 6 months before they bloody notice, and then when they try and cancel, it's almost impossible. The reason I really support legislation there, by the way, is that the bad actors in that field are ruining it for everybody else. So you'll have a point soon where nobody... So good actors would probably include, I think, Netflix and Amazon, who make it tolerable. From what I remember, cancelling your Amazon Prime membership or cancelling your Netflix membership is kind of like, it's not absurdly complicated. I think so.
Yeah, I'd say that's
I've got a vague memory. I think I've got that right, okay? But the good actors are being unfairly, basically, they're having their business unfairly destroyed by the bad actors on the simple grounds that you'll end up with millions of consumers going, I don't care who you are, there's no way I'm subscribing to anything, once bitten, twice shy, I'm done with this whole subscription model, and that's problematic for the people who are actually playing fair.
Rory, I feel like we could talk to you all day about sales, psychology, marketing. It's been a brilliant conversation. Typically we ask where people can find you. I feel like if anybody wants to
Twitter,
find you,
I'm at Rory Sutherland, all one word. I like Twitter. I know it's unfashionable to say so, and Elon is, shall we say, divisive, not always helpful. I kind of indulged the bastard on the grounds that practically everybody really remarkable in human history is bloody weird, difficult, pain in the arse, annoying, okay? And that applies to the good people as well as the bad, to be absolutely honest. So that's my take on that. Twitter's a pretty good place to find me. I'm on LinkedIn, where you can follow me, thankfully, because I ran out of connections or something. I'm at Ogilvy, where we have a behavioural science practice. But finally, I also run a course, who doesn't, but it's an online course called Mad Masters. If you look for madmasters.co.uk, there's a whole sort of series of 10 one-hour-long courses, combined with, I do live surgeries every 2 weeks. So if you're on the course, you also get live access to ask your own questions. And that's madmasters.co.uk.
Nice.
And all I can say is the people who've done it seem to love it.
Good.
And I get weird kind of fanboys going, thanks to something you said, I managed to solve a weird problem that I didn't realise I could solve, or I managed to solve a weird problem in a way that was much, much easier than we assumed, because we realised it was a psychological problem, not a technological one.
Nice. Well, we'll include all the links. And then what do the next, I guess, 10 years look like for you?
Oh, bloody hell. I don't know. I'm very committed to Ogilvy because I think the behavioural science practice is really important as a next stage in the development of advertising. So I want to continue that connection also because I think you can only you can only really teach if you also practice. That's not quite true. I think after you've stopped or after you've retired, you can teach for 2 or 3 years, but actually the two are intimately connected. You know, I think you kind of run out of material if you stop actually doing it and exclusively talk about it. There is a sort of weird documentary film being made about me for one of the streaming services. What I would like to do is, if I can just continue beating the drum to the extent that every time you have a problem that involves some form of human perception or behaviour, look to tweak the variable that's easiest to tweak, that has the biggest effect. Very often, the variable you need to tweak is the perceptual one or the psychological one, not the technological one. As I said, don't make trains faster, make train journeys more productive, more enjoyable, more valuable. You know, that's where what you might call metrics benchmarking and fixating on standard metrics of comparison actually kind of makes us all dumb, because we end up over-optimizing for things that consumers have stopped caring. I don't genuinely give a shit whether it takes me 2 hours to get to Manchester or 1, right? Okay. I would give a shit if it took 4 hours, right? Okay, you can't get to Manchester for the day. That's after 4 hours on a train, you can start to get a bit bored, you know, da-da-da-da-dum. There are lots of reasons why you don't want to take 4 hours. Yeah, okay, get it down to an hour and a half, that'll be kind of cute. Beyond that point, to be honest, once I've gone to the hassle of catching a train, I kind of want my rewarding hour and a half of sitting on my arse, okay? I think you couldn't make that journey too fast, to be absolutely honest. So my point is that actually most problems now are multivariate. There are lots of variables you can tweak. Generally, the reasons I don't understand, both organisations, institutions and governments, and particularly economists are guilty of this, tend to focus on those variables which are most expensive to change. And the vital thing, I think, the great thing about psychology is there are butterfly effects. You can literally add 3 words to a sentence, okay, and you can change everything. I mean, there's a story told about Charles Saatchi, and I don't think it's true. I think it's completely apocryphal. It might be true, that there was some beggar sitting outside Saatchi, and it just said, "I'm hungry." And that Charles Saatchi wrote underneath, "I'm hungry," on his board, "I'm hungry, and it's spring." Okay, and that the donations to the beggar went up by a factor of 2, or whatever it was. Okay, to be honest, I'm not certain that's entirely apocryphal, but it nonetheless makes my point. You know, there are literally occasions where you can tweak something to a tiny degree and just have a transformative effect in how people react to it emotionally. There's a nice example which I can end on, actually, which is someone, I'm not sure whether they thought it was a good idea or whether they thought it was just marketing bullshit, but they were at Changi Airport in Singapore, and their flight was listed. It was leaving 30 minutes after the scheduled time. The flight was listed not as delayed, but as retimed. And there are 2 ways of looking at this, which is, what a load of marketing bullshit. You're trying to escape the blame for a delay by referring to it as retimed. Okay, what a load of crap. And that's one interpretation. But I responded with a more benign interpretation, which is, hold on a second. So you could look at that and say it's a very generous thing to do. Let me explain. Because 20% of the people waiting for that flight, on average, are shit scared of flying. A lot of people are. Either of you? No. And there's a percentage of the population who genuinely are shit scared of flying. Okay? If you put delayed, retimed looks like it's a logistical thing. It's to do with schedules, pushback dates, runway slots, whatever. We've made a conscious decision to actually reschedule this flight. Delayed is going to make that 20% of scared people think, oh, they probably noticed one of the ailerons is missing, or that the engine's going to catch fire. And then they'll go into a fear spiral of what else does this mean? Because I imagine, I'm not a nervous flyer. It's a terrible admission, and I've confessed this once before. In the early days, when you could actually download Sky programs from Sky Go to your laptop, when I used to fly, I used to just take all the things I'd recorded on Sky and watch them in the air on what was something like a 15, 17-inch Apple MacBook at the time. And I used to sit on the plane, sitting with this bloody great screen. I used to watch Air Crash Investigation. And when I told I realised after I'd done this a couple of times, it was probably insensitive, when I told my wife and children, Dad, I cannot fucking believe it. Okay, so there are a lot of people behind you who are shit scared of flying, and they're looking over my shoulder and seeing like footage of the wreckage strewn across a Japanese mountainside, or burning debris, and whatever, or the or basically the recreation of a plane flying upside down. Anyway, that was my terrible confession of total crass insensitivity, for which, if anybody was on one of those flights, I really apologise, and it was astoundingly insensitive of me. But if you're frightened to fly, I imagine that every time it's delayed, you go into that mindset of imagine the worst. What's the worst that can happen? And you don't go, oh, they probably rescheduled this because of changing departure slots or whatever. Okay, or the crew are late. They're all go, oh my god, it's just the beginning of they've discovered this problem and then they're not going to fix the problem. And so actually, retimed might be a really nice thing to say. I think that might be a really, really good idea.
I love it. Rory, thank you so much for joining us. You've been absolutely incredible today. Thank you.
What a joy. No, it's absolutely delightful. Really, really super.
Beautiful.
What a lovely place. This has been an absolute joy.
Oh, thank you, Rory. So talking about lockdown, how effective do you think companies will be at dragging people back into the office?
It's interesting, actually, because in the UK, for whatever reason, there are exceptions. If you go to tech companies, there's tumbleweed. Companies which are very strongly kind of tech engineering driven still seem to be very empty. what I know best is the ad industry, and actually they're generally a fairly gregarious bunch. And I think it's returned to a pretty acceptable kind of equilibrium. And by the way, personally, I don't want to see people in the office 5 days a week, because everybody who's engaged in some sort of part of the knowledge economy, 20 to 40% of your working week is going to be stuff where you just need to truckle down, choose your own environment, and get on with it. And you're much more likely to be more productive if you have some degree of discretion over where and when you work for those tasks that you perform on your own. But there is this value of what you might call serendipity, coaching, for example, co-creation, collaboration, which I think still requires some degree of co-location. It helps to have people in the same place at the same time for all kinds of reasons. However, what's weird is that the level of absenteeism, if you want, I don't want to call it that, but you know what I mean, okay, is much, much higher in the US and Canada than it is in the UK. Now,
What's sick leave?
Well, some of it's probably geographical, in the simple sense that there are people who've moved. In other words, it's difficult in the UK to move so far away from the office that you can't come in for 1 or 2 days a week. You have to choose an island somewhere, or go to Scotland. In the US, there does seem to have been a sort of widespread dispersion of people to a distance away from their place of work, where it's a flight away, not a train ride away. But it's absolutely not what I would have predicted, because if anything, the US had a very strong culture of presenteeism, of people effectively getting in early, staying late, being absolutely desperate to show their face. And the office occupancy rates are much, much lower in the US and Canada than they are in Europe or the UK.
One of our mutual friends has a team that works remotely around the world, so they speak to each other on Slack, but they don't see each other in the office.
Yeah.
And as part of a team building exercise, I think every so often they bring people together. And he thought this would be brilliant, everyone's going to get to know each other, everyone's going to become friends, it's going to bond the team together so much. The week after they had this in-person meetup, separately, 3 people asked for a pay rise, because they all got together and had a beer. And we're like, so what do you want? Hang on a second. I was told because you don't have that kind of non-critical conversation if you're just dealing with people on Slack. Right, first off, there's a digital record of it. Maybe someone's able to check, I don't know. Can the admin check Slack? Maybe they can, I don't know. And secondly, it's like, we're just here to do the job. This isn't sort of play around time outside of work. And do you really text the other marketing guy or whatever after work about stuff to do with it? Probably not. So there is, from a totally Machiavellian totalitarian state organization point of view, there is an argument to be made.
Divide and rule. Silo
off, compartmentalize the staff, and then they never know if one of them's managed to negotiate a pay rise and the rest of them haven't.
That reminds me of an agency back in the 1990s who sent their staff on assertiveness training, and they all came back and half of them resigned.
Oh, God. Be careful the skills. Be careful the skills that you get to the staff.
Be careful what you wish for.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting, by the way, because one thing that's disappointed me is I expected to see much, much greater levels of investment in really interesting remote working hardware. And by which I mean really, really good tech at home. There is a project apparently in the works called Google Starline, which is a kind of 3D video conferencing, which there's a team at Google probably still working on, I hope so. But don't forget, you have a problem now in that offices have mostly shrunk their footprint. They still aren't kitted out for the frequency of video calls. In other words, the number of private pods in an office is too few, the number of meeting rooms is probably too many. So there's a whole architectural problem to be addressed in terms of how, because if I had a day with mostly video calls, I'd want to do it at home because it's easier to do that. Than it is to try and find the right conditions in an office. The other point I make is that there are a lot of things where it's very difficult to sell people on the new behaviour, but once they've experienced the new behaviour, the old behaviour seems ridiculous. An example I always gave of that is nobody minded buying CDs when it was the only way you could listen to music. Okay, you just accept it. Okay, I don't really want to buy a whole album, I just want to buy a track, but it's just what you do if you buy music. Then you had downloads, and of course the music industry resisted this furiously, the whole idea of downloading. Even to the point of not making it possible for people to download things legally. And the problem there is, once you'd experienced downloads, the CD seemed suddenly ridiculous. And to some extent, we didn't mind commuting in the same way when we just thought this is just a necessary part of
work is the place you go to.
It's just work is the place you go to. It's Wednesday, it's Friday, so I go into the office. That's the deal.
Okay. I summon. Synchro summon. Stardust Dragon. Let me see the animation for this. Take flight, Stardust Dragon. Damn. Stardust Dragon. Attack his life points directly. This will end you. That point.
time you spent on the train, the time you spent cleaning your teeth and getting up early and doing your ablutions didn't feel like a waste of time. Okay, because it was just what you had to do. The second you've experienced the alternative, which is get out of bed, put a cardigan over your pajamas and click join meeting, all of that kind of palaver suddenly seems twice as painful. And I got one of those fantastic cooker taps that produces boiling water on demand. And it was difficult to persuade my wife to get one. But once you have one of those things, waiting for a kettle to boil feels somehow weirdly Victorian.
Prehistoric,
Ridiculous.
yeah.
And so technology often works that way, that actually, interesting with electric cars, for example, the latest data seems to suggest that although there's a huge amount of resistance to electric cars, the people who make the move generally don't go back. Once you've kind of gone over that first initial hurdle of adoption, you don't revert.
What does that suggest from a sort of consumer behavior standpoint then, that there is a kind of price that needs to be paid up front? It kind of makes me think that the first movers within that industry don't necessarily have the best advantage, because they presumably need to pay the most money in terms of marketing
Exactly, yeah.
to break not only somebody into their brand, but break them into an entire new ecosystem of vehicle.
Quite often, early technology is probably driven by status seeking rather than utility. So if you think about early adopters of cars, which were unreliable and expensive, the motivation was either novelty or showing off rather than utility.
Apple Vision Pro, as the 2024
Apple Vision
example.
Pro would be exactly the point. I would argue that, you want to be the one person in your street who has that thing. And actually, those early adopters do, in a weird way, pay a price. But there's an argument, by the way, which is that this also happens in nature, which is the argument that birds, dinosaurs, conceivably, evolved plumage and wings for sexual display purposes, not as a mode of transportation. So in other words, they did this thing as it was a peacock's tail, but it was on the sides rather than on the back. Okay, and you could display your feathers as a proof of your health and magnificence. And then, so this effectively evolved as a status signaling mechanism, and then was parlayed into a mode of transportation because the wings became big enough to enable them to be used.
It's a massive phallic appendage in one form or another that they can then fly with.
So you might argue that that's true of things. I mean, I've always wondered about technologies like the typewriter, where I can't really see. Okay, there's an advantage in legibility over handwriting, but for a period of about 40 or 50 years, people would write a note. This is how it worked in business. I'm not making this up. Okay, in the 70s in Ogilvy, there was a typing pool, which was a lot of people who you would hand them a handwritten note, and they'd type it up so that you could then send it on to your client. And then typically there was always a mistake, so you then had to send it back and have it typed. There were no word processors then, so the whole thing had to start all over again from scratch. And the question you've got to ask there is, was that simply because you weren't a serious business unless you sent typewritten communication?
Signaling.
In other words, if you're, you couldn't, as a solicitor's firm or as a, Unilever or whatever, you couldn't send handwritten notes because it simply looked unprofessional, so everything had to be typed. Now, there may have been something to do with carbon paper and copying, which had some particular role, which made typing desirable. But it's an interesting question because there's not no one could really consider that typing added to productivity. Quite the opposite. It meant that every communication producing anything was painful. The only benefit it may have had is it kept the volume of communication low.
Because it's so effortful.
Well, because it was so effortful. Whereas email, the cost of actually sending an email to 100 people is far too low.
Yes.
Because then the burden of both filtering and prioritizing falls on the recipient, not on the sender.
Yeah.
It's a terrible. I mean, it does amuse me which is there's this hostility to flexible working, which is partly driven by the suspicion that people might be enjoying it. Now, okay, so it's not really to do with productivity, but there are people. I mean, someone in my company I won't name was driven practically insane by the fact that the Netflix CEO revealed that there was a spike in Netflix viewing between 12 and 1 in many countries, lunchtime. Now, first of all, it's lunchtime. Okay, it's accepted that people have a break. If they want to chill out by having a sandwich in front of Netflix rather than wandering around to Pret, it doesn't bother me personally. But also, I would argue that a lot of people would be much more productive in work if they started work early, took a 3-hour break in the middle of the day, and then worked later. Now, commuting makes that impossible to do, but I would argue that your energy levels would be much better managed if you did take a break in the middle of the day, with the additional bonus that you'd actually get a bit of sunlight.
Yeah, you can maybe pick the kids up at the end of that.
If you're a Scandi, okay, in the winter, you go to work in the dark, you come home in the dark. So effectively, your exposure to natural light is Saturday and Sunday for 3 or 4 hours. So that doesn't bother me. The fact that people are actually choosing. If you look at writers, the people who are professional writers, journalists, novelists, they're very different, by the way. But all of them have sort of conditions under which they can and can't write, and they vary. Some people demand complete silence. Some people go to a cafe because they want some background noise. But what these people clearly know is that they can optimize their productivity by controlling the conditions in which they write. And it strikes me as pretty plausible that's true for other forms of knowledge work, where some people can't work if there's any background noise or chatter. Other people can't work in complete silence because it spooks them out. I've known writers who, if there's someone operating an electric drill 7 houses down, they're incapable of producing anything. There are other people who are spectacularly disciplined. Now, it does strike me that you will make people more productive if you allow them some degree of autonomy to control the environment in which they produce their work. And now, I'm not suggesting that's 5 days a week, but I'm suggesting it seems to be implausible that giving people some degree of autonomy won't have benefits. But the interesting thing is, if you look at business, we've imposed loads of things on people: open plan offices, email, Slack, Teams, etc., without any real investigation of the effect it has on productivity. But we don't really care because the staff don't really enjoy that, so we don't have to worry about it. But the second you have an experiment where the workforce seem to welcome it, suddenly
That would
everybody
degree of
goes, oh
suspicion.
my God, they've gone to Sainsbury's on Thursday lunchtime. Well, they're going to have to go to Sainsbury's at some time anyway,
Yeah.
okay? Yes, okay, they're doing it during daylight when the store's quiet. Well, if they're working at 9 till 10, which they can do because they don't have to get up at 7 o'clock in the morning, who cares, okay?
Yeah. What do you mean when you say that we're too impatient to be intelligent?
Oh, that's simply a question which is, I think it's a wider question. So, I mean, email, which I mentioned earlier, is an interesting case in point in that it was assumed that there could be no finer form of communication other than immediate and free. And we automatically assume that faster is better. And one of the questions I raised, which I still think is a serious question, by the way, is do we need slow AI? Do we need slow Tinder? Do we need slow Rightmove? Let me explain just what I mean by this, which is that in most processes of search, if you look at consumers, what they do is they refine their preferences according to what they find out there. So they go into the property market, the dating market, the holiday market, and they have a set list of preferences to begin with. If you talk to any real estate agent, most people who deal with a human real estate agent end up buying or renting a property which meets remarkably few, if any, of their initial criteria. That's probably true of the people marry as well, I would guess. That if you ask someone effectively to write down, put it very simply, we think we know what we want, but we don't, is probably the simplest way in which, and the way we discover what we want is by a kind of exploratory process of discovery where we explore the market and what's available and what they cost and what we experience when having a look at a particular house or person, then refines our preferences. And so this, what you might call the right move approach to decision making, which is define what you like, we give it to you, you buy one of those, okay, looks to us as if it's a perfectly sensible and efficient way of choosing a house. But actually, we don't see what we don't see. Actually, talking to someone this morning, I better not give away who they are, who discovered that Rightmove, there are areas of London which are holes. In other words, they don't fall into any predefined area on Rightmove. And property prices in those areas are disproportionately low because you can't search for any property that's in that area. It might be if you're looking for a much bigger area. But in other words, they're not in Kensington, they're not in Notting Hill.
Yep.
In other words, they're these weird little islands of undefined location where you can actually find disproportionately cheap property because Rightmove is
Search
kind of
volume
blind
so
to their
low.
existence.
Wow.
You also have the problem, which is you can't sell a property apparently now for £850,000. Your estate agent or anybody else will tell you, no, you've got to make it say 810 or 890. Okay, that's fine. And the reason is that people search for property either 900,000 and down or 800,000 and up. And two things happen. One, they're less likely to find you at all because you're further away from their searching point. Secondly, if they do find you, the people who are searching 900 and down are a bit disquieted because they think you're too cheap, and the people who are searching 800 and up think you're a bit too expensive. So the extent to which what seems like a completely rational filtration process in online searching activity or decision making may be deeply flawed because it doesn't reflect the way in which we make decisions in the real world, which is we recalibrate what we want according to what we find.
We'll get back to talking to Rory in 1 minute, but first I need to tell you about Element. For the last 3 years, I've started every morning with Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink mix with everything that you need, nothing that you don't. Each grab-and-go stick contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio of sodium, potassium, and magnesium with no coloring, no artificial ingredients, or any other junk. Proper hydration isn't just about getting sufficient water in you, it's about having the right number of electrolytes to use the fluids that are inside of your body. You might not be tired, you might not need more caffeine, you might just be dehydrated, and proper hydration requires electrolytes. Best of all, they have a no questions asked refund policy with an unlimited duration, so you can buy it and try it for as long as you want, and if you do not like it for any reason, they'll give you your money back, and you don't even need to return the box. That's how confident they are that you love it. This thing tastes phenomenal. It's like a sweet, salty, orangey nectar first thing in the morning, and I love it, and that's why I've used it for probably 1,000 days now. Right now, you can get a free sample pack of all 8 flavors with your first box by going to the link in the description below or heading to drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom. That's drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom. What was that parable of 3 men getting onto an airplane?
Oh, the story at the beginning. No, that's just a story about how, undoubtedly, in all kinds of areas, driven partly by technology, what's urgent crowds out what's important. And it's a joke, it's an old advertising joke told to me by someone who was literally from the Mad Men era, which is you have a copywriter, an art director, and an account man, okay, who are boarding a plane to present work to a client. And they open the overhead locker, and someone implausibly a genie gets out and says, I've been trapped in that overhead locker for years. To thank you all for releasing me, I'll give you each a wish, so you can choose anything you want. And they go to the art director who says, I'd like Picasso's life. You know, I don't mind my life, but I want Picasso's life. The locations, the eye, the artistry, probably the women folk, the romantic life. That's what I really want. And whoosh, the art director disappears. And then the genie turns to the copywriter who goes, it's got to be Hemingway. You know, he enumerates a whole load of reasons why he'd like to be able to write and live like Hemingway, and whoosh, disappears. And then the genie turns to the account man and says, what about your wish? He says, I want those 2 guys back. I've got an important meeting in 2.5 hours. Okay, and there is that element where, and by the way, we could refer to this in everything from things like the shareholder value movement to business quarterly reporting, to the extent to which in advertising, too much money is spent on short-term performance advertising and too little is spent on long-term brand building. And that's not because it's necessarily more valuable, it's because it delivers measurable results faster. So I'll give you a fundamental problem. The FT wrote a very, very good article, specifically about the UK, but I think it applies more widely, which is how did customer service get so bad? Now, the point is, I felt like writing an article for the FT saying, well, if you occasionally acknowledged there was something interesting about business other than their quarterly financial forecasts, maybe the problem wouldn't have happened. If you actually discussed marketing occasionally, or customer experience, or the value of repeat business, if you looked at business from the point of view of what you might call a competition for customers rather than the competition for operational efficiencies and cost cutting, maybe we wouldn't have got into this total shitstorm. Okay, but parking that rant for a moment. What seems obvious, okay, if you spend some money on acquiring customers, you can see whether it's working very quickly, and you can say very confidently, we spent X and the value of the acquired customers was Y. Let's say you want to make a corresponding investment in customer loyalty or customer experience, in other words, ensuring your existing customers have a great experience and so they come back, or dealing with problems very well so that your customers don't leave. Generally, you could perfectly well prove that that was cost effective. And indeed, my hunch would be that money spent there would be more cost-effective in many cases than money spent on acquisition. However, it might take you 5 years to prove the efficacy of what you do, because it's slower. There are businesses which are fast. There are businesses which are slow. There are fast feedback businesses which you learn very quickly. An example, by the way, of very fast feedback business is comedy. You have an instant feedback mechanism from the audience, which basically tells you whether or not a joke is any good and whether you've landed it. And so apparently if you go to small comedy clubs, you'll occasionally be surprised because you're sitting there and there are only sort of 20 tables, and Chris Rock will come in. And effectively, it's all a bit weird, but he's trying out his new material for the next run. Before you go to bigger theatres, you try your material out on a small scale. And that's a fast feedback business. Amazon's a pretty fast feedback business, I would argue, because it has a very high degree of frequency of interaction with customers. Something like banking or insurance is unbelievably slow. I mean, if you're a bank and you piss off a customer, they don't even leave, by the way. They just go inert. Okay? It's not like people go, I'm going to close my current account and I'm going to walk off. They just open another current account somewhere else. Your current account, they don't buy any other products from you. But it's not the same as something like comedy, where you know within seconds whether you've landed something or not. And then there are also things which bother me, which is, there are also things where, I was talking to the guy who founded AO, and they have this lovely little system where when they deliver a washing machine or a dishwasher or whatever, if there are children in the house, because they deliver things themselves, they give the children a little branded bear. Okay? Now, as he said, perfectly right, someone in finance is going to say, okay, what's the cost-benefit analysis? Okay, on that. And his point is, it's impossible. You just have to make a judgment, subjective judgment, that the cost of the bear is trivial and the long-term effect is likely to be quite high.
What's that thing about the Bezos has got when anecdotes disagree with data? Most of the time I trust the anecdote.
Right.
Yeah.
The interesting thing with Bezos is he's got. I mean, this is true of all those people. I mean, the sort of also very true of Elon Musk. They have a very unusual, sometimes highly, seemingly irrational thinking style. Speaking to someone who was very senior early on at Amazon, everybody except Bezos hated the idea of Amazon Prime. They hated the idea of Prime Video. They didn't like the idea of Amazon Web Services. Now, Jeff has an interesting notion, which is what he calls a two-way door. If you talk to people, by the way, at Amazon, it's a very, very interesting, I'm not sure I could cope with it, to be absolutely honest, but it is a very, very interesting culture in terms of its approach to everything from meetings to decision-making. What a two-way door is something where you can walk through the door, and if you don't like what you see, you can walk back. So a one-way door would be deciding to build a sort of 2 million square foot distribution centre north of Memphis. Okay, once you've built that, it's difficult, not impossible, but it's difficult to reverse the decision. There you actually depend on a large degree of decision-making, rigour and rationality, and you need a really rigorous case. But in other cases, Jeff would say it's a two-way door. Try it. If it works, whoop-de-doo, that's great. If it doesn't work, we simply stop doing it. And to be honest, the trial possibly cost less than we would have spent just arguing about it if we were adopting a kind of purist approach. And I think it is important because why I think this is becoming vitally important is most business is probabilistic, but everybody in business wants to prove and pretend that it's deterministic. So every spreadsheet is in some ways an act of pretense, because it's past information which you pretend has wonderful predictive value, as if it's kind of Laplace's demon, but it really doesn't, okay, because weird shit happens out of nowhere all the time. And you have this fundamental problem, I think, where I think what distinguishes someone like Jeff is they're probabilistic thinkers. They just go, well, look, it probably won't work, but if it does, it will be spectacular. And they are in a position where they can take those decisions. In their defense, most people, I think, first of all, most people are promoted within business for their aptitude in solving reductionist, deterministic problems. How do you optimize this particular...
There's a number in the far right-hand column of a spreadsheet somewhere next to a person's name that says, that was green this year. They made
a number. Absolutely right, yeah. And actually, by the way, they probably, in most cases in business, you capture remarkably few of the gains from a bold decision, whereas you capture 100% of the blame if it goes wrong.
Correct, yeah.
So certain decisions which are what you might call, low chance of success, huge return, that's when people leave a business and become an entrepreneur, because they realise that there's no point in actually doing those kind of things within a business, because if things do well, you get a pat on the back and a bonus. If things go badly, you lose your job.
Speaking of things going badly, Jaguar's rebrand. What do you reckon?
Now, I'm in a small minority of people who would argue that before you criticise what someone does, you've got to understand what they're trying to do. And they have been completely forthright about the fact that they expect to lose all but 15% of their customers.
All but 15% of their customers?
Exactly, of their customers, by moving to a much more upmarket, expensive car on an electric platform. And the argument I might make is that normally what they did is anathema to anybody who loves what you might call brand maintenance and brand management. Because, by the way, they didn't change their name. Okay, they didn't call the car Zog. They still call it Jaguar. They still, contrary to rumours, have kept the leaping cat motif, etc. But what they've done is a very, very bold kind of, okay, in a sense, it's, look, bet the farm here. Okay, either we do this, we either succeed, in which case, great, or if we fail, to be honest, we were heading for disaster anyway, because you've got to be slightly careful. This is where, okay, when Dylan went electronic, okay, someone shouted Judas. The crowd in the Manchester Free Trade Hall absolutely hated it. Jaguar purists are going to hate anything. By the way, I've had 6 Jags, by the way, so I'm a loyal Jag enthusiast. I love the brand. And in many ways, I love a lot of the heritage about that brand. But equally, I love red telephone boxes, but I don't think it should be the BT logo. Okay, I love, Giles Gilbert Scott's design for red telephone boxes, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that I don't make many calls from payphones anymore. And I like Burberry Macs, but I'm also cognizant of the fact that because of various things like, central heating and Uber, not many people wear Macintoshes anymore, apart from Americans and flashers, in my experience. I was saying this the other day. Now, there are occasions where you might argue that electrification completely reshapes the competitive landscape for any car brand or any car manufacturer. And that what you have to do is a fairly dramatic pivot. I'm going to join you.
Get that in you.
Yeah, absolutely.
Not enough stimulants in it.
Exactly. There are cases, Kid A, for example, where bands produce an album that kind of alienates their existing fan base. Okay, you might argue that for Jaguar this was a kind of Sergeant Pepper moment. Okay, where we've got, fundamentally we've got to do. Am I right that there was a sort of Pet Sound Sergeant Pepper interplay going on?
Were they on some trajectory toward slow motion irrelevance? Was that where they were going?
Well, the problem with Jaguar is lots of people love the brand, but the people who love the brand didn't necessarily buy Jaguars from new in particular.
Right.
And the new car buyer is a pretty niche audience to begin with. I thought the ad was deeply weird. It wasn't produced by an ad agency, by the way. Someone said it was less a branding exercise than a de-branding exercise. You might make the contrary position, which is that it got millions and millions of people all over the world talking about Jaguar.
Yeah,
which hadn't happened for years. Now, I'm not one of those people, any publicity is good publicity. That emphatically is not true, okay? However, it did signal the fact, and by the way, it's not as if Jaguar hasn't done this before, okay, that a big change was afoot and that something remarkable was going to emerge. And the new car, by the way, which we've only just seen this morning, just for people listening.
I haven't seen it. What is it?
It's highly polarising. It's an extraordinarily bold design. I personally like it. It seems to come in 2 colours, Miami pink and London blue. Okay. And the idea of a pink Jaguar is transgressive. Heretical, exactly.
Yeah. I don't know whether you saw their Twitter was replying to people that were criticising the campaign, whoever it is in the marketing department. They're being very non-apologetic about what they were doing. We don't care about what it was before. This is a new era, etc., etc. Really, no airs or graces about trying to bring along the heritage or the...
Well, bear in mind, they have got an advantage. Now, if you look at it from the mindset of a game theorist, okay, if you're a volume car maker, electrification is goddamn terrifying. It's Clay Christensen and the innovator's dilemma, because you've got this huge sunk cost in both expertise and plant in producing internal combustion engine cars. You have this incredible engineering heritage, which, don't get me wrong, I love that stuff. I love steam trains, okay? I love red telephone boxes. I love driving gloves, E-types, girls from Lucy Clayton being taught how to get in and out of an E-type without showing your pants, okay, which apparently was something that finishing schools taught in the 1960s. All of that heritage is wonderful. But when technology comes in, okay, BlackBerry purists. Okay, this is a kind of rim moment where electrification fundamentally changes what it means to be a great car, because probably reliability, assuming the software doesn't go wonky, is going to be pretty damn good. Okay, now I recently had a bit of an issue where somebody said electric cars are expensive, and I kind of went, well, kind of depends, doesn't it? Because an electric Skoda will be more expensive currently than a petrol Skoda, but in performance and quietness and and what you might call driving dynamics and efficiency, and the electric Skoda is probably more akin to a petrol Audi than it is to a petrol Skoda. And the guy I met, who's the kind of electric car guru at Wired magazine, was asking this very same question, which is, okay, you've got a bunch of engineers, you've got a bunch of, if you think about it, the people who hated Dylan going electronic were folk people. I rather like folk music. It doesn't really exist anymore, does it? Okay, you get the odd little...
So he saw the writing on the wall, but got shouted at for having been ahead of the curve.
Dylan had seen the writing on the wall and decided, okay, and someone shouts Judas at him. I don't believe you, play it fucking loud, as he replies. Yeah. Right, now, you might argue that Jaguar's had a bit of a Dylan moment, which is, look, the things that made us great at Le Mans or in the age of Mike Hawthorne, fundamentally, what the hell is a car in 2030, 2040, when pretty much any car can deliver all the performance and indeed the quietness that a normal driver would hope for? Okay? And the Wired guy asked the question, is it going to be all about interiors? Is it going to be all about design? Is it going to... Because, okay, how do you... A very simple, tough question for Jaguar Land Rover is, we've got Chinese competition. We're never going to kind of undercut them, given labour costs, all the other costs that apply. How on earth do we carve out a niche for ourselves in this new future? Now, for a small car manufacturer and a small volume manufacturer, Jaguar is making about 60,000 a year, okay? They do have one advantage, which is they can completely pivot and start all over again. Whereas a large volume car maker has to manage this incredibly painful transition.
Complex supply chain, etc.
I mean, there's a whole German Mittelstand, which supplies, fan belts and weird bits. All of that goes. Because, I mean, this is one thing, by the way, which I think we ought to say about electric cars, which I think is missed by a lot of people, which is that if you look at a petrol engine, which is, it's a cathedral, it's a magnificent achievement, a really advanced, petrol engine. All of those things that move and rattle and bump and filter things and need to be replaced and the gearbox and what's that, all of those things exist for only one reason, which is to rotate a shaft, to provide forward movement. Okay? Now, I'm Team Faraday here, because the way an electric motor works is you put electricity in, it rotates. Which explains why, with the possible exception of your lawnmower, every single rotating, moving thing in your house uses electricity as the motive power, not petrol. Okay? There is a wonderful advertisement, by the way, which was done, I think it was either Renault. I think it was the Renault, the first electric Renault, which is equivalent to the Nissan Leaf, where they simply showed someone getting up in the morning and what would have been their electric toothbrush was actually powered by a little gasoline engine.
That's very
they shaved and there were sort of fumes coming out of their razor.
That's very good.
Okay, and it made that very simple point that nearly everything else in your life has gone electric. It was only a matter of time before battery technology, driven actually probably by the mobile phone industry, made this possible for the car. I mean, by the way, Henry Ford and Edison worked together on an electric car.
It's interesting, the resistance that people have, especially around vehicles. I guess second to a house, a car is it's a type of identifier. In a way, it's a status symbol. It's probably, in terms of purchasing, it's going to be second largest in terms of your capital expenditure.
You notice, by the way, when you go back up north, that northerners have nicer cars than southerners do.
Why do you think that is?
Their houses are less expensive.
Right. But the price is the same of a Jaguar in Newcastle as a Jaguar in...
You get this extraordinary phenomenon in London, which really depresses me, and I've known people like this, who literally have a £1.2 million house and a £1,000 car.
Fiat Cinquecento or something.
It pains the... I mean, come on. The car is a much greater thing than the house is, looked as a piece of technology, okay? Are you a car fan, or are you one of these weird people who just, like young people, Ubers around the place?
So I have single-handedly kept Uber Liquid in Austin, Texas. But no, I think I said to you last year, I was threatening to get a Camaro, and sure enough I did at the start of this year. Yeah, the only way that I can non-ironically buy an American muscle car is when I live in Texas with an American driving license.
You just need it to fit in.
Correct. Well, yeah, I mean, it's part of the course. If somebody drives an American pickup truck, a Ford Raptor, or whatever the equivalent, a Ranger, I think they call it over here. If somebody drives that over here, you feel like they're cosplaying. If somebody drives it in America, you think, that's cute compared to the Tundra next to you and the six bed, whatever.
There's a Ford F350. I think it might be a 450, isn't there, as well?
It goes all the way up. Dude, in Texas, there's ones where, some guy will happily throw his kid in the back and take him to the park on a Saturday morning, or pull what appears to be an articulated lorry behind him on a Monday morning. Like, very versatile in that way.
One of the things, big motorhome, yeah. That'd be one of my temptations if I moved to Texas.
An RV would be quite nice. One of the things that I've been thinking about since I've been staying here, I'm at the Royal Garden Hotel in Kensington, and on the front door there's maybe 2 or 3 doormen, and it's not so much of at least the places that I tend to stay in America, it doesn't seem to be so much of a trait. Yet over here, it could be replaced, I've heard you talk about this before, it could be replaced with an opening door, it could be replaced with a series of sensors and buttons and switches, but it's not necessarily about that. It's about the experience of the doorman being outside.
Yeah, what you're doing there is the old consulting trick of you define the doorman in terms that make him most amenable to automation. So you basically go function of doorman, opening door, replace the doorman with an infrared automatic door mechanism, lay claim to the savings, but an awful lot of consulting activity. Do you know management consulting firms engage in this thing which is called game sharing? Now, I can't believe that anyone in a company would sign up to this agreement, because it's appalling, where they effectively say, we will effectively define the costs we have saved you, and we want you to pay us a proportion of the cost savings which we identify. But as Roger L. Martin says, any idiot can cut costs. The real skill comes in cutting costs without actually losing long-term revenue as a consequence. And so short-term cost cutting is dangerously easy. This is when I come back to that point of we're too impatient to be intelligent. That intelligence and wisdom is slow, whereas seeming logic is fast. You can seemingly logically replace the doorman with a automatic door opening device. What you're failing to notice is the other tacit and subtle human functions which might be recognition, hailing taxis, also security. Okay, basically, you don't want drunkards sleeping in your entrance to your hotel, and simply maintaining the status of the hotel. That arriving at a hotel, which is notionally a 5-star hotel, and kind of, just being met with an automatic door.
Even if it's a very fancy automatic door.
Americans have come to Americans want a London hotel. Okay, if you take American, or for that matter, Asian tourists, they want London to be a bit Londony with a guy in a top hat. Okay, yep. A friend of mine booked some friends from Los Angeles in the Hempel Hotel, which was, I don't think it exists anymore, it was in Bayswater, but it was kind of like an LA hotel, which was in London W2, and they were gutted, these Los Angelenos, and they were very cool people, right? But they said, if I come to London, I want horse brasses, I want hunting prints. Yeah. Okay, and so there are all these nuances which I think are very, very easy to lose, because costs are quantifiable and instantaneous, and opportunity costs, lost opportunities, lost revenue, that's slow, and it's generally hard to actually quantify. A lovely story about this, which I wrote about actually in The Spectator, but people won't mind hearing it once more, I hope. I'm driving along this dual carriageway in the Welsh borders, and we wanted to buy some milk, and the motorway service station appeared to be closed. all the lights were off. The kind of, the petrol fuel logo was off. The fuel prices were off. It looked, like, as I said, like the Bates Motel. It was completely kind of unlit. My wife said, "Oh, bugger, it's closed. We needed to buy her lacto-free milk because she's convinced she has lactose intolerance." But I said, "No, hold on a second. I remember going there on Christmas Day. I'm sure that a place that opens on Christmas Day wouldn't close at 7 o'clock in the evening. Let's just go in anyway." And sure enough, we find a fully functioning 24-hour store with, I think, might have been a Starbucks or something as well, or a Burger King, and we're the only customers. And it's hardly surprising we're the only customers because everybody else on the road, it looks like the place is closed. So I go to the guy behind the till. I'm a marketing person. You're pissing away revenue here. This is insane. There are, every 10 minutes there are 3 cars driving past going, "Oh shit, you're closed." So I go to the guy behind the till. Why are the lights off on the road? He goes, "Oh yeah, I think we're going on the last shift. I forgot to turn them on." I go, "Okay, turn them." There was no urgency. Now, it occurred to me when I left, and the lights were still off when I left. So that guy had nicked a Lion bar at 2 o'clock in the morning and been picked up on CCTV. There would have been a kind of inquiry. He might have lost his job. There would be extreme disciplinary action. Cost of the Lion bar is about, £1 in lost revenue. Okay, the cost of leaving the lights off is probably, certainly in revenue terms,
£200 an hour,
maybe £1,000 that night.
Yeah.
Could be more. Okay, but sins of omission are much less. Dogs that don't bark in the night are much less easy to identify than sins of commission, and we correspondingly get much less upset by them. And so, what you often end up doing is there are a lot of things like giving a soft toy to someone when you deliver their tumble dryer. Nobody would. Can you imagine a world? I love this world, but I can't really imagine it. Where someone goes, "What? You mean you deliver things to people with kids and you don't give them some branded merch?" Okay, are you serious? What a fucking idiot!
The anchoring and set point that we have.
But if for some reason there was a cost attached to something, as opposed so opportunity costs, finance people basically pretend opportunities aren't there because they're too nebulous as far as they're concerned to pay any attention to. But then you wonder why companies aren't growing, and the reason is because they're fixated on the efficient performance of what they're already doing and completely uninterested in what they're missing out on.
Trust really is everything when it comes to supplements. A lot of brands may say they're top quality, but few can actually prove it, which is why I partnered with Momentous. They make the highest quality supplements on the planet. 3 of the products that I use to support my brain, body, and sleep every day are omega-3s, creatine, and magnesium L-threonate. Honestly, I try and limit the number of supplements I rely on, but when I take these consistently, they have a massive impact on my cognitive performance, my strength, and my sleep. Momentous are literally unparalleled when it comes to rigorous third-party testing. What you read on the label is what's in the product and absolutely nothing else. Best of all, they have a 30-day money-back guarantee, so you can buy it and try it for 29 days, and if you do not love it, they will give you your money back. Plus, they ship internationally. Right now, you can get 20% off everything site-wide, plus that 30-day money-back guarantee by going to the link in the description below or heading to livemomentous.com/modernwisdom and using the code modernwisdom at checkout. So that's livemomentous.com/modernwisdom and modernwisdom at checkout. Talk to me about this the problem with seeking solutions through addition rather than subtraction thing that you've been on recently.
That's an interesting observation, which is that we have an automatic default when we want to solve a problem that we add things rather than removing them. There is actually a very good point. I think Nassim made this point when Elon was appointed the director of government efficiency, where he said quite rightly, you should be the director of government effectiveness, because it's perfectly impossible to do things very efficiently which you shouldn't be doing at all. And that's a Peter Drucker quote, which is, I think nothing's more wasteful or stupid than to see something done efficiently that shouldn't be done at all. And undoubtedly, I think there are, particularly among things which are ostensibly well-intentioned, okay, we never ask the question, would we be better off if we just got rid of this entirely? And so, there's a great quote from Cybernetics, a guy called Stafford Beers, where the quote is, "The purpose of the system is what it does," which is quite a lot of systems, quite a lot of bureaucracy has this ostensible purpose, which is entirely praiseworthy and worthwhile. And so, we actually attach much less scrutiny to that kind of thing than we do to something that's actually selfish. I mean, one thing about being a commercial company is people go, "What's in it for them? Okay, what do they get out of this? I'm suspicious. This is too good to be true. I'm not really comfortable with this." We deploy, quite rightly, high degrees of skepticism towards the private sector because we want to know what they're up to. Now, to some extent, if you're working in, for example, something that's altruistic or charitable, we suspend that level of skepticism. We go, "Oh, it's so well-intentioned, isn't it brilliant? Okay, oh, they're working for so-and-so, isn't that great?" Now, it's nonetheless perfectly possible that the ultimate consequences of that well-intentioned action, first of all, it's possible that the motivation isn't nearly as wholesome as we may like to think. But secondly, it's also possible that just because something's well-intentioned doesn't mean the consequences are necessarily positive or benign. And so, I mean, there is undoubtedly a really interesting question of what should we stop doing. I mean, I'm very interested. One of the reasons I'm very interested in flexible work is it occurs to me that companies looked at in one way are actually very inefficient. I did actually get our finance department. I said, forget about the usual method of financial reporting. Okay, how much does a client have to pay us in fee income in order for my younger colleague, and by the way, the fact that they're younger is relevant because they're not kind of vested in the property market as someone my age is. Okay? In order for my younger colleague to go out and have a curry. And what you look at is the client pays us, then there are various overheads and costs, so there's HR and finance, and there's office space, and there's all that other expense. Okay? Then finally, the money trickles down to the salary of the person actually doing the work, once the kind of landlord has taken their cut and the shareholders have taken their cut and everything else, trickles down to my colleague. Then, from that incremental amount of money, 40% will probably go in tax. Okay? Then, of the remainder, 40%, maybe 50% will go in housing costs and transportation costs, commuting costs. So it works out that in order to buy my colleague, a trip to the Koh-i-Noor, okay, a client has to give us about 250 quid. Now, my argument is, if you can get rid of all that shit and just do the work on Zoom, okay. In other words, the people. There seems to be an extraordinary extent to which, in large organisations, the people who are creating the value, the people who are doing the real work. I mean, it's amazing that capitalism functions at all when you look at the extent to which, money goes in. And then incidental costs, particularly property, I'm Georgist, okay, particularly, property costs, chip away at all of that. And so the actual incentive for the person to perform valuable work and the reward they receive for it has mostly disappeared.
You were talking about feedback loops earlier on. The feedback loop is so slow and it's so molested from what goes in to what actually comes out, the amount of time. You're on 30 days, you're on 60 days, you're on 60 days from the end of the month.
You got it.
It's the big problem on the back end, for instance, with podcasting platforms. So YouTube has gamified not only for the audience, but also for the creators. You have this little number that's 1 of 10, so it compares where this video is now since published in terms of the duration of time, 30 minutes, an hour, 2 hours, however long, with other videos, and it tells you where it ranks. First of 10, wow, this is better than your last 10 videos at the same amount of time.
At the same period after.
Exactly.
Now, obviously, some things are slow burn and some things are fast
pick up
burn.
afterward, but generally it's a pretty good indication.
So it's a pretty good indicator, is it?
Yeah.
You do get the sort of Shawshank Redemption phenomenon, don't you?
Where it kicks in for the end. But you don't have that. You don't have that on Spotify. You don't have that on Instagram. You don't have that on most other platforms because they're not quite as creator focused. And the power of feedback loops is fucking unbelievable. Speaking of you mentioned there some inefficiencies within the system, some changes to do with Britain. Obviously, 2 million people just signed a petition to. We are disgruntled with Mr. Starmer, or Sir Starmer. We want to make some changes there. We've seen a lot of sort of turmoil and stuff across this year, generally 2024 in the UK. What do you make of the state of sort of British culture, the milieu that we're in at the moment?
I did make the joke that voting Labour and having a Chancellor who's come from the Bank of England is a bit like going on a Club 1830 holiday and taking your parents along, which it kind of defeats the object of the exercise a bit. In that one of the things I think we would like to see as voters, and I'm perfectly happy to give this government I think you have to give the people the benefit of a few years before you get pissy about it. I mean, that is interesting. I'd be interested to know who's signing that petition. Is it people on the left who are just disappointed? Is it Reform voters? Is it Conservatives? I don't know. Who is it who feels most kind of cheated? I mean, you've got to remember that there are an awful lot of people who didn't vote for them if you consider the size of their majority, okay? They've got a massive majority, but the share of the popular vote is very...
Yeah, I'm not sure if you can be disgruntled with somebody that you didn't vote for.
Well, it's interesting who's demanding a kind of run again. Some of the things interest me because I think a lot of people know that there's fundamental inequity, intergenerational inequity, which is because salaries are taxed very highly and wealth, particularly capital gains from your main property, are barely taxed at all. And that leads to, I think, a kind of absurdity, which is that one piece written about this is it's not actually intergenerational inequality that's the problem. It's going to be intragenerational inequality when people start inheriting houses or not inheriting houses. Because you can literally have the situation where you can work incredibly hard for 30 years and reach a position of some eminence in a business or in an institution. And because your parents happen to live in an area of low house prices or didn't own a house at all, you're still living somewhere crap. Whereas your underlings, whose parents lived in Surbiton or Kensington or whatever it may be, okay, are basically swanning around in palaces, going on cruises all the time. And that does strike me as a fundamental flaw, that we've created a system where unearned income, which is not really particularly meritocratic or inherited income, is treated incredibly generously. Whereas earned income, I think the top, if I'm right, is it the top 5% of taxpayers pay 50% or 60% of all income tax?
So in America, maybe the same here too.
It's probably the same here. I mean, that's, by the way, it's a kind of statistical artifact. You usually find those power law effects.
Yeah.
So it's not quite as weird as it sounds, but nonetheless, that is quite weird when you think about it. Now, one thing I thought was extraordinarily interesting as an idea is, you know that chap who wrote The Trading Game, Gary Stevenson. He makes a very valid point, okay, whatever else you think, which is that nearly all economic models use single representative agents to populate the models, which is they assume that the person whom they're trying to optimize for is an average of everybody. And as a consequence, inequality doesn't feature in those models because you're simply dealing with an average. And so, if Bill Gates walks into a football stadium, everybody in the football stadium is actually a millionaire suddenly, on average, okay? It's simply not a reliable thing to do. And one of the things that strikes me as genuinely horrific is the extent to which I think the tax system is kind of gerontophilic. In that, there are huge concessions in terms of pensions that are given out, huge concessions in terms of inherited property, huge concessions in terms of capital gains on existing property. You also get this utter absurdity, which fascinates me, which is that there are 4-bedroom houses which have 1 or 2 pensioners knocking around in them. Nothing wrong with that, you might argue, except those pensioners are often skint. Okay? Now, it's a weird kind of way of being a millionaire that you live in a massive house that you don't entirely need. Now, if you simply saved a hell of a lot of money and you just like living in a big fuck-off house, well, you can argue that's kind of, you're entitled to that. But you literally get people living in these extraordinary houses who are, going to Lidl and worried about the price of lemons.
Yeah.
Okay, pretty weird. If someone told you when you're a kid you're going to be a millionaire one day, but you're going to be really worried about where you buy lemons, you'd think this is pretty weird.
Well, what's that?
So, I mean, one great idea, Roger L. Martin's idea, is that you should, at the moment, you get your first 10,000 or whatever it is of your annual salary is tax-free every year. Roger L. Martin, a Canadian, proposed that should be a lifetime tax allowance. So the first 250,000 Canadian dollars you earn in your life is tax-free, after which the tax system kicks in. Now that would be extraordinarily beneficial to younger people who need the money more and who could build up some... Actually, you don't need that much in the way of savings. I mean, one of the interesting things about the benefits to wealth is that there are inflection points.
First house deposit.
Well, actually, having £5,000 you can call on in a crisis is a really, really, it's a really, really big difference. It fundamentally changes what people can do. I mean, very interesting thing. When I first went to America, I think I was 29, roughly. And I remember thinking, I'm glad I never came here when I was skint. Okay.
It's a bad country to be poor in.
It's a terrible country in which not to have $10,000 sitting there.
Correct.
One bad thing goes wrong, and suddenly you're in Leavenworth doing a 9 stretch. And so there are these inflection points where you can take people. One of them I always think is that when you start earning a bit above median income, you notice that actually it's quite nice because things are priced for people who are a bit poorer than you. Televisions, for example, flat screen TVs. To be honest, okay, let's imagine that flat screen TVs cost $5 grand. Okay, we both would have bought one by now, but we don't have to pay $5 grand because they're priced for sale to people who earn a lot less than we do. And so, I think there are these interesting inflection points in earnings. Now, what's really interesting, by the way, and this fascinates me, is the extent to which pre-2020, the only real point of negotiation with your employer was how much they paid you. Because it was assumed that you worked a 5-day week. It was assumed that you came into an office or some other place of work for 5 days, and that you had hours and you had a place. Those were non-variables, and the only variable was your salary. Now, to what extent will people start to practice lifestyle arbitrage, which is to say, well, I could work for Goldman Sachs in London for 200 and something, whatever, but actually 120,000 in Lisbon, okay, and a pretty good broadband connection.
Earning in pounds and spending in pesos.
And the number of people who might simply... I mean, by the way, that applies within the UK. There are a lot of people
who live in Newcastle and get 10 times the house for the same amount.
Actually, my daughter went to Newcastle University, adores the city, quite rightly. I've been up there. It's fantastic. It's a glorious place which gets the balance. I think it gets a lot of things absolutely right in terms of the kind of yin and yang of a city. It's manageable in size, but it's not boring, remotely boring. It has beautiful architecture, but it also has utility, and it's got a coast, okay? My daughter actually said, the tragedy is, in a way, I didn't really want to move to London, which is bloody expensive. If I could have persuaded 6 of my university friends to stay in Newcastle, we all would have...
Tragedy of the Commons.
The tragedy of the Commons, which is that you're forced to go along with this kind of majority consensus.
You also can be on the
winner takes all effect.
You can be on the receiving end of that too, though. You can benefit from that, which I have been in Austin. Why does any scene appear anywhere? Any scene appears anywhere because people go. No one's really too sure why, and because people go, more people go, and then before you know it, you've got the hottest new place.
I suppose it was Rogan in Austin. Was it?
He made one of the big ones, but before him was Lex Friedman. I think before Lex was Michael Malice. Before him was Aubrey Marcus. You track it back to wherever you want, and now everybody has a fucking second holiday home. And Jason Calacanis coming over from Investor Bay, West Coast bullshit world to come and now live on a ranch, wear a cowboy hat. So yeah, it's
can I be really mischievous here?
Get it in.
Okay, and I always thought this is why Brits like living in LA, which is that secretly everybody over the age of 35 wants to live in suburbia. Okay,
correct.
But in London, it's just not cool. Okay, I mean, if I took my younger colleagues, I couldn't get them to move to Bromley if I put a gun to their head. Secretly, I suspect they want a little bit of, a bit of lawn and a bit of a place to park a car.
Yes.
Okay.
Oh, so you've got a blend
but
of
LA, it's totally cool to live in a suburban house, isn't it?
Same in Austin. Honestly, the suburbs, the olden style suburbs. So what's up north, which is the Domain, is kind of a soulless hellscape that was created for people that work at tech companies, so not having to go far to go to the office. But when you're...
A few things. It was also built after the invention of the car.
Yeah.
So the distance from the centre matters a lot less. By the way, it should have... I don't normally criticise the US, but you should create high-speed rail to someone like San Antonio, shouldn't you? You could link a couple of places.
I think the rumor is that Austin and San Antonio are growing at such a clip that they're going to merge into one huge megacity eventually. It's only... Without traffic, I think it's only 50 minutes-ish from sort of the edge of one to the edge of another. And when you think about, we've got this land, we might as well expand it.
You've got another advantage in Austin, which is interesting, because you saw, in the property crash of 2008, you saw very dramatic property crashes in Vegas, Phoenix, Austin. And the reason is, they're unusual in that they're not on a lake and they're not on a coast, and so they can expand in 4 directions. Which, I know that sounds... San Francisco can't, okay? You're on a kind of peninsula.
How does that impact the price?
Because simply there's 4 times as much land. Actually, more than that, because area expands at the square of distance.
Yes.
So you've only got to go a mile further out, and you get, what is it, the square of the distance.
A fuck ton more land.
Okay, so there isn't really much scarcity. Combine that with the fact that they were designed for the car. So I love Phoenix is fantastic because they actually synchronize they probably do this in Austin. They synchronize the traffic lights. So when you drive in at night, you can ride the green wave. Have you done this?
Well, I certainly know the way that traffic flows work. That if you hit a red light, you're more likely to hit subsequent red lights. But
that's it.
Right. Okay. I thought that was.
There's something called riding the green wave, where if you obey the speed limit, you can basically keep going.
That's only if you hit the first green, though. If you hit the first red, you think I'm fucked here for every one that I'm going to hit.
Well, you and your massive muscle car won't be.
Yeah, exactly. I can try and go as quickly as possible. This episode is brought to you by Function. Staying on top of your health requires more than just an annual physical, which is why I partnered with Function. They run lab tests twice a year that track over 100 biomarkers and monitor for early signs of thousands of diseases. They even screen for 50 types of cancer at stage 1, which is 5 times more data than you get from an annual physical. You receive insights from expert physicians who provide a detailed written clinician summary of their observations and phone consultations for any critical findings. Plus, Dr. Andrew Cuban is their scientific advisor and Dr. Mark Hyman is their chief medical officer, so you can trust that the data and insights you receive are as scientifically sound as they are actionable. Getting these lab tests done would usually cost thousands, but with Function it is only $500. They've got a 300,000 person waitlist, but every Monday they open a few spots for Modern Wisdom listeners. Right now, you can discover where your health stands by going to the link in the description below or heading to functionhealth.com/modernwisdom. That's functionhealth.com/modern wisdom. Just go back to the UK for a second. Let's say that Starmer brought you in, or whoever it is that does tourism, brought you in to improve UK culture, sort of tourist destination type thing. Have you got any sort of branding or psychological interventions which would maybe be low cost that could make the UK more attractive across the board?
For tourists?
Yeah, for tourists or for people to stay. We've got the, second in the world. The UK is second in the world for millionaire exits in 2024. China, fucking literal communist dictatorship authoritarian hellscape, was first with about...
You've got to watch the super rich, because the super rich don't give a shit about democracy, okay? Because they can capture power using money rather than using rights. And the super rich, I mean, if you look at Dubai, which has done a fantastic job of effectively saying, we're just going to make this place unbelievably attractive for wealthy people to live here in terms of low taxes, okay? Very low crime rate, okay? You have cheap labour, which rich people really love. You know, most of us are, in other words, you get lots of people doing stuff for you, so the service industries are fantastic. And to be honest, very rich people aren't that bothered about being able to vote because they only get one vote, which is the same as the teacher down the street. Why would I want something I can't have more of than somebody else?
Yep.
So it doesn't surprise me, by the way, that actually very rich people are often quite drawn to authoritarian spaces because they don't suffer the downside. Okay, but they gain, in some respects, they can profit from the upside.
China lost about 13 to 15,000 this year. The UK lost 10,000-ish millionaires leaving. But we have 3% of the population of China. We have about 5% of the population of India, and more millionaires left the UK. Second in the world in millionaire exits. We have the same number of universities in the top 10 as America do, but only 20% of the number of startup founders and entrepreneurs. So why? What is it that's going on? And
one thing you could do, and the Portuguese are playing this game. I mean, a lot of people. I had an interesting conversation, okay, which is that where people spend wealth is increasingly, I think slightly undesirably, okay, being detached from where people earn it. Now, I grew up in the Welsh Valleys. My Scottish ancestors moved down to South Wales because it was the Dubai of the late 19th century. Coal money. It was actually booming. I mean, my great grandfather, I think, moved down to Edinburgh, intending to join from a croft, intending to join the police force, and was told, "Don't bother here. South Wales is where you need to go to make money." But the people, including the coal owners, lived somewhere within. They didn't live next to the mine, but they lived somewhere within the proximity of that thing. I remember my grandmother, who's not remotely left-wing, okay, quite the opposite, standing on Cardiff Station, looking around. And by the way, Cardiff was a lot grimmer then. Back then, this was in the 70s, than it is now. It's rather nice now. Nothing. Okay, and saying, just think of the money that's been made here and spent in more exotic places. I always remember that. It was a kind of strangely kind of socialistic sentiment from a pretty right-wing grandmother. And what you see, I remember having this conversation with people who are responsible for Invest in Kent. And I said, to be honest, it doesn't really matter whether you attract businesses to Kent. If you can get people who earn money in London to come and live in Kent, and their families all spend their money here, okay, that's good enough. And so when you have this detachment of where people make money and where people spend it, one thing the Portuguese are doing, they're proposing lower tax rates for people under 30. They're proposing these nomad visas. Lisbon, very cool, very attractive city. Likewise, Porto, attracts people who like kite surfing and other excitement.
Italy's got this new flat tax. You pay 100 grand, and that's all the tax that you pay for the entire year. That's a new one from them.
So, I mean, we don't seem... Now, the other thing you can do is just make the place one hell of an entertaining place. Now, I've always argued. I can't get anybody to disagree with this. I don't think pubs, cafes and restaurants should pay rates or taxes because they're actually a social space. When you spend money, this is interesting, which is that economics holds it as kind of, this is my Gary Steve.
Yeah.
Which is, as well as these kind of single representative agent models, which don't understand inequality. And, by the way, really bad inequality is bad for everybody. It's bad for the very rich. Okay? You want people, the ideal place in which you live is one in which you're surrounded by a few people who are richer than you and quite a few people who are a bit poorer than you, but not so
much
poor
that they cause a ton of havoc.
No, well, it's not just a havoc. You want actually social spaces to be roughly commensurate with where you are.
Cohesive.
And if you live in a place where you have 10 rich people, okay, and everybody else is massively poor, the 10 rich people got nowhere to go to eat.
There's a fascinating study that came out of Australia. Candice Blake did this. They correlated wealth inequality with self-objectification as measured by sexy selfies online. And wealth inequality is positively correlated. The level of inequality within a local ecology is positively correlated with sexy selfies.
By men or women or both?
Just women.
Just women.
Yeah, so self-objectification, self-beautification, sexy selfies online is positively correlated with inequality.
What's their explanation for that?
Proposed mechanism is that in a high wealth inequality environment, women can see not only how high they can climb, but how low they could fall with a potential partner.
So the effort you have to make in terms of botox and...
all the rest of it.
Yep. There's a very interesting theory about that, which is why Neiman Marcus, there's an academic paper, why Neiman Marcus started in Texas, not in Boston. And there are two explanations. Where you get more males than females, the luxury goods thing is important, but also where you get a high degree of anonymity. So in other words, you had a lot of people moving in who can effectively reinvent themselves as high status individuals. Okay. Now, just to give an example, luxury goods only work really when you have an audience of strangers. Okay. So had I gone into the pub in Monmouth, where I grew up, which is a market town, with sunglasses with Machino written across them, okay, on inch-high letters, I would have been the subject of complete ridicule. Everybody knew where I lived, what I did, what my parents did, what I earned, etc. And this would have been regarded as an utterly ridiculous thing to do.
The signal can be stress tested.
But if I go to Miami, I don't know, that probably, So I mean, you're undoubtedly right in that a lot of these kind of display and signalling behaviours are contextually determined by the setting.
There's another one that I'll give you. It's called the environmental security hypothesis. So this is human behavioral ecology, which is kind of twinned with evolutionary psychology.
Got it.
It's a little bit more concerned with how we react to the local environment around us, how we sort of interact and so on. There is some pretty good evidence to suggest that men prefer bigger women when the economy is bad. So men under resource stress seem to prefer bigger women, and this can be tracked in a bunch of different ways.
There's a strange hemline index as well, isn't there, which is that in the 20s you had very thin androgynous women with short skirts. And then when you have a depression, the whole thing slightly changes.
Yep. Well, it's the proposed mechanism is that in a time of resource scarcity ancestrally, you would have wanted a woman that looks like she could survive a couple of months.
A bad winter.
Yeah, exactly. A couple of months without a good harvest. And that seems to have carried over now. So two really interesting ones, kind of as you've said there, as the economy wavers up and down, it seems to be that the preferred body size overall, the sort of ideal body that women have, also fluctuates. They did a really great study on university students in the canteen hall, and before and after they ate, they showed them different women's body shapes. And prior to eating, they preferred bigger women, and after eating, they preferred thinner women. That there is something about even the sort of ambient hunger, resource scarcity, which impacts this, the environmental security hypothesis, as it's known.
This is fascinating because undoubtedly, I mean, by the way, I'm a huge enthusiast for evolutionary psychology, but sometimes I think it jumps the shark a little bit in terms of, I think these things are contributory, but I don't think what sometimes happens in evolutionary psychology is that this is believed to be the only game in town. So, for example, that data on women having affairs on with one of your earlier guests, which seemed to validate one hypothesis rather than another. And there is indeed a valid evolutionary explanation for what they claim that the data shows. But I would argue there were also 5 other possible explanations to that phenomenon. Not least, more attractive men are likely to be out there playing the field more, simply because their opportunities are greater, and therefore the fact that women tended to have affairs with people more attractive but not necessarily richer than the people with whom they were in a long-term relationship with could be explained by multiple.
I knew that you'd come and do a quiz at the end. Talk to me about your assessment of Trump's marketing campaign.
I didn't think you need to do that, because actually what he did was fairly consistent with what he'd done before. He had probably, Elon was a little bit of a clever
Signal boost.
Signal boost. I think what you really have to analyse is the Democrats as a marketing entity and how spectacularly bad they are. In that you end up, the problem with living in a very tight urban bubble. I did talk with Rick Rubin for the Christmas edition of The Spectator.
He's great.
Absolutely glorious man. And he made the interesting point that he had a kind of interestingly bipolar childhood, and he spent weeks on Long Island, which was effectively a blue-collar existence. And then he spent his weekends in Manhattan with an aunt who was a kind of creative services director for Estee Lauder, who was taken to concerts, the usual cultural events, books, poetry, etc. And the interesting observation, he said, is there was a downside to that, which is that the cultural life in New York was entirely driven and hence constrained by what other people thought of your tastes. Whereas people on Long Island, the blue-collar culture, basically you like things because you like things. It's similar to Rob's point that middle-class food, posh people food, looks better than it tastes, and working-class food tastes better than it looks. Okay, that's and the constraints on you, on your opinions, on your tastes, on what you could enjoy, because you had to defer. Your primary concern was, what does this say about me to other people within my group? Now, in a blue-collar environment, you can like what you like. There are certain musical forms which tend to be gospel. I was mentioning this, country, where nobody really cares. There's no particular kudos to be gained from liking country or liking gospel. Okay, and therefore you're free basically to exercise honest subjective taste without having to pretend to like things that you don't in order to fit into a particular milieu. And there is a problem when the Democrats become. I've got a skin in this. I've got a dog in this fight, because actually Woodrow Wilson was like my third cousin twice removed, weirdly. Everybody's got a racist in the family. My misfortune is that my racist was the President of the United States. But his mum was born in England to Scottish parents. The Democrats, fundamentally, I think, are in this bizarre hall of mirrors, where effectively their own opinions and thoughts have now become subordinated to a kind of artificial worldview where you have to buy the entire album, as it were. There's a Times journalist who talks about this, which is sort of album politics. In other words, it's not just that you have left-wing opinions, you have to buy into every single opinion that is believed to be from the left, and you have to buy the whole package deal. And consequently, you end up with this very, very strange group of people thinking they're normal. And it's very similar to, the phenomenon that Gillian Tett spotted. I don't know if you've read The Silo Effect. Have you had Gillian on the show?
No.
Very, very interesting, because she's an FT journalist, but principally her training was as an anthropologist, and ending up as a business journalist. she brought her anthropological skill set and eye to what was going on in business. And by happy coincidence, well, in a sense, she ended up looking at what was effectively the securitization of mortgages, that whole business before the events of The Big Short, before the crash. And she immediately spotted that you had this group of people in a particular habitus or mindset who were incapable of understanding the world outside their own particular reference points. And just an amusing detail about that, which I thought was just, hold on a second, I remember thinking. Okay, so there was a Trump event at that huge New York hall, what the hell's it called? Madison Square Gardens, okay? Where there was a comedian, I think he's a Texan comedian, if I'm right.
Tony Hinchcliffe.
And he told a little joke about Puerto Rico, okay, which is, we won't repeat it here. And the immediate assumption, because in their worldview, all Latinos identify as Latinx and have a massive sense of solidarity towards all other Latinos, okay, because that's their peculiar worldview, was that by countenancing this joke, Trump had lost the entire Latino vote. I was sitting there going, okay, that's a bit like saying that if the guy had told an anti-French joke, he would have lost the European vote, okay? The idea that Latinos are so kind of homogeneous as an ethnic group that they identify,
Or band together with the Puerto Ricans.
I mean, Cubans thought that joke was hysterically funny. Okay,
I would imagine that the other Latinos found that funnier, given that it's jibbing someone that's close enough to them.
I mean, you watch Narcos, right? I mean, the Colombian-Mexican tension is enormous. I mean, yes, there are points of shared commonality, but you also have this thing between, actually, precisely because the countries are quite similar, you get this kind of narcissism of small differences.
Yeah.
And I always remember looking at that and going, he's lost the entire Latino vote. And I was going, you clearly have a view of a community, which is one which is based on, probably, some Marxist ideology about race, which is in complete denial about nationality or nationhood. And it just struck me as really interesting that you could misread that so badly. And something, fundamentally, the way they go about appointing people, the way the whole thing appears to be kind of a coronation, it's very sad because, this should be, this could be a, really wonderful, there are lots of aspects. I mean, by European standards, I lean politically right, okay? I'll be honest about that, by Euro standards. But there are aspects to the US which strike me as ridiculously right-wing, okay? Not least the appalling vacation allowance.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Which is that's a humanitarian crisis.
I don't know.
2 weeks paid vacation, but also it's weirder than that because unless you're getting married and going on honeymoon, taking a whole week at a time is looked at as pretty dubious. Now, I don't know about you. It's not a holiday if you know which day of the week it is, in my definition. Okay. If you're conscious of the day of the week, you're not properly on holiday.
Well, look at maternity leave as well in America.
That strikes me again as absolutely extraordinary.
It's fucking barbaric.
And yet it's a wonderful case of status quo bias, by the way, because if you think I have never, I've popped to spectator parties and I have a drink with Nigel Farage once or twice. Okay, I've never met anybody in the UK so right-wing that they believe that that we'd be better off with fewer days of vacation.
Roll back.
Let's roll back this 4 days because we can get another 2% of GDP if we just roll back vacation time. And genuinely, I've never.
That's a really great point. If there's anybody sufficiently right-wing that thinks that the UK is too open and free with the way that we give away.
The other weird American instance I had was that I met somebody who said they would happily pay $60,000 to a tax attorney or tax advisor to avoid paying $40,000 in tax. they said this to me in absolute seriousness.
Yep.
Now, hey, that is literally, you resent your tax dollars to such an extent that you would actually happily pay $60,000.
I think that at least from a business perspective, because people will have heard, I got my tax down to zero as an American thing, which is basically that you can drive profit down to the level where whatever it is, 32%, 37%, depending on where you live, that the government would have taken. There is none for them to take because you've spent it all. So you basically get a 1/3 discount on anything that you want to buy. But it sounds sexy. It's like, oh my God, he didn't pay any tax. It's like, yeah, but he did pay 60% of everything that was taxable that he had to drive down. It's not like you got it for free. You just got quite a big discount on whatever it is that he's talking about. But yeah, there is such an aversion to giving money to the government to the stage where people will happily do this sort of seppuku, like Harry thing.
Of actually almost harming themselves in order simply to spite.
Absolutely, yes. The hand will get chopped off in
order
to spite the finger. Yeah, exactly. Despite the IRS on the end of your middle finger. We'll get back to talking to Rory in 1 minute, but first I need to tell you about Shopify. Shopify powers 10% of all e-commerce in the United States. They're the driving force behind Gymshark, Skims, Allo, and Newtonic, which is why I partnered with them, because when it comes to converting browsers into buyers, they are best in class. Their checkout is 36% better on average compared to other leading commerce platforms, and with Shop Pay, you can boost conversions up to 50%. Best of all, they've got award-winning support, which is there to help you every step of the way. Look, you're not going into business to learn how to code or build a website or do back-end inventory management. Shopify takes all of that off your hands and allows you to focus on the job you came here to do, which is designing and selling an awesome product. Upgrade your business and get the same checkout that we use at Newtonic with Shopify. Right now, you can sign up for a $1 per month trial period by going to the link in the description below or heading to shopify.com/modernwisdom, all lowercase. That's shopify.com/modernwisdom to upgrade your selling today. But you had this thing about people that pay lots of taxes needing additional privilege, or maybe an idea to offer them extra privileges.
Okay, I'm
loving this. I'm slowly accumulating more flavors. This is great. It's brilliant.
It's a thought experiment, which one of the things I think we're lacking in is that I would argue, yes, that my joke suggestion was that people who pay higher rate tax should be allowed to drive in the bus lanes. Okay, now, just to be clear about this, I didn't mean that entirely seriously. I didn't mean that it should be enacted. It was purely a thought experiment based on the observation that rich people are pretty happy paying for things if a small amount... So when you are poor, a large part of your disposable income is spent on what you might reasonably call utility. As you get richer, both attractively and unattractively, as I said, what you might call relative status, in other words, the relative quality of something, matters more than its absolute value. And so if you look at car manufacturers, the top of the range X probably costs 25% more to manufacture than the bottom of the range X, but the sticker price might be double. And that's simply because the people buying from the top of the range are more interested in status and more interested in, leather seats and heads-up display and, adaptive cruise control. They're more interested in what you might call things you can show off about, or things which are just novel. Whereas the poorer person is buying the car as a mode of transportation. Okay, it's closer to the economic idea of utility. And consequently, it struck me that government should play the same trick that car manufacturers do, which is to say, yes, you pay a lot more tax, but in return, you get certain privileges. You get certain advantages. Now, by the way, the evidence that something of the kind, which is that if it was simply reframed with a thank you. So there's an experiment from Singapore, which I think was adopted in the UK by a housing association which had trouble getting people to pay their rent on time. And one of the most, they tried a variety of behavioural economic interventions, but one of the most successful was simply every time you paid your rent on time, you got a text saying thank you. And that massively reduced the incidence of late payment subsequently.
It's one of those weird things.
And that's a total, it's a tiny little reframing, which is, you did a good thing, we're grateful to you, we noticed.
Yeah,
okay?
I mean...
Whereas I don't feel, when I pay whatever vast amount I pay to the Exchequer, if they just said, kind of, we noticed, thank you for doing the right thing. By the way, just to be clear on this, I do the right thing, because my wife does my finances. She's a vicar in the Church of England, which is like having the shittest accountant in the world, in terms of tax. She'll say, Rory, when you attended that conference, they gave you a free pen. I really think you ought to declare this. I actually declared all the capital gains on my bloody Bitcoin. God.
Oh, wow. Oh, my God. That would bankrupt most people, especially if you've got to pay it in fiat.
Now, what was kind of pissed me off about that is, had it been a house, of course, I wouldn't have had to pay a bloody thing.
And no capital gains.
But the interesting thing there is that, I mean, there was the guy who's the expert on this, guy at Berkeley called George Akoff, who was a left-wing guy who pointed out that the right, to some extent, enjoyed some unfair advantages simply because of linguistics. So the phrase tax relief, for example, suggests that tax is a burden from which you have to be relieved. It's not paying your civic duties towards the maintenance of collective goods. And as a Brit, okay, as I said, a right-of-centre Brit, I can't help noticing when I go to LA. To be absolutely honest, I'm not sure I wouldn't rather have a slightly worse car and better roads. Okay, because, there is a correct ratio of expenditure, of money which is spent at the individual level and money that's spent at the collective level. And by the way, one of the reasons I half-jokingly suggest that pubs, cafes and restaurants should be given a big tax break, right, I genuinely mean that, is because I think they're a social good. If you go to the pub, okay, you are maintaining a pub that I can go to the following day, and it actually benefits the whole community, and you might argue that the rich people who go to the pub and buy the fancy spirits or the high-margin drinks are actually subsidising the lower-margin drinks for people with less money. So in other words, there is an ecosystem within that kind of thing which is mutually beneficial.
There's such distaste, though, from anybody to the people that have got wealth, especially from the media, in very much sort of demonised at the moment. It's very uncool, uncouth to talk about the level of wealth that you have, especially when we've got inequality, cost of living crisis, inflation, housing problems, etc. So it doesn't surprise me that it's hard to get people to be on board with doing something. You already have enough benefits as it is. Look at the wealth that you have. Look at I had this idea with Scott Galloway where I suggested that, presuming that some rich people are at least somewhat smart, given that they've managed to get themselves to the stage of being rich.
They're lucky too.
Yes, of course. I mean, there's a million.
Acknowledge that. He's very honest about that.
There's a million other reasons why. But that some people in there will not be total idiots. Perhaps some of the people that are real power users when it comes to tax. I think Elon did this, made a statement the other day that he's paid more money in tax than any human in history. He recently paid $10 billion to the IRS.
Probably Romans who take him up on that, I think.
Nations. When you're competing with entire empires, perhaps that might be something different. My idea to Scott was, why don't people who pay some uber amount in tax, the top 0.001%, why don't they get to have some sort of consultant at the IRS or the Inland Revenue, and they can maybe talk about discriminating where their tax dollars are spent? Because I really like education.
The military, for example, or whatever.
Yeah, I mean, anything. But it treats your taxes, first off, it makes your tax money more accountable, because I think people that have earned a lot of money understand efficiency, at least in one form or another, in that they've managed to accumulate the money, and they look at government and think, I'm going to give you these tax dollars, and I think that you're just going to piss it up. But how many times has the Pentagon failed its fucking budget report here? So
you had something a little bit similar in New Mexico. There was a guy called Gary Johnson, I think I'm right, I'm saying, who was the governor of New Mexico, who was kind of libertarian, and it was kind of Ron Swanson. I don't know if you know Parks and Recreation, but you had a libertarian doing a government job, and he believed, quite interestingly, he said, basically, I dislike all forms of government expenditure except roads and education. He believed those things genuinely had to be collectively spent, they were collective goods, and that, I think his phrase is, if you want economic growth, you need a four-lane highway. And so he was almost a case in point where, in other words, he very, very narrowly decided what the focus of government within New Mexico should, and was, by all accounts, actually, he was a presidential candidate for the Libertarian Party about 12 years ago or something. But he was a pretty good governor. Great. Have you been to New Mexico? It's your neighbouring state.
No, I haven't. Not yet.
Glorious. Go there. It's utterly fantastic. The Santa Fe Opera. Give that a go. By the way, I'm trying to start a little tradition that the guests on podcasts get to advertise something as well.
Whatever you would like.
It always strikes me as very unfair.
The Santa Fe Opera.
The Santa Fe Opera is my...
A mid-roll podcast.
I was on Jamie Lang's podcast and started. I think I was plugging a Italian-Jamaican cafe restaurant, probably giving it a greater level of indiscriminate fame.
I wonder how many people have bought air fryers and Mustang Mach-E's off the back of you. I do think sounds
I know.
It's had a market impact on the Mustang Mach-E.
Oh, I've got a new one for you. Only relevant for Brits, really, although also possibly relevant for expat Indians in the United States. The frozen paratha.
I saw you tweet about this the other day.
I bought this from Ocado. I thought, why the hell has this frozen paratha got 170 votes and is like a 5-star, literally 5 stars on Ocado? I thought,
What's Ocado?
Oh, my goodness, you don't know. You see, there are lots of things in the UK. So it's grocery delivery, home grocery delivery, very innovative bunch of people who started, effectively robotic picking. So it's a very, very high-tech mode of grocery delivery. They used to have a partnership with Waitrose. They've now got a partnership with Marks & Spencer.
Okay.
It's actually probably better than anything you've got in the US, actually. By the way, in Britain, we never really celebrate. So I would include Octopus Energy and Ocado as, and perhaps a Wise. Okay, we occasionally do these things incredibly well, and in the United States you'd be fated for doing this, whereas in Britain you're just treated with kind of mild suspicion. I think. Okay, and I think there is that British problem, which is there is an acceptable social ceiling to the amount of wealth you have.
Yes.
That Americans have observed, even in what you would think of as pretty cutthroat businesses like investment banking, that once they've got a flat in London, a former rectory in the Cotswolds, a wife called Polly, a Labrador, 2 children at a private school, a Range Rover and an Arga, okay, basically that's it. You've hit your ceiling, and anything more would be slightly dubious. So there is that kind of weird kind of class-based ceiling to, it's quite difficult to create a Dyson in the UK. Okay, but what's interesting in Ocado is the frozen paratha is, it was invented in what I call Cinnamon Valley, which is this area around Wembley in London, which is where an enormous amount of innovation in Indian food preparation goes on, which is one of the great reasons I still live in the UK is the quality of Indian food surpasses.
Very difficult to find in America.
I imagine Austin, you must have a large enough expat community that it's starting to raise its
I'm
game.
yet to find a good Indian meal in Austin, Texas, much to my dismay.
Okay, we'll go looking.
I'll crowdsource it. Maybe someone can comment below.
Someone can comment. But the frozen paratha is a remarkable thing. It just sits in the freezer. You can have an onion one, you can have an aloo paratha, there's a garlic one. But basically you take it out of the freezer, where it's basically completely long life, bang it in a pan with a little bit of oil, about 1.5 minutes either side, turn it over. You've had the kind of paratha which is literally, if you went to a 3-star Michelin Indian restaurant, you would not be disappointed by the paratha. It's what the hell is sourdough? What's this sourdough thing? It's fine, right? Sourdough has a place in my bread repertoire, but the extent to which it's come to dominate artisan bread, rather like IPA dominated artisan
Salted
bread.
caramel in the dessert world.
Yeah, you got it exactly. Yeah, these things, these winner-take-all effects in a globalized economy are actually problematic because they're like the grey squirrel. They eliminate the indigenous alternative.
Myopia in the bread world.
Yeah, it is a problem. And likewise, the discussion of AI relative to discussion of the importance of Zoom and remote working strikes me as off whack. But actually, over a longer time horizon, the importance of being able to have a conversation with anybody instantaneously on any continent, in a group or individually, strikes me as it's not far from teleportation. And yet nobody's really talking about it. Nobody's developing hardware for it. That strikes me as something slightly weird.
I've been thinking a lot about, we built a new tonic brand, and we're building another one at the moment with a guy called Mike Israetel. And a lot of the time what we're talking about is sort of coolness and credibility, 2 things that we're trying to aim for. Now with a millennial, Gen Z, degenerate, influencer-driven online TikTok, Instagram brand, perhaps that's easy. Are companies in markets that aren't necessarily so customer-facing, that don't need to have an Instagram account, do you think companies get too concerned with trying to be cool, with trying to create sort of a...
No, I think that the focus on the consumer is... there's a great passage, it's only a small passage in John Kay's book, The Corporation of the 21st Century, which is his attack, largely, the whole book is an attack on the idea of the shareholder value movement. That the fundamental point is that the point of a corporation is not solely to generate shareholder value, but also the fact that the pursuit of a single metric is much less creative and much more likely to lead to value destruction, including for the shareholders, than the pursuit of multiple objectives, the triangulation of multiple objectives, which is looking after your employees, looking after your shareholders, looking after your customers, and looking after the wider society. Okay, so a multidimensional objective from a company will probably lead to a greater variety of behaviours and a greater level of creativity than a single-minded kind of reductionist objective like short-term shareholder value maximisation. And one of Kay's points which he makes is that if you look at the companies that have been kicking around in the Fortune 500 or the FTSE or whatever for a long, long time, it's Nestle, it's Unilever, it's Procter & Gamble, it's Reckitt, okay? It's companies which have a large marketing function which keeps them rooted in the real but changing world of what customers really want. Okay, and keeps them alert to effectively exploring new forms of value exchange, which are ever-changing with technology, taste, fashion, etc. And those companies, interestingly, seem to have a much greater level of survival than companies that effectively develop some proxy measure of success other than the marketplace and seek to pursue that. Now, pursuing success in the marketplace is more difficult, it's more painful, it involves you to deal in things that are highly probabilistic rather than deterministic, it's messy, but ultimately, in terms of resilience, it seems to keep companies on their game in a way that businesses that are basically focused on what you might call internal benchmarking metrics can find themselves actually massively detached.
Could you give an example?
Well, okay, if you pursue, if you pursue efficiency at the delivery of something, okay, you can end up very efficiently making something that people no longer want, or where you're completely depositioned because effectively what you're making. So in some cases, for example, the rules of the game change. Okay, so there will be a period where, for example, well, I'll give you a perfect example of this, okay? Which is an example I love to give, which is when I was a kid, okay, there were a few rich kids at school who'd been to Schiphol Airport, and they come back and go, it's incredible, like there's shops and everything you can buy. I bought a Walkman for like so many guilders before the Euro, okay, that was amazing, you know, we went there and we did this, and then it was Changi Airport in Singapore, oh, it's amazing, I bought this, they've got a fountain, they've got that and the other, see? And then eventually moved to Dubai, the Crown moved to Dubai, kind of blinged up airports, okay, and that all goes on. And then one day, people come back and they go, have you been to London City Airport? It's brilliant. There are hardly any shops. You get on the plane in about 5 minutes. And you suddenly realise that everybody has been optimising for turning an airport into a bloody shopping centre.
Yep.
And then London City Airport comes along, completely the opposite.
Yep.
Okay, and just changes the rules of the game. So, I mean, the hotel industry is interesting. I mean, okay, I think I'm allowed a plug for this. I'm a weird fan. Have you stayed in a Moxie hotel?
Yeah, a few times.
What's your take? Because I think it's I think it's a kind of mental hack, which is actually quite smart, which is everything's really basic. It's good. Good TV, good Wi-Fi, comfortable room, but not very big. No room service, no laundry, as far as I can remember, okay? You wouldn't want to stay there for 2 weeks. But two things, pretty good location. And secondly, the ground floor is basically a bit like a WeWork, in that you can just hang out there, meet people. There's actually a meeting room. Even after you've checked out, you can spend 3 hours doing your email at the Moxie without feeling like a weirdo. Whereas if you do that at a conventional hotel, once you've checked out, you feel they want you to piss off.
Yes, because it's just a small reception area.
Exactly, it's a crappy reception area where you look like a weirdo.
Yeah, I've spent a lot of time on the road over the last couple of years. I've come to believe that the biggest determining factor about your enjoyment of a hotel is the quality of the pillows. And it's not the bed. Bad, good pillows, totally fine night's sleep. Good bed, bad pillows, fucked. So every time
you need a pillow sommelier, don't you?
Well, look, so I'm trying to work on this at the moment. I'm trying to find a Amazon Prime pillow, which I can get in most territories that I go to. So most, like, US, UK, maybe a Dubai or whatever, that I can get next day delivery to any hotel. That if I get there, and on the first day when I check in, I go, oh fuck, they've got one of those ones that makes the sound when you lie in it, and like quickly get onto Amazon, order it, and have it arrive.
You need Uber Sleeps to go alongside Uber Eats.
Very good, very good.
So
but no, it's just
deliver.
That's the worst part. But I mean, yeah, interesting pivot at the moment.
It's an interesting idea, because you would also have a market. If you had Uber Sleeps, you can have a service which, if you basically miss the last train and end up crashing at a hotel, it would deliver sort of, a shirt in your size for the following day, or, and toothpaste and a toothbrush, and all the things you didn't think to pack because you weren't aware you were going to be staying at a hotel.
Yeah, that's brilliant. There's a move at the moment in airports towards like health, wellness and stuff. There's meditation areas, there's gyms, there's napping, rent by the hour napping rooms, which I imagine are used for all manner of...
Fundamentally, by the way, I mean, the built environment in every respect has not caught up with technology, and it's actually, I think it's a total failure. It's largely probably because you can't measure. But I always think, okay, there's nowhere at a station in a concourse. They've got all these walls around the edges, which are underused. Now, just put a shelf there for people to put a laptop on, okay? There are trains with no tables, which drives me practically insane, because apparently it's worth spending 120 billion to reduce the time spent on a train between London and Manchester, but actually putting a table on a train so the person can work for an hour rather than basically sitting there like a Tyrannosaurus Rex trying to type on their knees, okay? That's considered apparently an unworthy expense compared to time saving on the actual journey itself. And offices will need to actually, fundamentally adapt to the fact that patterns of work are different, that you probably need fewer meeting rooms and more pods. But also, the open plan office was insufficiently variegated. So if you take people who are non-neurotypical, for example, my argument is that to some extent the perfect office is not an open plan space. It's 50% library, 50% pub. In other words, half of it should be hypersocial and a bit noisy for people. I actually like working in cafes. I like background noise, even if I don't know anybody present. Equally, I'm conscious of the fact there are people who can't work unless
you also don't want to be in that all the time necessarily.
Here's a barbell.
If you have the final proofread of this particular piece of copy that absolutely needs to be right, if you're writing a best man speech, it's probably best to be in somewhere that's a little bit more chill. It's your final run through. You're trying to remember a presentation. You're trying to do whatever. So you really want to be in the cafe. But yeah, I mean, you'll have seen this as well.
For introverts, an open plan office is probably very tiring.
Well, I mean, I think on average, it seems like open plan offices really, really damage down productivity. The difference even between noise-cancelling headphones and complete silence is marked. A mutual friend of ours worked at a social media management agency years ago, and they had this huge Harry Potter fan page thing. And as a part of that, they were doing a time lapse of them building the world's biggest Harry Potter jigsaw puzzle. So they were going upstairs. They had an entire room. It was one of these many stories. And there was open plan office and fucking AstroTurf on the walls and ping pong Wednesdays or whatever. And he couldn't work. He couldn't think. He couldn't focus. So he had found that they'd kind of given up on this huge Harry Potter thing. They maybe got stuck at some stage of the jigsaw. So there was a point where every morning for a couple of weeks he went up and sat in amongst disused Harry Potter jigsaw puzzle pieces on the floor because it was the only place he could get any fucking piece.
Yes. Yeah. I mean, we have some weird sort of mysterious lavatories on the ground floor, which I notice the occupancy rate is surprisingly high, given that they're not signposted.
Yes.
And I strongly suspect people are using them as a kind of escape pod.
Need a little bit of chill time. Yeah.
Yeah. And the other thing I think is interesting is if you really want to bond people, one interesting thing is to reduce the amount of money you spend on rent, but I think you have to correspondingly ring fence a bit of that saving and spend it on what you might call staff jollies. Now, I don't mean total self-indulgence, but I mean, away days where maybe we should take some office space by the sea, somewhere like Margate, Folkestone, Brighton, okay? Mm-hmm. Just because, actually, if you want to bond people, I don't think an office is a particularly good place for bonding. I think if you take people on a trip together, you find people bond very, very tightly. I mean, famously, you'll love this story from advertising, the Coke Hilltop ad, I'd like to teach the world to sing, was actually, it was conceived at, I think, Dublin Airport, because there was a massive flight delay. And effectively, there's a quote from Bob Dylan in Brownsville Girl where he said, "Isn't it funny how people who've suffered together have more in common than those who are most content?" Mm-hmm. And these people had basically all been together, and they were stuck at Dublin Airport like overnight. Okay? And he noticed that effectively people were all going to the Coke machine, and because of the shared adversity, they were all bonding in ways that they never would have done had the flight been on time.
It's one of the reasons that throughout history, armies have been encouraged to get drunk together a few nights before the first battle. Not because, the bonding thing, the fact that it's more difficult to lie, the fact that you're a better liar detector when you're drunk than when you're sober.
Do you remember that Carlsberg campaign, you know who your mates are?
No.
It only lasted, I think it was it interested me from an anthropological perspective because there's a theory that the reason young men get drunk and do stupid things is to find out who your mates are. In other words, the person who, at the first sign of a police siren, hoofs it round the corner is not your mate. And so it's a kind of loyalty testing thing, just as to some extent, rude banter is a kind of proof of...
Stress testing.
It's a stress test of a friendship. If we weren't really good friends, I couldn't say this to you. Therefore, the fact that I'm saying this to you is proof of our friendship.
Signal of friendship. Yeah. I wanted to show you this. Europeans, according to a study by Simple Analytics, Europeans spend approximately 575 million hours per year clicking through cookie banners, the prompts which appear on websites asking users to accept cookies.
One of the Brexit dividends should have been that we got rid of that, because it was an absolutely stupid piece of legislation, which adds... by the way, it's also counterproductive, because every now and then I go onto my Google Chrome and I get rid of effectively all the cookies.
Right, so you've had to restart
for the next 2 weeks, it's even worse than usual in that every goddamn page I go to, I have to effectively give permission or deny it to see whatever this thing was. That was a classic case of what I think is sometimes called, what was the famous thing in British India where they created a bounty on cobras?
Python. Cobras.
Poisonous snakes.
Yeah.
And people started farming them to claim the bounty.
There was something to do with trying to reduce the number of cars on the road, so they logged the registration plates in one form or another. All of the rich people just bought second cars, so they doubled the number of cars that were on the roads.
That was Athens, yeah. I think you could come into Athens with an odd number plate or an even number plate to reduce traffic. And so everybody lined up at the Greek equivalent of the DMV, and that when they were handing out car license plates, and basically they said, I really need an even number because my other car is an odd number car. And so they'd all shuffle into order, effectively.
I'll swap you,
in the queue. And no, I mean, if you think about it, there were extraordinarily intelligent... If you'd given the job to some nudge theorists rather than to lawyers, you could have come up with a very simple solution, which I would have thought would be fairly amicable to everybody, which is you can set your browser to delete cookies more than X weeks old. Okay? And that would be, you might mandate that that's an automatic option that's made available to you. But, the problem I have is that I like to purge all these things. I never quite know what clearing your cache actually means, but I like to do it regularly because it feels, cathartic. Okay, but I like to clear cookies every now and then because it occurs to me there's probably an unwholesome build-up of the things. But then every time I purge the damn things, it makes my browsing experience painfully bad. We could have got rid of that within weeks of 2016 if we wished to. And I have no idea why nobody's done it.
Meanwhile, we're still struggling with all of the problems everybody wanted to get rid of, and we've accumulated new ones, and some of them have got worse. And now Keir Starmer's done a massive U-turn on immigration, and that was surprising.
If we acknowledge the fact that the bad thing about government isn't really that money spent through the government is necessarily bad, because there are things that probably are better paid for collectively rather than individually, defence being an obvious example. Okay, I don't think it makes sense for everybody to employ a private army. It's pretty logical that we should actually pool our resources in the provision of defence. I don't think and by the way, I would also argue that the ratio of those things probably changes. There are periods where technologically we'd be better off spending money on collective goods, and there are periods where we're better off spending more money on individual goods, and there's a ratio of the two. But you made the point that, first of all, if you allowed very high taxpayers some degree of control over where their tax was spent, that's the first thing. Interestingly, good luck with that, because it's called hypothecation. Dan Ariely is a friend of mine, behavioural scientist, believes that you could get people paying tax much more happily if it were hypothecated. But the Treasury absolutely hate the idea because it removes from them the finance person's privilege of shoveling money around at their whim. So they absolutely hate
It also creates a level of accountability.
I'll tell you a clever case of hypothecation, by the way, was John Maynard Keynes. I think it might have been £1 million to spend. He was the bursar of King's College, Cambridge. And he had two things that were calls on his finances. There was the Arts Theatre in Cambridge, which was run and still is and owned, I think, by King's College, Cambridge, for whatever historical reason, and King's College Chapel, which is a famous, glorious medieval building. And Keynes immediately gave £1 million to the Arts Theatre and nothing to the chapels. And his argument was very simple. He said, raising money for the chapel is a piece of piss, okay? I can get Americans to give money for this world-famous chapel, whereas raising money for the Arts Theatre is going to be damn near impossible. So with the money I've got at my disposal, I'll give it to the things that can't raise money at the expense of things that can. The Treasury absolutely hate hypothecation. I also think that, for example, fundamentally, I've got an interesting idea which I'll share with you, which I think is actually a usable idea, which is what I call charitable yield management. Okay, let me explain. There are lots of things where you want to allocate resources according to willingness to pay. So I'll give you an example. I'm at Athens airport. There's a massive queue for passport control. There are people in front of me in the queue. I'm paranoid. I turn up at the airport like 3 hours early. I'm totally paranoid like that. These people had left it a bit late. Their flight was leaving in 40 minutes. The queue was about 20 minutes long. I was pretty sympathetic. Now, what you could do is you could simply have, in the end, someone spotted them and let them through. It was quite intelligent. But you could have a system where you pay 20 quid, you jump the queue. Most people find that repugnant, but also they see that as the airport effectively profiting from their own incompetence. Okay, which is you're probably deliberately creating a long queue so you can maximise revenue from queue jumping.
Yeah.
If you had certain things where you paid, but the money went to charity, that is an interesting thing because it still identifies willingness to pay. In other words, you're clearly desperate to catch your flight.
It removes the incentive for fuckery.
And also the resentment of the people doing it because, they may be richer than you, but at least they're doing a good thing. So that could apply to parking. In every car park, there should be 5 station car parks. There should be 5 spaces where it's 25 quid to Oxfam on top of the parking charge to park there. The reason being that someone who is absolutely desperate to park will always be able to find a space. Whereas someone who's got 40 minutes to spare can drive off somewhere else.
You've got maximising area under the curve.
You're maximising exactly that, the area under the curve, without creating resentment. You can apply that to street parking. 1 parking space in 10, and it's easy to do with Ringo or pay by phone or what do you use in Austin? What's the parking app in Austin?
I had no idea. It's just tap your card on
You've got that. So with those apps, it's really, really easy. If you're in one of those charity spaces, you have a different code and you just put in a different number and 20 quid goes to Oxfam on top of your cost of parking, which means that the parking spaces go to the people who most desperately need them without anybody feeling rooked, and charities make a lot of money. Now that strikes me as quite an interesting. You could apply that to road pricing as well, by the way, interestingly.
How so?
Well, if people felt that a component of, let's say you had a high-speed lane. If there's a traffic jam on the M25, you can pay 20 quid to use it's equivalent to the multi-occupancy lane you get in the US. Okay, there's a premium lane which lets you jump the queue a bit. Okay, now I would use that if I were going to Heathrow, probably. Okay, if I've got a plane to catch, if I haven't got a plane to catch, I went. Now the great thing is, what would create a lot of resentment is if people just saw a load of Bentleys and flash cars jumping the queue. It creates fundamental resentment. But actually, if you made the thing charitable, it would be less repugnant. And you would still be allocating the roads to the people who were most in need of the road.
Well, we have like fast lanes or whatever they're called, preferential lanes, all across America, and that's basically the same. It's like the if you've got the text tag or whatever, then you can go through this one, and by paying that, it's $1.86 or whatever in order to go through this particular lane. But that lane's got far fewer people on it, and everybody kind of.
I mean, it's interesting. Road pricing is going to be very interesting from a psychological perspective because one of the things they did with ULEZ, which is in London, which is that if you had an older diesel vehicle, you had to pay. Was it £20 to come into the ULEZ zone, which was pretty extensive. It went right. It wasn't like the congestion zone, which is just the middle of London. It was pretty much right to the edges of London. There were ULEZ cameras everywhere. And what was unfair about that was not only that we can debate the whole legitimacy of the charge, but let's say I had an older diesel vehicle. I live in Sevenoaks, which is just outside the ULEZ zone. To be honest, I drive into the ULEZ zone 6 times a year, maybe 8. Okay, I could just about swallow the current charge. Okay. If you travel in every day. So 100 people paying the ULEZ charge once don't really care, whereas one person paying it 100 times, it's practically bankrupting them.
Yep.
And the fact that there was no recognition of that, so if you were a nurse who lived outside London, or indeed inside London, and because of shift work needed to drive to work, and because you hadn't got much money, you had an older diesel car, that was the fact that there was no equivalent of Amazon Prime, which is, okay, pay once, pay for a year.
Yep.
Okay, was fundamentally unfair. And that again is down to Gary Stevenson's observation, actually, that if you optimise for the average, you don't distinguish between one person paying something 100 times and 100 people paying something once. I always notice when you drive down the French motorway, which is called the Autoroute des Anglais, from Calais down towards, I think it's towards A10 or something it's called, can't remember the exact number. And you always notice that for the first sort of 50 miles, basically all the cars are English, this bloody road. And you just be odd, don't the local French want to use their autoroute? And then you realise, of course, if you're English, you drive to France once a year. You pay the French motorway tolls. If you drive a long way down to the south of France, it's going to come to a few €100. Okay, but that's a lot less than you pay for a hire car if you flew, and it's just something you suck it up if you want to drive down to the south of France. If you're French, okay, and you've got to stretch a motorway of 20 miles and it costs you €5 a goddamn day, okay, that's €1,000 a year. It's completely different equation. And so one of the things we need to understand much better is to economists, price is a number, but to consumers, price is a feeling. And fundamentally, economists have this weird idea of money that it kind of, I mean, one of the most important topics, I think, in economics is how to spend it. I mean, Scott Galloway did quite an interesting piece on this just a few days ago, which is, in other words, it's not just about investment, it's not just about wealth optimization. The level of skill with which you translate available money into meaningful experiences into happiness, well-being, flourishing, whatever you want to call it. I mean, that's a skill in itself. And there are undoubtedly people who do it very, very badly. By the way, not only people who are extravagant, but actually people who are too stingy. So there's a wonderful piece of research by George Lowenstein, which looks at the fact that we all acknowledge in economics that there are people who spend too much. In other words, they get into debt, they're extravagant, they live for the moment, they're probably, they kind of have short time horizons and optimize for the moment to a point where they neglect their long-term wealth. But George Lowenstein also made the point that correspondingly, you would expect there to be people who are not spendthrifts, he called them skinflints, who actually find the act of spending money so painful. Just the act of parting with money is something, the very transaction itself is so painful, they spend far too little. And I think he did a kind of survey on this, and roughly speaking, about 40 to 50% of the population get it roughly right. And then you have a chunk of people at one end. Actually, skinflints outnumber spendthrifts, if I remember his data.
Wow.
So there is, I mean, one of his points is that he's a very big believer in buying experiences rather than stuff. That's one of the reasons I think Americans, by the way, should have more vacation time, because Americans have quite a large non-working population, but it's all people at the beginning of life and at the end of life. And the Americans massively over-index in terms of leisure, or lack of economic participation, in terms of students and in terms of retirees. But they're massively too busy in the middle of life. And one of the things I would argue is that if Americans spent more money on experiences, leisure, travel, etc., which tend to be quite labour-intensive, rather than, say, buying more goods, which is what you do when you have very little spare time, would the actual American economy benefit?
Because you can't.
Because you've got, in other words, it's better off having people working in a New Orleans cafe than it is importing a Chinese device that, I don't know, robotically cleans your cappuccino machine or something. Okay, like whatever it is that people are buying. And that's now, having said that, you've got to be very careful about dividing what is a good and what is an experience, because if you buy a guitar and then spend a lot of time playing the guitar,
It's both.
It's both.
Yeah.
So it's very dangerous to say, no, it's just goods are solid things, experiences are intangible, because there's a combination of both.
Rory Sutherland, ladies and gentlemen. Rory, let's bring this one home. I appreciate you 8th time, 9th time on the show. I love it every time you come on.
Always
Thank
a
you.
pleasure. It's a delight. Yeah. To be honest, I just feel I'm a crap version of Eric Weinstein. I don't invite Eric. Every time I watch him, I feel inadequate. I just feel like this sort of
Eric,
rubbish version of Eric.
If Eric's made it to the end of this episode, I forgot to text you and ask what brand of shirt you wear.
He wears these incredibly plutocratic white shirts. I'm just
Okay,
intrigued
I'm
to know
going to
where he
find.
buys
I will
them from.
remember, and if not, I've just put it out on a
By the way,
YouTube
his
channel.
theory, which is ingenious, that Jeffrey Epstein was basically an intelligence ploy that couldn't survive into the internet age. That was one of those eye-opening moments where you go, surely not. Because if you think about it, okay, for a government, for a state actor, right, operating a billionaire looks expensive, right? But compared to an aircraft carrier,
National budget.
It's a rounding out.
Jeffrey Epstein was the deal of the century. Rory Sutherland said it here. Rory, I appreciate you. Until next time, mate.
Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much for tuning in. If you enjoyed that episode, you will love my full-length conversation with Alex Hormozy right here. I heard a quote from you. A mutual friend, George Mack, sent me a quote that said, "A rich man is anyone who earns more than his wife's sister's husband."
Yeah, that actually isn't me. I wish it were me, because I would have retired on the basis of that quote. Happily. I think it's what's the chap called? A brilliant American humorist called the Sage of Baltimore. The Americans will know.
No idea.
A fantastic comic writer, and I've briefly forgotten his name. Right. But it is interesting how I was having a conversation yesterday with someone at an addiction clinic in Switzerland, which I can't name. I wasn't there as a patient, just in case I was there as a very, very interested outsider. And he said that comparison is the enemy of happiness. Mm-hmm. That one of the things that seems to be a curse for all humankind, and you've obviously read, you probably interviewed the author of The Status Game.
Will Storr,
Will Storr,
great. Yeah.
Which is a fascinating book, because it's this kind of terrifying invisible force that drives us, and we're in denial about it. And in some ways, the game only works because we pretend we're not playing the game. You see what I mean? And that comes down to other phrases about status seeking, which is, I think, the famous one of Aristotle Onassis, where he said that if there were no women, all the money in the world would be worthless. I think he's probably overstating that. I mean, they're presumably pleasures to be derived from sort of jet skiing, and I'd like to have one of those yachts, not for the yacht, but just for, I know it's not called parking, it's called mooring, okay?
Yeah.
But the actual business of sailing around on one of those yachts wouldn't appeal to me at all. But docking a fucking thing, that must be an absolute joy.
Yeah.
Do you ever watch that guy called Super Yacht Captain on YouTube?
No.
Now, what they do when they dock those things is they actually send up a drone, so they've got an aerial view of the ship,
right.
And then they use the bow thrusters and the stern thrusters to actually maneuver the thing in.
I mean, you get that now on cars, right?
Yeah.
You know, the fanciest Range Rover gives you what appears to be an overhead
Yeah,
shot.
mine does it actually. I've got the electric car, and they tend to come
still
with
in your
more
Mackie?
gizmos. Fantastic car, absolutely delighted with it. Yeah.
Right. Are you going to upgrade to something similar?
Well,
Something
possibly
different?
the Mackie GT next time, because then I'll be well into a midlife crisis, and so I'll need a car with stripes on it.
Interesting that you said earlier on. I just misattributed a quote to you. Something called Churchillian drift. Did I teach you about this before?
Which is where quotes. There's also a famous thing which is called somebody's law, which is that the quote is never attributed to the original person who said it.
Right.
And it also applies to scientific laws. So if you take Bayes' theorem, it wasn't actually Bayes. It was someone about 50 years earlier who's a blind mathematician at Cambridge. In fact, I can't remember his name. Appropriately enough, we can all remember Bayes' name, but we can't remember the person who actually came up with it. And so quite often, it's the second person. The person who popularizes or makes famous, who actually gets the law or the discovery credited to them, not the person who is the original discoverer.
Well, it's a stickiness game, right? It's all about who manages to capture the meme best. Me and George were talking about this yesterday.
H.L. Mencken,
Right.
the sage of Baltimore. There you go.
There we go.
You know that Americans, don't you?
Taken.
Yeah.
It's only,
He's one of those-
taken 5.
he's
The
one of-
Newtonic's kicking in.
He's one of those people who probably is, there's certain people who are, much more famous in America than in Britain, and undeservedly so, because he was extraordinary. Yeah.
What have you learned about the choice architecture of online dating sites and how it relates to property websites?
Well, this is kind of interesting because one of the reasons I like working in advertising and marketing is I think the correct way to solve problems and to understand what's going on is really bottom up, not top down. By which I mean actually open-minded inquiry and observation of all kinds of things. Okay, tends then over time patterns start to emerge, and I think the better way, what we try and do in politics in particular, is we start with a theory. We then impose the theory on reality. We trumpet the areas or the scale at which that theory succeeds, and we sweep under the carpet those areas where the theory basically fails. Okay, so if you take something like the efficient market hypothesis, it probably has an application in a few fields, and those are well celebrated and measured by economists. It's a complete nonsense to apply the same rules of a market to, say, the property market or the dating market as you do to the market for a commodity like iron ore or something of that kind. Okay, they're fundamentally different. In particular, if you look at the property market, there's a problem. Because when people go and buy most things, if you went out to buy a car, I've got to ask you about your car. I'm a big Mackie enthusiast. Have you gone electric? Or in Texas, does that get you vilified?
It would get me killed.
Not in Austin, though.
Yeah, Austin's sufficiently,
Austin, okay.
it's sufficiently progressive. I think I'll get a Camaro for my first car in America. FYI, there's no license equivalency between the US and the UK, which means that I need to retake my theory test 18 years after I took it in American.
Which is weirdly difficult.
It's going to be, all the road signs are different. What does this particular thing mean? All of my knowledge about roundabouts is totally fucking useless, obviously.
My car, which is obviously American, has an interesting American feature, which is you can set the cruise control to effectively go at the speed limit, plus or minus X miles an hour.
So it's using this sat-nav.
It uses a mixture, I think, of sat-nav and actually optical character recognition, reading the road signs, which does raise the question that people in residential areas are going to put up fake 7 miles an hour signs along their streets, so that electric cars all automatically slow to a crawl.
How hilarious.
But so I imagine, you noticed that wonderful thing where people, as I predicted, were hacking autonomous taxis in San Francisco.
Yeah, putting
where
cones
you
in
put a cone
specific.
on the hood, as they call it, and the thing was basically immobilized in a state of complete confusion. And I predicted that, I'm proud to say, 5 years ago. I said, people will hack self-driving cars, and they'll discover that all you've got to do is put a pattern of weighted balloons on the road, and the things will go absolutely dilally. And sure enough, someone discovered that.
Okay, dating sites.
So dating sites, okay. So let's look at something here, which is, so to go back to my original point, the market for property is highly problematic because what most people do when they look for property to buy, is they work out how much deposit they have, they then work out how much they can borrow, they add those two together, and they start looking for houses around that price, okay? So the basic heuristic question they're asking is, how much can I afford? And then they start looking. Now, if you notice, we don't buy anything else like that. We don't buy cars that way, okay? If you went and said, okay, how much money can I raise as a deposit? How much can I borrow? People will be driving around in Bugattis and Bugatti Veyrons and Bentleys all over the place. We don't do that with cars. We kind of take a balance on how much car do I actually need, how much do I care about cars, etc. But because we have this heuristic that effectively property is the only tax-free big bet you can make in your life, okay, with huge tax advantages in terms of the capital gains, everybody maxes out. Now, unsurprisingly, people who sell property have noticed this fact, and consequently, property prices go up and up and up because everybody's effectively, so as interest rates go down, it doesn't make anybody richer. It just means that they set their target price for the property they're prepared to buy even higher than before. Sellers of property aren't complete idiots, so they basically put their price up to get whatever they can get, and so consequently you end up with an absurd spiral. Okay, so the property market is fundamentally unlike, say, the market for, as I said, whether it's iron ore or indeed whether it's high quality energy drink.
Yeah, there it is.
Doing some implausible product placement.
There it is.
Now, it struck me also that there's a fundamental problem in three things, which actually is the same in all three cases, and it's the market for graduate recruits, the market for in other words, employees for first jobs, the market for property, and the market for dating, okay? Which is that two problems. When you recruit someone straight out of university, or you recruit anybody for a job in which they have no experience at all, okay? You don't know anything about them, realistically, but you need a proxy. So the proxy seems to have become, Russell Group University, 2-1 or above. And everybody uses that as the first stage filter for their search. And everything that doesn't meet those criteria, or everybody who doesn't meet those criteria, effectively disappears out of the marketplace, despite the fact that they may be possessed of unbelievable talents. They just either had a good time at university, or a part of that very large part of the population who are very, very clever but don't feel motivated doing academic hypothetical things. Okay, if you think about it, I know people who are good at chess are probably quite bright in some respect, but you can't say someone who's bad at chess is thick, right? My brother's an astrophysicist. He's shit at chess, right? Okay. They do actually record games that sort of Einstein and Oppenheimer played in the Manhattan Project, and they're kind of okay chess players, but they're nothing amazing, right? So there are quite a lot of things that are a one-way proxy.
Necessary but not sufficient.
In other words, exactly, necessary but not, or sufficient, but actually not necessary. Yeah. So actually, now what's happened here, as a consequence, is that we're automatically just discarding. Now, let's take dating as a parallel. There, what's your first filter? Okay, the HR person's first filter is 2-1 and above, and then they interview them. But the first filter is that 2-1 and above, they've got to have a degree. In fact, increasingly, I notice my daughter's generation are doing master's degrees, because even if you've got a first-class degree from a Russell Group University, it's that positional good thing where you create hyper competition, and it's really a kind of peacock's tail signaling effect. Okay, so what you're really proving is not ability or human capital; it's just commitment to the area in which you're invested. Okay. Now, in dating sites, it strikes me that what you have... I got married long before there were online websites. And as a contemporary of mine said, who also got married before there was online dating, he said, I feel like I caught the last helicopter out of Saigon. Genuinely, I wouldn't know where to get started in online dating. But what's the first criterion you use, accept or reject? Now, I'm assuming here you're a guy. I don't quite know. It works slightly differently, I think, for women, because obviously the demand is completely asymmetric, okay? But it's a still picture of them and some words of text, all right? Now, how good... Just as 2-1 or above is not actually a brilliant proxy for how valuable an employee this person will be. It's all you've got, okay? I don't think a still photograph and a few words of text are in any way a proxy for who you might forge a long-term relationship with, okay? Because what you're doing is you're making a series of decisions. You're working your way down the decision tree, to use the language of choice architecture, and because every decision you make you're happy with, you think, therefore, that a series of seemingly rational decisions will reach an optimal outcome. But actually, for example, there are people who are extremely attractive actresses who wouldn't make it as a model, because their attractiveness is to do with motion, humour, wit, present, all those things which matter more in a relationship than how you look in a static photograph. I'm showing my age here, but Cameron Diaz probably wouldn't have made it as a Vogue model, okay? But, Jennifer Aniston, I don't know, okay? But what I'm saying is what makes them attractive is a whole mix of things like humour, deportment, movement, subtle things which cannot be captured at all in that initial filtration phase. Same goes for employment. What makes a good employee cannot really be very well captured by that initial filtration phase. Same goes with property, okay? Which is, what do people do when they look for property? They go, okay, first of all, how much can I afford? And they start looking at that point. Then they ask the second question, which is, where is it and how many bedrooms? Now, all I'm saying, okay, is that it seems rational. While we're going through that process, it seems perfectly sensible, because each stage we're filtering. What we don't see, the dog that doesn't bark in the night, is what we're rejecting that might be great. Okay. Now, here's where the problem really gets acute. Okay. Everybody's going through this decision tree, starting at the same place and working through in the same order. That's what online choice architecture does. Now, if you look at how people chose houses, or for that matter, girlfriends or boyfriends, back in the pre-internet age, there was a lot of noise in the system. The conventional British way, the New York way is you go out with people and first of all find out how much they earn, as far as I can see. Okay, dating in New York always strikes me as like a weird Jane Austen kind of transactional field. Okay, but in Britain, basically, you went to a rugby club and got pissed with your friend's sister. Okay, and then you discovered you really liked each other. And that's messy. I'm not suggesting it's optimal. There's a lot of choice you're missing out. But everybody effectively found a house, found a partner in a different way. The choice architecture was different, the starting point was different, the initial filter. In many cases, people found a house because they walked past an estate agent's window, they drove down a lane and saw a for sale sign. And in many cases, they didn't start searching with 800,000 and down, right? And it was messy. So houses had lots of opportunities to appeal to people, and partners had lots of different strengths which they could deploy depending on the circumstances in which the meeting took place. Because, guys aren't that shallow. Men are a bit shallow, but there are a hell of a lot of personality features, okay? Now, if everybody chooses according to the same criteria, it's a much less efficient market clearing mechanism than if everybody's a bit messy. Right. So let's assume that you had, I mentioned this earlier because I was talking to a kind of recruitment firm. I said, let's imagine where you had a world where weirdly everybody's HR director was like oddly prejudiced, okay? But they're all prejudiced in completely different ways. One person was obsessed with hiring Oxbridge graduates, another person was obsessed with hiring Jamaicans, a third person was obsessed with hiring Scousers, okay? Over time, multiple differing prejudices, or what you might call diversity of opportunity rather than equality of opportunity, would provide a more efficient market for talent than the one we have now, which is regimented and identical. And it seems to me there's a conflict here, which is in recruitment. The need to look fair means you have to apply the same criteria to everybody, which means as that kind of consistency of selection spreads out across the whole of the industry, okay, it actually means that there's a ludicrous undersupply of certain people who meet those initial criteria, while the 50%, 80% of people who don't meet those initial sortation criteria effectively go to waste.
Yeah, it's like
there must be a
pastel
hell of a lot of
selection.
girls who are single because they just don't look that great in the stills photo, right? Now, there's this further thing, which is, now I've got to be really careful because my wife's going to watch this, okay, but actually, you don't want a wife or a house which appeals to everybody, right? If you marry a supermodel, right, basically they're going to run off with your tennis coach and take your house, right? What you want is someone who's disproportionately attractive to you. Yeah. All right, that's the sort of game theoretic approach of house hunting. So my approach to house hunting, I'll stay out of dating because my wife might be watching this. Okay, is to some extent a form of, and I've often said that estate agencies would be a lot better if they actually were forced to list the downsides of a property as well as the upsides. Because the shrewd way to choose a house is not to say what's my perfect house; it's to say what do other people hate that I don't mind.
Yes.
Okay, so an example in my case would be next to a railway line, absolute bonus. You know, I love trains, right? They stop at midnight. They don't keep you awake. I never go to bed before midnight anyway. I'd actually pay extra to have trains going past my house. Okay? Equally, my children have left school, so the school catchment area can be, you know, some crackhead's academy. Doesn't bother me, right? Because okay, my kids are 22, right? And the third one, which would be a massive bonus to me, I couldn't believe my parents-in-law once didn't buy a beautiful Georgian house. Wait for the reason, because it was next to a pub. Right? I think, sorry, I'm totally confused here. That's the best garden in the world, right? It's not Sissinghurst, it's a beer garden, right? Because it's a garden and it's got beer. Now, I actually knew some people who lived next to a pub and they had such a good relationship with the landlord, they could actually order over the fence. So if they had a barbecue, they could just go, you know, 4 pints of the usual.
Yeah.
Now, to a lot of people, being next to a pub is an absolute nightmare, you know. Flight path, okay? If you're completely deaf, go and buy a place in the Heathrow flight path, because it's not going to bother you, but it's going to bother everybody else. So the other thing about this very regimented mode of choice is that it prevents you from gaming the system.
Yes.
Now, to be honest, what makes someone initially attractive at first glance and what makes the relationship enduring, okay, are not the same thing. They're not the same criteria. Therefore, using what you might call first glimpse criteria in a house, in an employee, in a potential partner, okay, if you're seriously after a long-term relationship, which, after all, you are with a house and you are with an employee, you may or may not be when you're on an online dating site. That varies, okay? The first glimpse criteria are totally unreliable as a guide to long-term enjoyment. So, my wife's going to kill me for this, okay? The kind of person you want to marry, right, isn't something that everybody wants. It's something the value of which you only discover on repeated familiarity, on long-term familiarity. So, what you want is an air fryer girlfriend or a Japanese toilet girlfriend, okay, right? Not a Corvette girlfriend. Do you see what I mean? Right? You want something which actually you know the value of fully, because over long-term exposure, they're actually technically called in economics, they're called experience goods.
Okay.
And what's interesting about an experience good is that it's something the value of which only becomes apparent with use. Okay, I'm sorry, it's terrible using that economic term to refer to relationships.
It's not the worst thing people have said about relationships on the internet.
Okay, you're probably right.
Yeah.
But that is fundamentally interesting. That what the internet has done, the two things is that in many cases, the thing it yields up as the first filtration point is not a very good proxy to begin with. But secondly, and this is I think the worst problem, if everybody is using the same first stage filter because everybody's on Tinder or whatever it may be, okay, then effectively it's going to create a totally inefficient market clearing mechanism, because demand disproportionately goes towards those people who happen to meet those initial proxy criteria. Now, that strikes me fundamentally as a problem in all three of those markets.
In other news, this episode is brought to you by Element. Element is a tasty electrolyte drink mix with everything that you need and nothing that you don't. It's a healthy alternative to sugary electrolyte drinks, and it is the best way that I've started my morning every single day for over 3 years now. It contains a science-backed electrolyte ratio of sodium, potassium, and magnesium, with no sugar, no colouring, no artificial ingredients, or any other junk. Your adenosine system, the caffeine acton, isn't active for the first 90 minutes of the day, but your adrenal system is, and salt acts on your adrenal system. So if you want to be more awake, want to regulate your appetite, curb cravings, and have better brain health, this is the way to start your day. Head to drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom to get a free sample pack of all 8 flavours with your first box. Plus, there is a no BS, no questions asked refund policy, so you can buy it 100% risk-free. That's drinklmnt.com/modernwisdom. Did you read Seth Stevens Davidowitz's book, Everybody Lies? So he was an ex-data scientist at Google, and then he did another book called Don't Trust Your Gut.
Oh, no, I haven't read that.
So the second one, Don't Trust Your Gut, looks at this specific problem. It looks at what is the issue. By the way, nicotine plus that is like just the supercharged. Yeah, I know, yeah, beautiful.
Ooh.
What flavour's that?
This one's, I think, cherry, I think.
Very good.
With my cataract, I can't believe either. sorry. This is going to be the first ever guest Chris has had where half of our conversation is about medical problems.
Yeah,
so sorry.
that's totally fine. In his second book, he looks at people who basically haven't been priced into the market when it comes to dating.
By the way, who's single makes no sense, does it? If you actually go around the world and meet people who are single and meet people who are in relationships.
Highly educated women, one of the most overrepresented single groups. You've got women who can contribute a ton of money to a household, etc.
Depends on marriage, highly educated women. Because, my God, the arguments, never mind. Okay, but but also because historically, effectively, this may change, okay? So women are more reluctant to marry down in education level than men are.
Correct.
Interestingly, probably because men are shallower, and they'll just go, well, you know...
That 21-year-old barista that can't spell her own name.
Yeah. It's your atrophy wife, as I call them, you know, very thin second wife. Yes, exactly.
Oh my God.
But you notice that the people, they have that very weird breed of people who are sort of very rich and very, very thin, you know.
Right.
But so I mean, Chris Rock did a whole routine on this, didn't he? Which was, what was it? Men can't go backwards sexually, women can't go back in lifestyle. I think the Chris Rock routine.
Yeah.
One thing that I think deserves study, which is interesting, is a huge generation of the most successful comedians are also amateur effectively evolutionary thinkers, aren't they?
Yeah.
So if you look at Gervais, absolutely fascinated by kind of Darwinian evolution and so on, absolutely true of, say, Andrew Schultz, true of Jimmy Carr. Jimmy Carr actually co-wrote that book with Lucy Greaves, The Naked Jape, which is an absolutely fascinating kind of investigation into the evolutionary origins of comedy. And actually, there are a few more than that. I mean, I think you can see it in Dave Chappelle, you can see it in Chris Rock, a lot of that stuff. There's a huge influence, and there seems to be a significant correlation between interest in kind of evolutionary psychology and comedy.
Well, ultimately, it tells us why we are the way we are, right? And that is one of the insights. To say the thing that everybody knows but no one has named, or no one dare say, is one of the greatest forms of comedy that you can find. There was something else. I remember...
But also, I suppose it's all about... I suppose, recontextualization. So comedians are going to be very, very open to different ways of looking at the world because it is, to some extent, the source. That contextual flip is at the root of quite a lot of
misdirection.
Misdirection, exactly. But it is fascinating because, like music, we have this debate, what is the evolutionary function? And one of the things that strikes me as odd is that we don't look at comedy as a source of inspiration for wider problem solving. So I did an interview with Jimmy Carr at Adweek, which was a kind of advertising festival, which, by the way, is, as you must have found, people like him, for example, what you might call brain-to-mouth speed is extraordinary, isn't it?
Terrifying.
There's that great phrase in television which is called brain to mouth, and Jonathan Ross or whatever, people like that are very, very good as interviewers because they can basically form a thought and speak it more or less in parallel. And I found that really interesting in terms of talking to Jimmy Carr, because it's rather like you fancy yourself a bit. There's a wonderful thing I saw actually on, I think it was the A299 in East Kent, which was one they sort of hotted up Citroens, which are like the hot hatch with enormous kind of unnecessarily large tailpipes and a ludicrously large woofer that takes over the whole of the boot. And one of those on the A299 decided to take on a McLaren F1. Okay, and I have to say it was comical to watch. The guy actually, acquitted himself in the first sort of 5 seconds reasonably well. But I felt a bit like that, talking to Jimmy Carr, because you work in a business.
You were the Citroen with the big.
I was the Citroen with the unfeasibly large tailpipes. Okay, and similarly, I've always been in awe of Andrew Schultz for the crowd work. Just has a speed which is just terrifying.
Yeah, mate. So someone asked me the other day who are the easiest people to speak to and who are the most difficult people to speak to on the show, and I definitely find that comedians are the ones that I need to be the most switched on for. Yeah. Mark Normand in particular. Mark is it's such a game of, it's not a game of tennis, it's a game of ping pong. Yes. Ba-ding, 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 ba-ding. It's that kind of pace. And you're right, he rides the crest of now. It's oddly a Sam Harrisian sort of type thing. He's just living in the perpetual present and just deploying thoughts as they come to him. And the lack of filter and the precision of his speech just allows him to things just fall out of him.
And there's always this weird debate about creativity, which is it kind of comes in two forms. One of which is what you might call sheer innate genius, and the other one is hyper-accelerated rationality, which is just in the same time that the other person is getting from A to B, you're already at F. Yeah. But, what interests me also is if you look at political movements, given the fact that psychology is often quite oblique, the way to solve a problem, this is what really, really bothers me about politics at the moment, which is, in fact, it's what my next book is about, if I can give a taster, which is, the question is, do you want to win arguments or do you want to solve problems? Because the mode of thinking you adopt if you want to solve a problem is much more open-minded, much less dogmatic, okay? It's much more oblique and creative than the mode you would adopt if you want to win an argument. And what we've done is we've selected for our leadership, for our politicians, in some cases for our business people, and we've educated for, and we've promoted for the ability to win arguments, okay? And actually, winning an argument and solving a problem are two completely different skill sets, I'd argue. So what always fascinates me about Andrew Schultz is, okay, if Andrew Schultz said 5% of what he says on stage in a corporate environment, or at Yale, okay? If you consider, Rob Henderson's experience at Yale, okay? They practically have the place shut down for defumigation, okay? And yet,
contaminated zone.
And yet his audiences are completely mixed in every sense. I mean, if you want a really, really diverse group of people, genuinely representative and diverse, an Andrew Schultz audience is pretty much as good as it gets. And he solves the problem, which is interesting, okay? Not by pretending, say, race or gender don't exist, okay? But by highlighting the distinctions and then taking the piss out of them, okay? Now, from an oblique kind of creative point of view, you have to ask the question, is that actually a better way of solving the problem than, for example, the extreme dogmatism of, say, the politically correct movement? I don't like using the word woke particularly, okay? Now, is part of the solution that? In other words, do you actually make people pretend not to notice ethnic differences and as a consequence become incredibly anxious in the presence of any of those differences, okay? Or do you actually acknowledge them, make light of them? Because
both of them are trying to tune down the seriousness. Both of them try to say, okay...
But one of them works.
Yes, precisely.
Here's a question, I want to do some empirical testing on this, okay? You do occasionally at comedy clubs, you do occasionally get a pissed guy who heckles and everybody gets really angry, okay? But do you get violence ever outside comedy clubs?
Outside?
Well, inside or outside?
I've seen one video in the last few years where a heckler has tried to start on a comedian, but unbelievably rare.
It's unbelievably rare.
Especially given that you're pointing out people and saying stuff about them or their wife or their relationship or their chastity or whatever.
I mean, I recommended, I couldn't make it to Andrew Schultz Royal Albert Hall, but I recommended people went for the limited visibility seats. Not only because they were cheaper, but because given his crowd work...
The blast radius.
The brilliant thing is I could hide behind a pillar, and it's very unlikely I'd be singled out as like the whitest guy he'd ever seen, or whatever it might be.
Yeah.
And so... what's interesting is those comedy audiences are really fascinating just in terms of their demographic constituency.
It's teaching people a sort of a degree of intellectual humbleness, being able to cast off the tension that you have when watching something occur by laughing. So I've noticed this. I'm preparing for my first live tour, which is happening around the UK and Ireland in a couple of weeks' time. And as a part of this, I did a ton of work in progress shows, and I could see in the room and feel in the room tension arising as I'm talking about whatever the thing is that I'm talking about. This section about confidence, or this section about regret, or this section about whatever. And there was bits where you needed a laugh, almost kind of like how a dog shakes its coat when it's wet.
And
It
once
needs
the
to just
laugh
cast it off. Yeah.
So here's an interesting analogy, okay, in terms of being right versus solving the problem. Okay. Now, if you want to win arguments, or if you want to win the respect of a peer group who hold a particular set of political views, what tends to happen is you get into a virtue spiral. I think that's what it's called in the book.
Purity spiral.
Purity, thank you. Purity spiral. You become absolutist. And then, because conflict is inherently interesting, an argument is inherently interesting. So if we hear outside some people having an amicable conversation, we won't even bother to get out. If we hear a fight starting to break up or two people shouting at each other, we'll have our noses pressed to the window to see what's happening. And journalists and newspapers and media know this, so they focus on those areas where there's the greatest polarization, which means you're focusing on the part of the problem which is most difficult to solve. So the example I give, because I'm going to move away from politics, because when you mention politics, everything suddenly drives people to this polarization. I aspire to be the most left-wing person on the alt-right, okay? Which is, I find the conversation of the alt-right inherently interesting, but I try not to become part of it. And I occasionally, I write for the Spectator, but I occasionally write about the virtues of Henry George or the insights of Karl Marx, just to shake the whole thing up. Bloody interesting guy, Marx, by the way. Okay, right. I mean, I think the actual the way I put it is the diagnosis is fascinating and the prescription is terrible.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct.
Now. Okay, the perfect exemplar of where this problem goes wrong. This is very difficult if you work in advertising and marketing, because quite often you're not criticising the intentionality or the aspiration of the person. You're merely saying that the way you're going about this isn't working very well. Okay, so yes, nearly all the aspirations of, say, the diversity and inclusion movement are those which we should all generally support. And I don't want to ever get into that kind of weird thing where you start getting angry about trigger warnings, because if you give it about 10 minutes thought, you realise that trigger warnings, although they're a bit funny, and it's a bit weird when Netflix says may contain nicotine use, okay, which never put anybody off going to the cinema in 1946. Imagine if you had to do Casablanca warning nicotine use. It's a bit weird, okay, but it's a great idea. Okay, some people may be deeply upset by certain forms of content, and you should at least give them the opportunity to kind of opt out. Or to avoid it. Okay, we can debate what is triggering, but nonetheless, it's broadly speaking an intelligent principle, I think. So the example I'll choose won't be from politics, because politics automatically leads people to become tribal, and therefore they have to take a side. Okay. The example I think is perfect is Cycling Mikey. Cycling Mikey is a YouTuber, okay, and he goes around, he stands at a place in London called Gandalf Corner, and if he sees a car ducking around the wrong side of a keep left island, he just stands in front of it and refuses to let them move, takes a photograph, reports them to the police. He's got Guy Ritchie. I think did he get Guy Ritchie banned because he photographed him using a mobile phone while stationary waiting for a set of traffic lights. And he sends his film footage to the police, he puts it up on YouTube, okay? Now, I basically support what he's trying to do, okay, because I think cycling safety is incredibly important, and these people are doing bad things, okay? We've all done it, let's be honest, okay? We've all used a mobile phone when driving, we've just been lucky enough to get away with it, and I wish I'd never done it, okay? Where Cycling Mikey is less effective, however, is his mode of delivery, which is so combative and so effectively polarising, okay, that it actually becomes counterproductive. Now, where he's well-intentioned, which is he wishes to increase cyclist safety. No one's disagreeing with that, okay? Where he's less effective is in disabusing people of the well-established stereotype that all Afrikaners are bastards. Because he does things which are inherently... First of all, he's a little bit unfair, because when cyclists misbehave, one, you can't report them to the police because they don't have a licence plate. Secondly, he claims that if you stand in front of a cyclist or a motorcycle, they might fall off. So he can't actually stop motorcyclists and cyclists performing egregious and illegal acts, so he concentrates entirely on the motorist. But then he basically stands in front of them on the road, and then effectively does things which are, we don't really have a massive culture of vigilantism in this country. Reporting other people to the police is something we're pretty reluctant to do. It's not a hallmark of a nice culture when people are bragging, basically, lagging to the screws, as it used to be called in Prisoner of Cell Block H, right? Okay, it's something you just don't do. But secondly, I'm there as a marketing guy going, look, I support what you're trying to do, but you've been driven into this extreme position where your purity spiral is so extreme that actually it's counterproductive. And so, you're very, very good at feeling confident in your own opinions, but actually your ability to bring... If you notice in advertising, it's very rare that you're nasty to users of your competing product, okay? You don't get Ford ads going, if you drive a Vauxhall, you're a twat, okay? Because genuinely, people want to win over people who are either undecided or in a rival camp. And it's not a good idea, and you won't see much advertising that does that, to patronise them or to effectively become incredibly sanctimonious, as he does. Extraordinarily sanctimonious. And I think it's a kind of example of a pattern you see, where people's desire to be entirely on the right drives them to practice counterproductive behaviours. Because, for example, I think
as a marketing guy, I can't help watching this thing and say, if you're actually very nice to those people and you handed them a leaflet, which you've produced yourself, just warning them of cyclist safety, I think it would probably be quite effective.
Yep.
I went on a speed awareness course. I don't know if you ever had that.
I've had to do it once. I had the pleasure.
I turned up thinking this is total arse, but I'm doing it to avoid the points. It was pretty worthwhile. At the end of it, I went away going, okay, I have rethought quite a bit of my driving pattern as a consequence of what I learned.
Re-education.
Now, if you turn, so there's this huge problem, okay, which is that everything. Now, I think Douglas Murray says this, which I thought was interesting. It was actually at a dinner, which he said the real reason he gets angry about the culture wars, which I think is the right reason to be angry about them, is not because somebody's wrong and somebody's right and goodness knows what. It's the extraordinary opportunity cost. That while we're arguing about these things that are very difficult to decide and which automatically polarise people, there are 100 problems we could solve, okay, which would actually appeal to everybody.
Yeah, as he says, while the barbarians are at the gates, we'll be debating about what gender they are.
Well, this is an interesting one, because I'd also argue, let's take cyclists and motorists, okay? It's in everybody's interest to effectively foster hostility between these two groups, even though, of course, quite a lot of people straddle both groups. Outside London, it's quite rare to be a cyclist who doesn't also own a car, okay? Not totally rare, but most people outside London, most households have access to a car in some shape or form. And my argument there is that imagine what you could have done if instead of fostering cyclist-motorist hostility by focusing on the areas where there's the most discord and the most disagreement, imagine if you both said, okay, there are two things one thing that motorists hate and cyclists hate even more, potholes, right? Now,
Bind them together.
Bind them together and say, look, potholes are really annoying to car owners because you've got to get your tyres replaced, which, by the way, is environmentally bad as well.
Fucking mortal terror to a
cyclist. They're total terror to a cyclist, particularly if you're on one of those narrow-tyred, titanium-rich thingy ones with your lycra and everything else. And so it's quite interesting, which is the point is that the opportunity cost of this focus on problems that divide, problems where the solution acutely divides people, opportunity cost. Because the thing to do if you have two people who disagree about something is to change the question. Okay, obviously we're not getting anywhere here, so let's just solve something else.
There's a quote from Scott Alexander which is really great. It says, if you're interested in being on the right side of disputes, you will refute your opponent's arguments. But if you're interested in producing truth, you will fix your opponent's arguments for them. To win, you must fight not only the creature you encounter, you must fight the most horrible thing that can be constructed from its corpse.
Well, maybe I'll come back to you with a quote, which is Thomas Sowell. As I said, I'm the most left-wing person on the alt-right. I'm a very big admirer of quite a lot of the people, Sowell included.
Thomas Sowell's phenomenal.
Absolutely phenomenal guy. Activism is a way for useless people to feel important, even if the consequences of their activism are counterproductive for those they claim to be helping and damaging to the fabric of society as a whole. Okay. Now, one of the weirdest things about this movement, okay, and one of the most tiring things about being politically correct as a Brit, is weirdly you have to pretend you're American. Because, okay, if you think about it, okay, there are loads of problems you can solve at the local level. This place here, okay, sort out the fucking signage, right? First of all, you come into a place to find it, and it's like the St. Valentine's Day massacre. You come into this weird news, okay, where the only thing you can imagine happening there, it looks as if the interior decor has been done by Pete Doherty, right? And then you've got the signage and the numbering is completely batshit insane, and you can only read the actual number of each door if the sun is at a particular angle. Okay, so all these things we can do to solve problems locally at a smaller level. But if you want to feel self-important, you concentrate on the problems at the top. Things like effectively politics. I mean, if you look at actually even things at the level of kind of probably not London, actually, but if you look at, I don't know, why do we never get any coverage of, say, the Mayor of Manchester or the Mayor of the West Midlands? We get a load of coverage of Scottish politics, right? Okay, because why? Because there's a massive divisive issue there which gets people worked up, which is Scottish independence. Where, by the way, we're asking the wrong question anyway. The question should be, what kind of independence do we want? Not, do we have independence or don't we? Completely lacking in nuance anyway. Okay? You never get any coverage. No coverage. Now, bear in mind, the population of Scotland is smaller than the population of Yorkshire. Okay? Most people don't realise that. They think because it's kind of a large geographic area, there are about 15 or 20 million people living in Scotland.
Abandoned.
It's a very small population because all the really talented ones moved to Wales in the 19th century. That's just my own ancestry. Right. In search of people who weren't permanently angry about nothing in particular. And so my great-grandfather moved from Caithness to the South Welsh Valleys. Because in fairness, Cardiff was like the Dubai of the late 19th century.
Cardiff was like the Dubai of the late 19th century.
First place in the world where £1 million contract was signed was in Cardiff Docks. It was coal, so it was effectively the largest coal exporting port in the world.
Wow.
And by the way, not your shitty German coal, proper quality coal.
Right, here's a question.
Sorry.
Here's a question for you. Why is it that when we look at the exports of national identities from the UK and Ireland to the rest of the world, English people, we have a position, although we get referred to as being British.
Yep.
Northern Irish people kind of do. Southern Irish people absolutely, definitely do. Even Scottish people do.
Well, Scottish marketing is brilliant. I mean, as a nation brand, it's absolutely potent as hell, yeah.
Why does no one? What's happened to Wales? Why has Wales not managed to establish itself on the global geopolitical branding?
There's an interesting debate about this. One Welsh commentator, I don't shoot the messenger here, suggests that Welsh people who move somewhere else very rapidly kind of lose their Welshness and assimilate anyway. That's his argument. So if you look at the contribution of Welsh Americans, okay, now, you've never heard that hyphen before, have you? Okay.
Irish American, Scottish American.
Yeah, absolutely. You've never heard of Welsh American. It includes like Thomas Jefferson, okay? It includes arguably Elvis, about 50% of country singers, Tammy Wynette, real surname Pugh, okay? Right? If you actually, Hillary Clinton, funnily enough, is, I think, half Welsh, okay? So you have this, but there is, I mean, if you ask people who are American about their Welsh ancestry, they may dimly know that they have some Welsh ancestry. It barely extends to knowing where it is. Whereas if they've got Scottish or Irish ancestry, it informs every fucking cell of their being, even if they're like a 16th Irish. They start wearing green things.
Yeah.
to the slight annoyance, by the way, of real Irish people, I might add, okay? To be honest, okay? And quite a few people who are very proud of their Irish heritage are actually descended from Northern Irish Protestants, what's sometimes called in the United States Scots-Irish, but they don't even know that. Okay, so I think Henry Ford. There's a huge Irish-American contingent of people who are effectively from Northern Ireland. But again, that distinction isn't really made. There's an argument that it was at the time of the American Civil War, where people tended to take sides on that basis. I'm not quite sure. But generally, that hasn't pervaded until 2023. But the Welsh have done a bad job. And there's actually a group called Global Welsh, which I belong to, which looks at this question of kind of. The greatest Welsh American, by the way, was a guy called Russell Camel Humphreys, who was number 2 to Al Capone. I'm not making this up. Okay, so this guy, who was, by the way, he was known by the various feds and people out for him as the nicest man in the mob. Okay, and being Welsh from, I think he was from Carno, which is in kind of the middle, kind of mid Wales, tiny little bit. His parents were. Okay, and he was entirely Welsh. And sorry, did I say Russell? Murray the Camel Humphreys, and or Murray the Hump, he was known as, which is either to do with Humphreys or to do with the fact that he wore a camel coat. But I think he effectively he would occasionally kill people, but he'd always negotiate first. And I think one of the senior feds who was supposed to arrest him actually refused to turn up to arrest him because he liked him personally, okay, and didn't want to be part of the arrest. And he was also violently against cussing, by the way. Okay,
right, so he's a killer but not a swearer.
A killer but not a swearer. No, didn't like any of that.
Very Puritan.
But research him, because it's really, it's comically funny, the idea of a Welsh guy in the mob.
I looked at a study recently that showed an inverse correlation between marriage length and cost of engagement ring and wedding combined. That the more that is spent on the engagement ring and the more that is spent on the wedding.
Which almost, in pure economic terms, you'd expect it to be the other way around, because the sunk cost of the
Correct.
wedding
Skin in the game.
should ensure the duration of the wedding. Equally, what are you trying to prove?
Yes,
okay.
Yeah. What have you learned? You must have some insights about engagement rings and their heritage and their history.
I mean, what is interesting is that there is a degree where what you're practicing there is a form of commitment device. In other words, it's an unrecoverable sunk cost, which is upfront expense being proof of long-term commitment. And I made that point that some advertising works that way, okay? In other words, you wouldn't spend a fortune advertising this car if it were a waste of time for me to test drive it, okay? So once you spend the money on advertising, it's gone. Therefore, the only possible value of advertising is that it leads to a sale. Therefore, if you are advertising a new product heavily, you are confident, rightly or wrongly, but it doesn't matter, you yourself, who know the product better than the buyer does, is confident in terms of its long-term appeal and desirability when test-driven. And so some part of advertising undoubtedly works through sheer
Costly
expenditure, sheer costly signaling.
Wasn't it, you guys did a study where heavyweight paper was the most effective thing to increase charity donations?
That's right, yes. And you'll never, ever get in. What's so interesting about some of this research is it uncovers things which people feel but don't even think or say. So there's this quote, probably wrongly attributed to David Ogilvy, that he said the trouble with market research is that people don't think what they feel, they don't say what they think, and they don't do what they say. He would say that a charity donation should be sent out on the cheapest paper possible because you should minimise your marketing cost. What we found is that when you put slightly more expensive paper in the donation envelope, for Christian Aid Week actually, slightly more people give, but people give much more large donations. So the volume of donations over £50 or £100 was significantly increased. Now, that's unconscious. It's probably, if this thing is flimsy, there may be a certain degree of reciprocation in that, which is they've sent me a nice bit of paper, I owe them 50 quid. I mean, how it works, by the way, why it works, you could come up with 4 or 5 different possible explanations. But those kind of things are really fascinating because they belong to that field of activity which you can only prove through testing. Market research won't tell you the answer. Pure theory won't tell you the answer. You have to test.
I'm not a very prejudiced man, but given my background as a nightlife club promoter, living and breathing flyers and paper for a very long time.
Did you do that nightclub game where you created artificially long queues?
Of course I did.
Of course you did.
Of course I did. Let me give you this one first. So one of the few prejudices that I have in my life is against single-sided flyers. Single-sided flyers are around about 90% as expensive to do double-sided flyers because almost all flyers are double-sided. My second biggest prejudice are against double-sided flyers with the same thing printed on both sides. You have 2 sides of a piece of paper.
That basically says, I can't even be bothered here. What should we put on the back? I'll just put the same thing.
Command C, Command V, send it. I don't care. Then after that, just tiny little things that you can do. We found that if you go, there's something called Spot UV, which is the kind of gloss that you put over the top of a piece of paper that gives it a smooth finish. If you go uncoated, which isn't that much more again, and if you go a little bit heavier GSM, you get this almost sort of organic, furry feel to it. It's like every innocent smoothie label, right? It kind of feels a bit more kind of raw and organic and natural.
You see, what we're talking about here is this brilliant thing, okay, which is, it's very simple if you want to solve problems, okay, which is stop trying to think like Newton and come up with universally applied laws, okay? That's been done, okay? It's called physics, okay? We've done it. Instead, you've got to think like Darwin, okay? Now, we mentioned earlier this difference between effectively evolutionary thinking, which I think, evolution is a study of how things change, not how things are. Okay, that's a fundamental difference.
What do you mean?
Well, evolution, the most banal description of evolution, but which is also incredibly insightful, is things are the way they are because they got that way. Which sounds like absurdity, but when you actually think a little bit more deeply, then it forces you to ask the question, well, how do they get that way? Okay, and where else can we go from here? What are the tools at our disposal to get from here to somewhere better? Okay, now, one of the things I think that is an obstacle to problem solving, I think the reason that comedians are often evolutionary thinkers, Ricky Gervais being an obvious case, but John Cleese, another one, okay, absolutely fascinated by evolutionary thought, is because it's a gateway to complexity. It's a gateway to thinking in terms of complex systems and complex systems changing over time, and it's an escape from the idea that there must be universal laws. I have a friend called Jagbala, known on the web as Hanging Noodles, who always argues that we monotheistic cultures, like Christianity, have a disadvantage in our thinking because, unlike Hindus, we're prone to what he calls monotheism. We need one theory to explain everything. Okay, and he points out that actually in Hinduism, we don't have that problem because we're used to the fact that there's, the elephant and the. I think he said it's Mother Praised on an altar which has an elephant, a monkey, and Jesus on it.
Right.
There's no inherent contradiction to that. Now. Actually, that's why I'm quite hopeful about having a Hindu Prime Minister, because I think if we unleashed his lack of monotheism and freed him from political dogma, he could be creatively really quite interesting. But that complexity thing is really interesting, because one of the things that you need to lose in order to understand complex systems is an idea of what you might call discussing things that make you look important. One person called it the higher problem. And that's I noticed this with the former chief executive. If he was interviewed, instead of talking about advertising, he'd always talk about like the Fed and Janet Yellen, and likely interest rate rises, okay? Right? And that's that's a self-important thing to talk about. Weirdly, people in Britain, instead of solving British problems, somehow weirdly adopt American.
It's a signalling thing.
And it's a signalling thing, which is, I care about these things, and I'm so important that I'm only going to debate them at the very highest level. Okay? And so, there are all these people, you can go right down to defund the police in the United States. I'm a Brit, right? First of all, my responsibility for what I think is a terrible criminal justice system in the United States, my responsibility for that ended in 1776, okay? I don't think it's great, but it's not my problem, okay? Secondly, I wanted to start some Brits demonstrations going around going, disarm the police. Because it's what's so interesting is if you're American, just defund the police is debatable. The idea that the police shouldn't carry guns is probably to them so bizarre that they think you're insane, okay? Other things in the United States, 4 weeks of paid vacation. Okay? I've never met anybody in Britain so right-wing that they think we should have less holiday time. Nobody. Zero. Nobody's ever said, well, you can have 2% on GDP growth if we just got rid of people's holiday. It doesn't happen. Never exists. Okay?
We cut maternity leave down to
Yes,
just 2.5
exactly.
weeks.
No. Those things, actually, once you have them, they're air fryers. They're Japanese toilets. Once you have them, there's no going
Everyone's
back.
an evangelist.
Exactly.
Grandfathered
Yeah.
in.
Once you've got there, you never go back.
Yeah.
Okay. I'm kind of going, first of all, you have to, now, if you look at what Darwin did to have what is probably one of the 5 biggest insights, to be honest, I'm going to stand up for Alfred Russel Wallace, not least because I was born in Lumbaddock, which is the same village that he was born in, tiny Welsh village. And my ambition is to be, I think I've probably already succeeded, is the second best evolutionary thinker born in Lumbaddock. I think that's a kind of attainable, sensible ambition. Okay. But I'm really worried that someone will prop up, Imperial College London and places
Some fledgling evolutionary psychologist from Lumbaddock.
Exactly.
Christ.
Yeah. And it was very sweet because I spoke at the Royal Institution and I made the prediction that I was probably only the second person from Lumbaddock ever to have spoken at the Royal Institution. And sure enough, I think Alfred Russel Wallace spoke there in sort of 1860, whatever it was. It's right into the 20th century, actually. But if you look at what Darwin did and what Russel Wallace did, okay, they didn't get involved in self-aggrandizing theory first. They went around interesting, funny little places and they looked at the beaks of finishes, okay? Now, I think if you want to solve political problems, actually, this is why I love working in advertising, okay? Because you can get down into the weeds of microscopic things like what's the effect of choice architecture on property selection or indeed dating websites. You can actually, we have a kind of mantra in our behavioural science practice, which is dare to be trivial. Because our argument is, in a complex system, quite often the things that make a difference may be surprisingly small. They're kind of butterfly effects. And your job is to look for the point of intervention in the system where the smallest change has the biggest effect. Buckminster Fuller called it trim tab. Okay? On his gravestone it says, call me trim tab. And the trim tab, I'm not an engineer, but it's the bit on the end of a rudder, I think, on a ship or plane, which only moves slightly, but it's the greatest point of leverage in terms of turning that ship. It's like an extra rudder on the end of a rudder or something.
Okay, yeah.
And my point is that we have, and I had an argument with someone who was, I think he was the political correspondent of the FT, and I said, when John Major, a lot of your listeners will be too young to remember this, but I'm always conscious of this. I find myself doing things like now explaining what a fax machine. But when he invented the Cones hotline, he was widely ridiculed for that. Okay, so he invented this thing which was a phone number where you could report cones that were blocking off the road where no roadworks were being performed, and you could also say, you could also get advance warning of where cones were going to be. Now, at the time he came up with that, he was the Prime Minister. Okay, and this was regarded as the most comical and absurd thing you could possibly imagine.
Like everyone was being tyrannised by roving bands of cones.
But on the other hand, he was solving a problem which is like potholes, which annoys a great number of people all the time. Okay, and it was non-controversial, but it was considered absolutely beneath his dignity. Well, my argument is that probably the way you solve big problems is by tinkering around with a lot of small things, and then sometimes the big problems just weirdly go away. Okay? I think that tackling problems head-on is usually counterproductive, but the argumentation tendency that people want to win an argument rather than solving a problem, first of all causes this tribal polarization, which means that people very rapidly then start saying, I won't actually argue for what's good, I'll argue for whatever path of action most annoys my opposing tribe.
Correct, yeah. It's not what's most effective, it's what signals that I am a acolyte.
Yes, I'm a devoted, unquestioning acolyte of this particular...
Let me give you this idea. I've come up with this idea of the unreliable ally. So if I know one of your views and from it I can accurately predict everything else that you believe, you're probably not a serious thinker because you've put your entire world ideology on as a onesie.
Incidentally, Dominic Cummings' great insight was he said that effectively the language of left or right is a is a tribal convenience for people who are into political cosplay. Okay,
Correct.
It's rather like, okay, most people are kind of interested in politics in the way that I'm interested in Star Wars, which is I'll watch it if it happens to be on, but I'm not going to go to a convention and dress as Darth Vader. Okay, and politics is full of the kind of people who dress up as Darth Vader and get unbelievably involved in insane details of how the Federation is actually the governance of the Federation. Okay. Most people aren't like that. The other inside of Dominic Cummings was he said most people in reality are both more left wing and more right wing than politicians fully understand. So ordinary people in a way are saner and more diverse politically than the people who've been forced to take sides.
Yeah, they get reduced down to a dashboard, though, right? And that isn't able to fully capture. One vote from somebody doesn't fully encapsulate just how far right and how far left you are, because on balance, you aggregated that you are a bit left, so you voted Labour, or you are a bit right, so you voted Conservative. This idea
So
of
avoiding that identitarian thing, I mean, I wrote for the Spectator partly because the weird thing is, it would have been complete. Actually, no, that's not fair. Okay, actually, that's not fair. I was going to say that in the 1970s it would have been the opposite, where the right-wing press got much more annoyed about you writing something left-wing than vice versa. Actually, that's probably not fair of the British. Very interesting, by the way, which is if you're American, okay, there's quite a simple narrative which you can reasonably believe, which is that most progress socially, not necessarily economically, but most social progress happens under a democratic regime. Okay, so you go back to say votes for women. That was my cousin Woodrow, who was bizarrely like my fourth cousin twice removed. His mum was English, from a Scottish family. Okay, just to even things out, my other traced American relative is in prison in Washington State for kidnapping and attempted murder. So swings and roundabouts, right?
Yeah.
The interesting thing there is that most of those kind of forward movements, the civil rights movement, etc., happened under a regime. Okay, and so it's very easy if you take the American narrative on board, which is basically they're these well-intentioned Democrat people who do nice things, and then Republicans tend to be nasty. Okay, I don't think that maps very neatly onto the UK. Okay. So if you look at the UK, Votes for Women was actually a Conservative government. The NHS was set up undoubtedly by a Labour government, but actually on the recommendations of Beveridge, who was a Liberal. Okay, I think same-sex marriage was Conservative government. I think the legalisation of, by the way, if you go back, the Guardian supported the South in the American Civil War. Okay, the Spectator, a right-wing publication, was about the only publication in the UK to support the Union against the Confederacy. The Spectator in the 1960s, okay, was known as the Bugger's Bugle for its campaigning for the legalisation of homosexuality. Okay, and another force that was absolutely decisive in that campaign was bizarrely the Church of England. So there's, well, not that bizarrely, I suppose, if you consider the number of homosexuals in senior church positions.
God.
Okay, no. At the time, no, there were quite a few, trust me, okay? But I mean, actually, there was an Archbishop of Canterbury at some point in the 60s who kind of needed protection because of his position on that matter. If you want to see a really advanced group in terms of being ahead of the curve on anything, it's the Quakers. I mean, if you're an empiricist, everybody would become, what we really need is Quaker revival, okay? But the thing is, you can't have a demonstration, can you? As a Quaker, what do we want? Okay, it doesn't really work. But my point is that actually, if you look at the British social progress, the anti-slavery campaign, as some of them were Tory, okay, Shaftesbury was. It's actually British progress is much less easy to kind of stereotype than in the United States. And so, you actually look at the history of different publications and their opinions on different things. The idea, actually, which my kids seemed to absorb, which was everything was horrible until left-wing people came along and made it better.
Yeah, it was a civilizing force.
This force of history thing is kind of a bit borne out, I have to say, in the it's complicated, obviously. It's a bit, you could say, well, there is some empirical evidence for that in the United States. Although you had a Democratic Party which was completely weird, while the South was overwhelmingly Democrat, you had that kind of weird unholy alliance thing going on. But it's not really safe. And this business of taking American concerns because they're the most important, because it's America, okay, and getting wildly excited about them in the UK, even though our problems are different, okay? So I'll give you just a very simple example of this, which is, if you talk about white privilege, okay, I'm to some extent the beneficiary, inarguably, of exactly that. But the only point I make is that one of the reasons I'm white, okay, apart from the obvious ones, one of the reasons I'm white is I was born in the UK in 1965, when I think, someone correct me on this, the population of the UK was 97% white, okay, in 1965. So, the odds that I'm going to be white, it's not a situation like the United States where you've had generations of people effectively unfairly disadvantaged. Okay, the people who are disadvantaged hadn't arrived at the point when I was being born, to the most part. Okay, now as a consequence, simply transplanting American history and American preoccupations and American narratives and imposing them on Australia, the UK, France, okay, doesn't really work. And yet these people do it because they want to identify themselves with the highest profile, biggest debates de nos jours, so they can take sides. And that's completely inimical to, we've got other things to be guilty of if we're Brits, let's be honest, okay? It's very interesting, actually. I had a great aunt who was an anthropologist called Beatrice Blackwood, who spent her life kind of connected to the Pitt Rivers Museum. And her diaries survive, and sometime in about 1923, she went to Memphis, I think it was Memphis. Okay, I thought that was really interesting to see. How does fairly, obviously she's an anthropologist, fairly conventional English woman of 1923, upper middle class family. How does she react to going to the American South in the 1920s? And I thought her reaction would be, gosh, this is really, tiny bit, it's a bit dodgy, it's a bit off. She was absolutely horrified. I mean, there's just these pages of her raging against the fact that she wasn't even allowed to visit a black household because they wouldn't allow her in because if word got out that a white woman had been in their house, there'd be trouble. Okay, now, yeah, we got loads of flaws over here which we can solve and we can look at, but I don't think there's a wonderful case from your part of the world, isn't there? Which is a battle where the pubs refused to deny access to coloured servicemen when they were billeted somewhere in the northeast, isn't it?
Not sure.
Are you a monkey hanger? Are you or?
Technically a smoggy,
Oh, you're smoggy,
as
okay.
it's referred to.
The American audience at this point is completely
Teesside,
flipped off.
Middlesbrough,
Got it.
where
Yeah.
ICI, a huge big industrial plant
Got it.
that spews out all manner of smoke is.
But I mean, different countries, the situation in Canada is fundamentally different from the situation elsewhere. And the idea that you have to solve problems by basically looking to the United States and then just importing wholesale, whatever happens to be the fashionable topic du jour over there, seems to me crazy. If I were in the US, I'd be competing anyway for 4 weeks paid vacation, which would benefit everybody.
Yeah, that seems to be the vanguard of social change. Should be paid vacation and a bit more maternity leave.
The only person who suggested that was Bernie Sanders, and everybody thought he was some sort of communist.
Well, I'm not sure if it was just because of that they thought he was a communist, but there may be other reasons as well. One of my favourite stories that I've learned over the last couple of years about David Ogilvy that I never got a chance to talk to you about was when Fortune published an article and titled it "Is David Ogilvy a Genius?" I asked my lawyer to sue the editor for the question mark. Is there any truth in that?
Gosh. Funnily enough, he's an interesting case in point because he's a university dropout, okay, so he didn't have a degree. When he started the agency, he was former chef, failed tobacco farmer. I think during the war he'd been in MI6 somewhere in Washington as well. He was kind of Ian Fleming character in many ways, actually. Ian Fleming, by the way, was also successful in a sense relatively late in life. And by the way, we need more of these stories because you can it's never too late. Colonel Sanders, was 65 when he founded Kentucky Fried Chicken, as then was. Okay. And David Ogilvy was a kind of Colonel Sanders of advertising. He was relatively late, and he had the advantage of surviving for a long time. There are people within Ogilvy who think that his brother Francis, who tragically died young and was based in the UK rather than the US, was as much the brains behind the operation as David was. But I met him once, fortunately, and I knew his wife quite well, his widow now. And yeah, I think he had some advantages, okay? So he was doing advertising at first for fairly aspirational products at a time of great American Anglophilia. So he was advertising Guinness, Rolls-Royce, Schweppes, the English Tourist Board, for example, which allowed him to do a particular style of kind of urbane, aspirational advertising at a time when most American advertising was quite crass.
Yeah, it was to an educated audience. It could work out the inference.
I mean, famously, that Rolls-Royce advertisement at 60 miles an hour appeared only twice, and it was in the Wall Street Journal.
What was that?
At 60 miles an hour, the louder sound in this new Rolls-Royce is the ticking of the electric clock. What is it that makes the Rolls-Royce the best car in the world? There really is no magic about it. It is simply patient attention to detail, says an eminent Rolls-Royce engineer. I even memorised the subhead. But it's he was very the one thing everybody can learn from him is writing, and he is closest, I think, as a prose writer. If you read his books, one of his books is terrible, weirdly, which I think is called Blood, Brains and Beers, his autobiography. The rest of the books are excellent. I think everybody's allowed one bad book, but it's a wonderful prose style, very similar to Conan Doyle, in that it's very, very simple and easy to read, with every sort of 57th word being a slightly more complicated or slightly more highfalutin word, just to remind the reader that the writer isn't an idiot. And I think it's actually a great approach to communication, which is that little signalling of, in the Rolls-Royce advertisement, if you are too diffident to drive a Rolls-Royce, you can drive a Bentley. He actually says you have a Bentley with a less kind of grandiose radiator grille, effectively. And and so he was. It was actually. It's probably actually. Other people who are big fans of that kind of prose. Kingsley Amis was a big admirer of Conan Doyle, and it's a particular way of writing which is incredibly easy to read, but at the same time really intelligent and quite urbane.
What I really loved about at least my research that I have managed to do with David Ogilvy is his approach to engendering, which you guys have obviously continued now, engendering this. There are no wrong answers, creativity kind of culture, which I think is really great.
Well, it's a huge. I was saying to some clients the other day, we make it easy for ourselves in one way, which is it's one of very few corporate. This is why I'm very interested in the comedy world. I'm very interested in other forms of anomalous economic activity, if you like, where you're actually paid to be weird. And you don't realise how rare and precious it is until you encounter management consultants, okay? Where the whole thing is kind of templated, formulaic. They recruit engineering graduates, which, by the way, is a terrible waste of engineering talent. I want engineers going and making bloody things. I don't want them bloody well producing PowerPoint decks at sort of £200 an hour. What a waste, those people could be producing, I don't know, space rockets or something, but instead they're going and producing these effing PowerPoint decks for management consulting firms. And the value of actually having... So most organisations, first of all, regard logic as a good proxy for... in other words, the course of action that has the best argument attached must be the best course of action. And what's unusual about advertising and comedy and a few other things, music obviously, I guess, is that we don't buy that. That we don't buy the idea that whatever has a good argument attached to it must be right. Because there's probably a better idea which comes from left field, which you won't arrive at through pre-rationalisation, you can only post-rationalise it. Now, that distinction, by the way, is quite interesting. I won't go into the whole thing about Charles Russell Peirce, brilliant American philosopher of the 19th century, and I won't go into the stuff about the whole thing of abductive inference being a different form of mental process. But if you look at actually quite a lot of pharmaceutical progress, okay, it actually happens backwards. Okay, it's not we have this disease, we need to cure it. Ooh, look, let's do these things. Here's a cure. Those processes generally lead to fairly actually not that reliable, tolerable incremental progress over a very long period. Now, let's not discount that because over a period of 80 years we do get better at things. The real breakthrough things happen backwards. Okay, which is Viagra, penicillin.
Yeah.
In other words, it's almost a cure for which there is no known disease, rather than a disease for which there's no.
What can we use this for? It's giving people erections.
Well, what happened was it was intended as an angina remedy, Viagra, and there are two stories about it. One of which is that the nurses noticed that when the guys came in for their kind of people on the trial, when they came in for their kind of checkup, they were sitting in a really weird way. And the other story I've heard is that at the end of the trial, they were told, well, okay, we're obviously processing the trial results, which were pretty inconclusive as far as angina went. So could you hand back any unused pills you have? To which the response in every previous trial had been, yeah, sure, here they are. And in this trial, they went, no! There's also a fascinating story, which is that a German pharmaceutical company got there first, noticed the side effect, and immediately rejected the drug, okay? Because they failed to see the opportunity to... in other words, as any angina cure that caused people to go around in a priapic state of tumescence was obviously no good as an angina medication, and they failed to see beyond it, which is that... Now, I'll tell you two other stories of this. I was talking to some other people. One of the great things about being a vice chairman is you can just go and talk to... I mean, to be honest, okay, most discussion and decision-making and argumentation is top-down. Most progress is bottom-up or horizontal. Okay, so we organise organisations in the absolute. What you need is people who know quite a bit about three different things to solve a problem, because more and more modern problems aren't problems within a specialism; they're problems that involve the combination of two specialisms. So anyway, here's an interesting one, which is a drugs company I was speaking to, giving a talk to. And to be honest, I think I learn when I give these talks to companies. Often I learn as much from them as they do from me, but they pay me, so fine. Okay, this is a case where they were looking at drugs to treat autoimmune diseases such as rheumatoid arthritis, and what happened was that some of the drugs they tested were appalling, right? Because they actually had the opposite effect. They boosted the immune system. And of course, if you've got a disease where your immune system is attacking your own body, it's the worst thing you want to do. So they put these on the shelf and go, okay, rule that out. And then someone a little while later goes, ding. If you're trying to practice immunotherapy for cancer, a drug that strengthens the immune system, that's not a bug, that's a feature. Okay? And similarly, that happened with Night Nurse, which is one of my favourite marketing stories, where they were looking, when they created Night Nurse, and this was long before there was something called Day Nurse, okay, they were looking to produce a flu remedy. And they produced a very successful, to be honest, it was treating the symptoms rather than the cause, okay? But they produced this flu treatment, so not a remedy, but a treatment, which was brilliant, but the downside was it sent you to sleep. So you couldn't drive or operate heavy machinery. I don't regularly operate heavy machinery, but it's been...
I love that warning.
Yeah, I love that warning too. Yeah. Oh, fuck, I was about to do some heavy excavating.
My
and you
afternoon
ruined
of
it.
forklift driving has been taken from me.
It's rather like that video message, which is, you mustn't show this video on an oil rig. Do you remember that?
Yeah.
At the beginning of VHS videos, it said, this is not licensed for the display on oil rigs. And you imagine those people 500 miles out of the North Sea going, oh, fuck, press the pause button.
We're about to watch Speed 2.
We're just about to watch Speed 2, and that's ruined it for us.
Yeah.
Any moment now, someone's going to turn up from the Copyright Licensing Authority, and BP are going to be in trouble. And but anyway, the fascinating thing is that what happened is they said, okay, so it's no good, it sends people to sleep. And then a little guy, I've always heard the story, a little guy, kind of from the marketing department, said, actually, if you position it as a nighttime flu remedy, okay, the fact that it sends you to sleep is a bonus. It's not a problem. So Night Nurse was born by basically reframing, and this is what I said about High Speed 2. I said High Speed 2 is a terrible answer, really, in the sense that it goes at the wrong speed along the wrong route. Lots of things are terrible about it. The whole thing was misconceived. But it was the first thing that was wrong about High Speed 2 was the question they asked. And they asked an engineering question, which is how do you transport X people over Y miles at a time of Z, T, okay, right? And so they set down those kind of mathematical parameters. Now, a marketing person would have asked a different question, which is a much more interesting open-ended question, which has far more scope for expanding the solution space to allow for creative solutions. And the question a marketer would have asked is, how do you make the train service between Manchester and London so good and so enjoyable people feel stupid driving? Now, speed, obviously, okay, speed may be part of that.
Convenience, comfort,
comfort,
enjoyability.
Connectivity, catering, okay, variation of seating. So, you remember Strangers on a Train, those Hitchcock films where they used to have the observation car at the back of the train? Fuck me. Every time you watch, this is a train in the 1950s, you go, oh God, I wish I had trains like that now. They even had a smoking thing at the back, didn't they? Now, I did have a crazy idea, which is, if you spent the money, okay, this is hypothetical, but this is why comedy is so important. It's much more easy to start silly and rein it back than it is to start boring and rein it forwards, as it were. And I said, just a hypothetical exercise, if you kept the tracks the same, and you spent all the money on both buying and recreating the world's greatest steam locomotives, right? And you ran the trains from Manchester, like your train at 9:15 will be pulled by the Union Pacific Big Boy, okay? Or the Mallard, right? Or a replica of the Mallard. Now, it would be slower, okay? I'm assuming the Wi-Fi could be quite good. You wouldn't go into full, 19th century or, mid-20th century nostalgia. But every single tourist to London would go to Manchester just to ride on the effing train, right? If you had a replica of the bloody Harry Potter train, okay? You'd actually get people coming to London so they could travel to Manchester. Yeah. If you think that's, by the way, comical, I've got a friend who's the warden of an Oxford college, a former boss of mine, and the tourist visitors to Oxford colleges basically have completely bifurcated. There are colleges which nobody visits, and there are colleges which are swarming with tourists. The entire discriminator between those two is whether the college features in a Harry Potter film.
Wow.
So New College Oxford has a tree, apparently, which is featured in one of the films, and that has tourists swarming in. Next door, you can have a fantastic college, architecturally magnificent, didn't feature in Harry Potter. Basically it's...
pointless.
It's what do you call those things that blow through the place?
Tumbleweed.
Tumbleweed.
Yeah.
Yeah.
What's your thoughts on the abandonment of this $1 billion train thing? There's something recently that's been thrown
You
up
can
in the
still
air.
solve it. You go and hand the job to I've said this. You go and hand £100 million to Johnny Ive and his mate Mark Newson. Mark Newson, Australian designer, already has form here because he designed the Qantas business class seat, which in my opinion is the best. Actually, never mind business class. It's the best airline seat ever conceived by the wit of man. And you give them the brief, okay, we've got this stupid railway going along this stupid route. How do you make it just absolutely amazing? I mean, Johnny Ive's back in the UK, right? I'm sure 100 million will get him out of bed. Okay, and you just go, okay, you're in charge of the design of the train interiors, you're in charge of the catering, the connectivity, your brief, open brief. Make this journey so amazing that people want to go on the train for the sake of the train, not for the sake of the journey. That's the brief. It's the brief that Cunard effectively had, okay? So when jet aircraft were invented, okay, the Blue Ribbon, which was that competition for how fast you could cross the Atlantic, became, to be honest, a bit of an academic exercise, because if you could get there in under a day by plane, even if you had to refuel in Gander, it didn't really matter whether the Queen Mary was faster than the bloody United States or the Normandy anymore, okay? So Cunard basically had to go, okay, we've got to stop thinking of these ships as a sort of a form of transportation, they've got to be a destination in themselves. And consequently, they kind of invented the cruise ship industry, sort of. I don't give them 100% credit, but that idea, so cruise ships, when you think about it, you board a cruise ship, you go around in a circle and you come back. I mean, you do visits and
Paying
places.
for a journey.
But actually, the cruise ship is as much of a destination as the destination is.
What
But you can do that with high speed too.
Yeah, what would you do?
Train twister is my suggestion. Solution to train overcrowding is to turn close proximity to other people from an annoyance to a source of entertainment. Okay.
A lot of intimacy concerns there.
Yeah, I did think of the legalities, but your next station is Headcorn, left hand, yellow.
Right. Okay. Yeah.
Come on.
Well, actually,
you probably have to have gender segregated.
That's a concern. It depends if you're going to Brighton or not. That might be a bonus. You've also got the issue, I suppose. I've seen a lot of the people that travel up and down. This country is getting older.
Yeah.
And I'm not sure whether you'd have to have at each different stop some sort of paramedic, perhaps, or a physio that could get rubbed down.
By the way, that is part of the appeal of the cruise ship industry to the elderly in the United States, which is you've got a doctor on board.
Right.
You've got 3 weeks where your medical care is basically taken care of.
If you tumble
Okay.
down
Yeah.
the water slide
Oh, yeah,
quickly.
it's not irrelevant. And by the way, if you're a cruise ship doctor, you're a shitting good doctor because you've got to be able to cope with everything, right? You can't
Yes,
specialise.
yeah.
If someone's on board, you're sort of 200 miles from land. You can't say, "I'm terribly sorry, it's not my specialism."
Yeah,
I need
from
to
a
refer you."
perforated eardrum to a heart.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I bet you've got to be a shit hot generalist.
What would you do to improve business class flights?
Interesting. I've got an idea for that, for short haul, which is really mischievous. You know how they always say that the biggest car company in the world, Uber, doesn't own any cars, and the biggest accommodation company in the world, Airbnb, doesn't own any houses. I've got this idea to start an airline that doesn't own any planes, okay? And this is, I did think of having a vaping airline. I did wonder about that.
Well, you can just vape on
You
board.
just vape on board. Stop that.
Like a vaping tax, a vaping surcharge.
Yeah, and you'd have to, you'd have 2 glasses, 20 milligrams at the front, 20 milligrams at the back.
Fantastic.
But I did wonder about that. But actually, my idea was you buy a country house near Stansted, okay? And every time you fly, okay, you park your car at this country house, okay? You check in your luggage, and the country house is like the party in The Wolf of Wall Street, okay, right? It's like Eyes Wide Shut, okay? It's absolute total opulence, okay? And then when you're ready to fly, you're driven in, Dr. Evil's car, which of course is an S-Class Mercedes with the windows blacked out, isn't it? Okay, which is, I don't like, it's kind of like, Dr. Evil's natural conveyance of choice. Okay, you're driven to the plane, and you walk onto a Ryanair flight, okay? And the Ryanair flight costs you 37 quid, and it costs 250 quid to use the lounge. You're a nightclub promoter, right?
Yeah.
We can go into business doing this.
I'm ready to go.
So the whole idea is, okay, the bit on the plane is only an hour, and it doesn't really matter if it's Ryanair okay. You could do a thing where you book the middle seat out, okay, so you've got a bit of space. But basically, you use Ryanair, and the whole aim is you make the airport experience amazing, where you're literally ferried to the plane. Then the plane bit, you don't try and compete because there's a limit what you can do at 30,000 feet to make it amazing.
Yes.
Well, certainly a limit to what's illegal that would make it. What's legal that would make it amazing? There are lots of illegal things I'm sure you can do. At
Would make it
30,000
more
feet
amazing.
that will make it amazing, but we'll kind of we'll draw a veil over that, shall we say?
Yeah. So we were talking earlier on about kind of this culture of creativity that you guys managed to foster and kind of perpetuate as well. I know that you've spoken to Rick Rubin.
Yes, that was fantastic.
You think a lot about creativity for yourself.
By the way, Rick asked me a question, which I'm going to ask you. He said, "Why haven't you moved to the United States?" And you have moved to the United States.
Mm-hmm.
Now, you moved to Austin, which I think is very clever.
Yeah.
Because I think Austin is actually an interesting game, which is Americans are choosing it because they want to live within a cool culture rather than the cash culture. Okay? In a sense, the status game in Austin is slightly different.
You've read that Paul Graham essay, Each City Whispers Something Different to You.
Lovely.
Yeah.
I haven't, but I will.
Yeah.
He's an interesting guy.
You go to Miami. Miami whispers to you, you are as important as the watch on your wrist or the shoes that you wear or the car that you drive.
Yeah.
Right? LA whispers to you, you are as important as
your role in
people,
the entertainment
the
industry.
people that you know and the people who know
in
you.
LA, there's a club which is only for people who don't work in the entertainment industry. Because any other club they join, they're automatically at the bottom. You can own some business, literally $1 billion business, and you can own it. But in LA, if you go to the same club as the celebs, you're basically treated like filth.
Second class.
So they have a kind of separate club for people who aren't in the film industry, fascinatingly. And LA, you're right, it whispers. London's very complicated because it's the bloody centre of everything, from government to advertising to business to.
I can't remember what you say. London whispers to you. But yeah, so
Austin also has a great advantage of being a democratic city in a Republican state.
People say that blue dot red ocean thing. I see no one that's liberal. Everybody that's there is in some degree based or conservative.
Sorry, really? Really?
That's what I see, man. I mean,
I assumed that, I assumed it was my idea of heaven, which is kind of, it's short range left wing and long range right wing. Which
That's
is
probably about
so I can go out and I can buy really good coffee made by people with interesting body art, but then in the afternoon I can drive into the desert and fire machine guns at oil drums.
both of those things are actually true. Yeah, you can. That's Austin in a
drive a
nutshell.
tank, okay?
That is Austin in a nutshell. But definitely one of the things that's
By the way,
interesting.
I absolutely adore Texas. So I've been,
So much fun.
I've been having the odd dig at, I said I've got nothing against the United States. My cousin Woodrow was president of the fucking place. But I have to say that Texas I find absolutely lovely. Now, I'm a Brit, I'm a white guy, etc. Actually, it seems to me, I've got a Texan colleague who says all Texans get on pretty well because they're all Texans. Okay, they have an identity which transcends other things. Okay. Now, Austin, you say that actually you find oddly that you don't find that kind of blue dot.
Well, I don't know, man. It's just I don't know how much of it's
I love
selection.
visit that, but I love Houston, I love Dallas.
I don't know how much of it's a selection effect because the people that I'm around are going to be people who have maybe achieved a degree of financial freedom that's caused them to lean more right or whatever. But there's definitely
And low taxes.
correct. There's definitely a freedom to and a freedom from culture. So there's a freedom to do the things that I want. There's a freedom from any of the fucking interventions of the people from Washington, etc., etc. But going back to the creativity thing, for the people who want to try and get they want to artificially inseminate their creativity muscle.
Yes.
What are some of the things that you advise the guys that you work with and the companies you work with to do to engender a creative culture?
Study biology, not just sort of physics and maths. In other words, study complex things. I have a kind of weird theory which might form a chapter in my next book, which is, in a weird kind of way, cops are better scientists than scientists are. Okay? Now, let me explain, okay? So one of the things I recommend is read a lot of true life crime. Okay? Study that kind of stuff. By the way, there's a fantastic Andrew Schultz routine on this, on his wife's propensity to watch films about serial killers.
The female obsession with serial killers is never going to make sense to me.
But can I have it as well? So it's great because my wife and I both. I think she likes it because there's a lot of psychology. I like someone gets killed. But no.
Right.
I'm only joking.
Bond over your love of true
There is a
crime.
really interesting thing about reading about true life crime, which is it's one case where you get an extraordinary amount of detailed study into the life. If you've read those, books about, say, Peter Sutcliffe and his family, you get an extraordinary amount of detail into a family which, in many cases, is completely ordinary, except for obviously the outlier that somebody kills somebody or a lot of people. So that, you do get that weird thing, which is a very deep study, not into a major historical figure, except in the worst possible sense. No, it is interesting. But what it is about detective work is you're kind of working. Okay, there's a Conan Doyle piece. So I actually, funny enough, one of the sources of my creativity was obsessively reading Sherlock Holmes short stories as a fairly young kid. Okay, my behavioural science thing was probably weirdly reading Aesop, who is really the first behavioural scientist, even though he lived in the 6th century BC. Jesus was also a pretty good behavioural scientist. If you look at it, the parable of the lost sheep is basically loss aversion. Okay, you have really interesting things like the parable of the vineyard is perceived equity. Actually, there's a hell of a lot of behavioural science in Jesus. Seriously, so that's my third book. There's that book Jane Austen was a game theorist. Okay, there's a fantastic book. My book's going to be my third book going to be Jesus was a behavioural economist.
Right. I wonder how that one's going to go.
Yeah, I don't know how that's going to go down, But actually, what Conan Doyle talks about through the mouthpiece of Sherlock Holmes is this business of reasoning backwards. And he said that everybody knows how to reason forwards. This has happened, so this is going to happen next. And it's the natural mode of thinking. Reasoning backwards is not actually that difficult to do, but most people don't do it. And that is, if you think about a work of detection, it's this thing has happened. Now we have to find out what were the pre-existing conditions that led to this outcome. And in advertising forward-thinking creativity, it's we want to get to this place. In the words of Roger L. Martin, a very brilliant business guru, what would have to be true for this to come about? I think that's the question, by the way, a lot of political movements don't ask. They have a hypothesized ideal future, okay? And they don't subtly ask the question, okay, what needs to happen between now and, in other words, play the hand you're dealt. We happen to be here. We want to get there. Let's not just ignore where we are and immediately, effectively fantasize into existence a perfectly neat society, because change doesn't work like that. You have to start where you are. You have to play the hand you're dealt.
Yes.
And it's very, very easy to say, why did it take them so long to, give votes for women, etc., etc. But actually, if you look at the reality of it, these things take time. And also, persuasion is slower than legislation, but it's persuasion that actually makes things work.
Have you got the?
So I'll just make that distinction in regard to drink driving. Okay, the breathalyzer, penalty points, license bans for driving. For Americans, we don't have a distinction between driving under the influence and driving while intoxicated. If you're basically intoxicated, you lose your license. Okay. The legislation sort of worked, but a lot of people in my parents' generation thought it was a bit naughty to get caught over the limit. My parents didn't drive drunk, I just want to absolve them of that. But some of their contemporaries did, and my parents wouldn't stop someone leaving the house if they had too much to drink. They'd encourage them to stay, but they wouldn't grab their car keys. Now, when something makes its way from being imposed to being adopted, what you see in my children's generation is they would wrestle one of their friends to the ground before they got into a car over the limit.
So America is so different to this.
I know.
So different. The attitude of Americans to people that drink drive is like, you'll be at some bar or something. We're going to go to such and such a place. Do you want to come? Oh, right, okay, brilliant. Presuming that there's an Uber waiting outside and someone gets into the Ford F-150.
No.
You go, I've just watched you sink 3 margaritas over the last hour, and no one really bats an eye. I saw this amazing video. I'll find it in a
LA is like that as well.
LA?
Yeah. Uber has probably reduced this to some degree, but the extent to which people used to drive around LA intoxicated.
Half cut.
My brother-in-law, who lived there for quite a few years, just couldn't get his head around it at all.
There was a great video of when they first introduced the you can't drink and drive. Drink and drive, not drink then drive. You can't drink and drive. And they're talking to these guys and girls from the deep south in America, and they're all in beat up Chevy trucks or whatever, and they're interviewing them through the window. And this dude sat there, and there's another one with a woman who sat there, child on passenger seat without seatbelts on, beer between legs, saying, I don't know what this country's coming to, that a guy can't finish his hard day at work and have a beer when he's on his way home. This country's being run by communists. These goddamn commies trying to take our beers away from us. I'm like, you're drinking and driving.
Literally,
drinking and driving at the same time.
thing I think in New Orleans, or certainly in Louisiana, I think isn't it, where you can actually have drive-through margarita stands.
Phenomenal.
So you literally put a margarita in your cup holder. Yeah?
Nothing in America is beyond being drive-throughable. The bank, CVS, fucking margaritas, everything is drive-throughable.
That, by the way, I never answered Rick Rubin's question, why I never moved to the United States. And there are two reasons, one of which is I'd probably make $1 million, but then I'd start shopping at Whole Foods and I'd be back to where I started. Right. So the one thing I can't get my head around...
fucking individual Malthusian trap that you've got yourself into.
We had this LA guy who came over, and he was an LA creative guy, wonderful guy, and he was in raptures about Waitrose. Now, this won't be funny to an American audience, apologies, okay? He said, the food is such good quality and such reasonable price. Okay. And you suddenly realise he'd grown up on Whole Foods or Bristol Farms or those LA.
Yeah.
And it's completely bipolar, American grocery retail. German grocery retail is all about price, really.
Yep.
Okay. American grocery retail, British grocery retail is really all about brand, actually. Quite interesting. And then you have American grocery retail, which is just like you have a choice between two absurd extremes. It's like having first class and standing room only.
Yes.
It's kind of weird.
I think what happens with British supermarkets is that they are woven into the class structure as well.
Yeah.
Right?
The
Little...
class system isn't all bad, Let me explain this, okay? One thing which I think is problematic about the British class system, but is also quite nice, okay, is you do reach escape velocity relatively soon, okay? If you prove yourself reasonably successful materially, okay? So, okay, this is a total stereotype, okay? But if you're a Brit, you're going to do this, right, okay? You're going to come back to Britain with some money, which I hope you made in the colonies, okay? Right.
Slowly
And you're going to buy
exporting,
the old rectory in Minchinhampton, a flat in London. You'll have a Range Rover, a Labrador, a wife called Polly, and 2 children at private school.
A membership to Soho
A
House,
membership to Soho
Cotswolds,
House.
yeah.
But basically at that point you can stop, okay? Because anything more than that is actually evidence that makes you suspicious. You're probably a drug dealer. If you've got a private jet or something like that, people go, it's probably up to no good.
Yes,
Okay,
yes.
it's probably a bit shady. It's
Yeah.
not really respectable.
Yeah.
And so there is that kind of weird thing, probably, which is the royal family sumptuary laws, which is because we had a royal family who actually, in many ways, their pleasures until recently were extraordinary, walking around muddy fields in Wellington. Okay.
Yeah, there's a culture of sort of elite modesty in
Yes.
some ways in the UK. Look at a Land Rover Defender.
Yeah.
It's every single person.
I have a weird thought in the car market, which is once you produce the electric Land Rover Defender, there can be no more prestigious vehicle than that, in a weird way.
Why?
Because it's hard to explain. The Land Rover Defender is unbelievably beautiful, by the way. The latest iteration of it is fantastic. If you made that electric and therefore, you've got a big, tough, versatile vehicle, big, heavy thing with a huge battery, quite a lot of range, the performance is going to be fine, right? Because it's electric, okay? And generally, it doesn't matter what the electric car is, the performance is going to be great, okay? If you had the money, why would you have any other vehicle, okay? And the only other vehicle I can imagine, by the way, is will a proportion of... So as a Georgist, I believe that there should be a single land value tax. And I believe that an awful lot of technology exists so that people can escape from the rent-seeking depredations of landlords and landowners. And that's one of the great advantages of places like Texas, okay? You've got a super abundance... Because Austin, like, say, Vegas or, like, say, Phoenix, okay, they were basically built after the car was invented, okay? So living 8 miles from the centre of Phoenix doesn't matter because you can just drive in.
Retrofitted to have the automobile.
Well, in Phoenix, do you ever go there? Phoenix, Scottsdale, Santa Fe is a fantastic...
I'm going to Scottsdale in a couple of weeks' time for the
You
first
want to stay at
time.
the Hotel Valley Ho?
Okay.
It's kind of hotel where the Rat Pack would have hung out. It's really, really cool.
Okay.
Okay. But I absolutely love the place. Now, bear in mind, okay, as a Brit, okay, the 2 most pointless cities in the United States to visit are New York and San Francisco because they're a crap attempt to recreate a European city. Okay? Whereas Brits love places like Austin or Houston or LA or Chicago because they're really different. They allow you to have a completely different life to the life you'd have in London. And I'm going to make an accusation, okay? Deep down, everybody wants to live in suburbia, okay? But in Britain, living in suburbia isn't cool. But if you live in LA, you can go and buy effectively a suburban house, up in the kind of, just off, what's that place called? Wonderland, the valley thing that goes up towards the Mulholland Drive.
Yeah.
You can basically live in a glorious suburban house, and because it's LA, it's totally cool. Okay, so that's one of those little games. You see, if you move to Bexley Heath, your friends would start disowning you, right? If you move to LA and buy a nice suburban house, totally different.
Yeah. So I was thinking about the rebrand. It's speaking about that sort of West Coast phenomenon. This rebrand of Twitter to X. What's your assessment of...
It's a very weird thing to do because I would wait until he creates the Everything app before you rebrand it.
Yeah.
That's what seems strange to me.
Bundles, Neuralink, and SpaceX.
Bundle
and...
payment vehicles. I mean, if he build, I'll forgive him everything if he builds in a content payment mechanism to Twitter.
How do you mean?
There is a fundamental... There are lots of holes in the ecosystem, the digital ecosystem, which haven't been plugged because they're natural monopolies, and therefore it's very difficult for them to reach critical mass as network goods unless they have monopoly status. Now, looking at the Royal Mail, which is the first real network good, the penny post, technically, not the Royal Mail, okay? The penny post was an extraordinary thing because there'd been 1 penny postal services in London for about 150 years. And this guy, Roland Hill, with the mathematical help of Charles Babbage, i.e. the kind of inventor of the computer and one of the 10 greatest mathematicians of his time, managed to do the maths to say, actually, you can scale this up to a national and subsequently an imperial level. So there was an imperial penny post in 1910 or whatever. So
Mail somebody in Australia or something.
it didn't include Australia and New Zealand. You had to pay extra for them.
But India.
But it included India. So when Ramanujan wrote to G.H. Hardy in Cambridge, he paid a penny for the letter.
Wow.
Okay? Now, the mathematics there is to say that in a network, of the postal kind of network, the efficiencies in trunk routes, in other words, the cost per mile when you're transporting 50,000 letters at a time, the cost per mile is so low that all the costs basically are in collection, sortation, and then last mile delivery. So as a consequence, the distance is actually more or less irrelevant to the cost of carriage, and therefore we can have a flat rate for postage. And it required Babbage to do the maths to prove it worked. Even then, it lost money for the first few years because people weren't in the habit of writing to people 500 miles away because they didn't know anybody.
It takes time to develop the
It takes some
brand.
time. It's a bit like if you own the world's first fax machine, it's not really very useful.
Yeah.
Okay. And I think there are lots of things, and I think two of them are a locker system for e-commerce delivery, and what the government should do is basically license a monopoly for 10 years. And say, okay, if you offer an open access locker system, we'll give you 10 to 15 years of Schumpeterian rent from your monopoly, okay? And by the way, it has to be open access so that local shops, I can ring up a local shop in Sevenoaks, okay, and say, can you drop off a copy of this book in my locker or in this locker, sometime this evening after you shut, right? Not just e-commerce, but actually all forms of local commerce and indeed peer-to-peer sending. If I want to send something to my dad, if there's a locker in his village, he's 93, I can basically pop it in my locker and be sent to his, because then you remove the last mile cost of delivery, which is causing environmental costs, it's causing transportation congestion, and it's not ultimately scalable because, as I spoke to someone at P&G about the subscription model for things like razors, they own Gillette, right? And they said, the problem with this model is it works at a limited extent, but if we bought everything that way, our homes would turn into a delivery hub. Your house becomes a logistics hub, and every time you open the window, it's beep, 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 beep. Okay, it just doesn't make sense. At ultimate scale, it doesn't
What's
make
this got
sense.
to do with Twitter and X?
Right, okay. So there's a similar problem, which is with micropayments for... Now, I've got a friend called Dominic Young, who's in a company called Axate, which is also looking at this problem, which is most people don't want to subscribe to most content, okay? Pay to subscribe. Okay. Now, there isn't a single case. There may be one case in like Finland. Okay, but that's it. There's barely a single case in the world of a tabloid newspaper making a success of the subscription model. What Twitter could do is launch a micropayment system where I keep like 20 quid of my Twitter balance, and every time I want to read an article I do subscribe to the New York Times, but I don't subscribe to the Wall Street Journal, and I bugger if I'm going to subscribe to the FT, right? Because the FT, there are lots of articles in the FT I'd pay £1 to read, but I'm not paying 35 quid a month or whatever. I mean, most people claim the FT, I guess, or at least it's tax deductible. Okay. But also, the FT, there's a psychological thing going on here, which is that there are certain things in the FT which I would love to read. There's some fantastic journalists there. This guy called Garnish, something or other, brilliant guy. Okay, but equally, if I pay 40 quid a month for the whole of the FT or whatever it costs, that's 500 quid a year, right? Okay, well, I feel that 70%, 80% of that money is going to produce articles on the prospects for central banking reform in Ecuador, which are of no interest to me at all, right? Not that just to FT readers, but nonetheless, okay, I don't want to pay for the stuff I don't want. And it's a psychological thing. Even if the net value to me of each of those articles added together might add up to £20, I'm not paying for the whole thing because I feel I'm paying for a lot of value that other people are getting, but I'm not.
So if you centralise the payment ability through Twitter,
So
you could then distribute
I
this.
keep a Twitter balance at 20 quid or $20, and I go, well, that FT article looks a bit interesting. I'll pay 50 cents to read that.
Yeah.
Now, you can really monetize high quality, and the same goes for video content, by the way. The same could go to musical content, okay? Although Spotify's made that work fairly well. But I think for high quality journalism in particular, but equally tabloid journalism, the people who buy The Sun buy it in the way you buy chocolate or crisps or a pack of cigarettes. Like
Next
an
to the-
impulse bar,
yeah, it's next
to the
to
till,
yeah.
and you go, oh, I feel like a bit of a treat. I'll buy a copy of the Super Soar Away Sun, and it's XP, and then you take it with you. Those same people do not want it. Just as there are people who will only have pay-as-you-go mobile phones, even if they would be better off on a contract.
Yeah.
Okay, I won't buy a train season ticket because my argument is there are 2 days of the week where I don't take the standard journey. Now I might actually save money overall on the 3 journeys I do take, but it pisses me off that I'm getting proportionately worse value than the people who travel in 5 days a week, but I'm still paying the same. So that feeling of pissed offness prevents me from subscribing to a season ticket, and it prevents me from subscribing to a lot of publications where I would give them 10 quid a month if it was pay-as-you-go.
So would you, if you had been Elon...
Also, by the way, if I subscribe to every publication, that I think I subscribe to the Atlantic, I think I subscribe to the New Yorker, but let's add, Wired, New York Magazine, let's add
New Statesman.
Harper's, the New States, okay. I do subscribe to the Spectator, I write for the Spectator, so that's obviously...
Should have got a freebie.
Exactly, and I subscribe to the Times and the Telegraph, I think, okay, and then I read...
You're probably accumulating, what, at least a grand a year?
Well, this is the point, that I've basically reached peak subscription, okay?
Subscription saturation.
So in other words, there is a limit to the number of direct debits people are prepared to have.
Yeah.
And therefore, you cannot grow the market for paid high-quality content or paid entertainment content.
I'll tell you what's an interesting business that I found out about recently. I think it's called Rocket Reach. And this company, they go through... Maybe you link them to your bank or something. I don't really know how it works. But they go through and they look at all of the debits that you've got that are kind of lapsed or pointless or fucking something like that, and they get rid of them. Yeah. So if you've been Elon,
by the way, I would also add legislation here, which is it is too difficult to cancel a recurring credit card payment. I was paying for Club Penguin for my kids, where I was picking them up pissed from all bar one, at 1 o'clock in the morning. Okay, I was still paying for Club Bloody Penguin. Now, I mean, I probably had a little sneaky visit to. No, I didn't. Don't worry. I did not go on clubbing. The only time I went on clubbing as an adult is my children, when they were younger, would make me play the games to earn points to decorate their igloo.
Fantastic.
So they'd outsource to me to get me to play the games.
Dad, go to work, please, virtually.
Yeah, I'm not doing anything else. I don't want to end up in the nonsense wing of Wakefield Prison. Okay, I'm not going on for any other purpose.
Fucking hell. Look, let's get back to
Okay,
X.
sorry.
Get back to X. If you'd been Elon, would you have waited until you were able to bundle everything underneath? Right.
Yeah, because there's too much equity in that. Everybody refers to it as Twitter brackets X.
Yeah.
There's a hell of a lot of equity in that. It made perfect sense as a name. You had a tweet.
Tons of
It's a
brand
very, very bizarre decision of Elon's. I mean, undoubtedly, I mean, the most bizarre feature of Elon, okay, if I may say so, which is if you take a comedic viewpoint, one of the great things you do, you take this sort of Darwin mentality where you look at little things and suddenly you discover these absurdities everywhere. And Elon's greatest absurdity, okay, is he's in favour of driverless cars but manned space travel. Now, I don't want to be rude, okay? What he means by manned space travel is people who have no obvious aeronautic ability should be able to project themselves as humans into space. But cars, which obviously benefit from being driven by a human, have to drive around autonomously. Now, I don't want to be rude, but isn't that the wrong way around, okay? Shouldn't cars be driven by people and spacecraft be autonomous? I don't want to be,
How much input do the humans in spacecraft have now?
None. My brother is an astrophysicist. If you want to get astronomers and astrophysicists absolutely driven to a point of apoplexy, just mention manned space travel, okay? Because they regard it as, per dollar spent, an extraordinarily bad way of discovering things about the universe.
You should just be robots.
It was described by one colleague of my brother's as spending $300 million to find out how mice wank in zero-G. The kind of experiments you performed on manned space travel are kind of absurd compared to something like a space telescope or something of that kind.
Right.
Whereas if you look at what those probes do, that the non-human probes,
like stuff bring it back.
It's just that's just joyous, absolutely joyous. However, I do have a colleague in the advertising industry, Trevor Beattie, whose lifetime dream has been to go into space, and I think he's done this with Virgin. I get it.
What is it now? 250 grand?
I think that was it, yeah. And and all credit to him, he's not some rich dilettante guy who decided it'd be cool. I mean, he's probably quite rich, but he's been an absolute lifetime space obsessive, literally since being a child. So it's perfectly good use of it. I can see why he does that.
Each time that we speak, you have become an evangelist for a new category of product. I think this is maybe your 5th or 6th time on the show.
Yeah.
Each time that we've spoken, I feel like the first time was the Japanese toilet, the second time
Air fryers.
was the air fryer.
I was the John the Baptist of bloody air fryers, I can tell you that much, right? I mean, seriously, I went to Philips, who at the time had a monopoly of air fryers. Now, this is a really interesting point for anybody who's got a business. The thing to look at a business is not just the rate of growth. Okay, you can have extraordinary rates of growth, which consist of lots of people trying something and deciding it's shit. I mean, if you compare that thing, what was that Facebook thing, Threads, right? Now, if you look at the actual data for the adoption of Threads, it was absolutely, exponential rates of insane adoption. If you go there, it's basically, it's
Fucking wasteland.
Absolute wasteland. Okay. Now the reason for that is they made it very, very easy to sign up. People didn't like it. You can't actually leave Threads because if you want to leave Threads, you've got to delete your Instagram account, which understandably people don't want to do. So that's a kind of fur-line trap. Okay. Now it looks impressive, means nothing. By contrast, there are things which grow very, very slowly at first. It's a sigmoid curve. The data you need to look at to give yourself reassurance, if that data is there, is the repeat purchase rate or the subsequent conversion to evagelism.
Yeah.
Now, not many people had air fryers. Now, I had this even... The reason I went to Philips and they didn't listen, and I said, look, trust me, you're sitting on an effing goldmine here. If you just promote your... They were the only manufacturer of air fryers at the time, okay? If you promote your air fryer and you advertise it, you can create kind of
Were
movement.
they not promoting it at all?
No, not at all. They didn't advertise it at all. I have no clue. I don't know. It drove me nuts.
Well, it's now Ninja, right? Ninja
No,
the
Ninja
incumbent.
wasn't there. Tefal wasn't there.
No, but now if you look at it-
Ninja has become the Tesla
They have.
of air
So
fryers.
I've got a 450 XL. I've got a 450.
Is that a double? Is that a double?
No, it's single.
the
It's
extra
single.
big.
Yeah, it's single,
huge.
extra big, and it goes to 450. So here's my hack. I'm sure that you've done this already. Look at me teaching the Messiah how to use his own fucking air fryer. From frozen steak, salt the shit out of it. 12 minutes either side. Slap it on a plate. Done perfectly every time.
Perfect every
so
time.
I asked. I needed to eat more red meat in my diet. Go to my dietitian. So I asked the only person I know who eats a very, very high volume of meat, Michaela Peterson, who only eats meat.
Yeah, that's a bit weird, isn't it? I mean, I have to say, okay, my attitude to Jordan Peterson is a bit the same as my attitude to Frankie Boyle, which is in small doses I quite like him, but I think he's overcommitted to a particular dogma. And I think what he says, and there are very interesting insights to be derived from him, but I wonder, there's a phrase that was used of Enoch Powell, this equally applies to people on the left, okay, which is you're driven mad by the remorselessness of your own logic, okay? And I don't think anybody should see the world through exclusively a lens of black and white, left or right, okay? I just don't think it's helpful, conducive to problem solving. An example on the left would be James O'Brien, of someone who's, I call it James O'Brien Jesuitism, which is that you're so obsessed with the rightness of your cause that you effectively construct an argument from a fairly dubious assumption and arrive at a place, and therefore you go, QED, my position on this is incontestable, okay? And what's less visible about that is that the starting point or the driving assumption or axiom of your argument isn't that great. Your argument seems wonderfully convincing. It's a bit like dating sites, okay? Every time I make... I've never been on a dating site. I don't know what dating site I'd go on in terms of, fat Welshman. There's probably a niche there, isn't there, I guess? But in any case, by the way, you mentioned that asymmetry that you said astoundingly, that in your entire time as a nightclub promoter, and as I assume, because I can't tell as a bloke, a pretty good-looking guy who was on Love Island, by the way, which is partly a WPP creation, so we can take a small amount of credit, by the way, for your incredibly deserved elevation and fame. But you've only actually been spontaneously approached by a woman 3 times, twice.
Yeah, twice. That overcoming approach anxiety for women, guys talk about how hard it is to go up to women, and that's true, that is true. But for a girl to do it to a guy, they need to swallow something else, which is that if they are rejected, they've had to overcome a social convention that is very, very embarrassing to have done. To be rejected, it's the same reason, it's the reverse reason actually of why women are shamed for women are shamed for not performing in bed in a different way to men are, but men get shamed for not always being hot to trot when the wife is. For some reason, if you as a guy, the guy is always supposed to be
That's the Jimmy Carr joke, isn't it? That men and women desire sex to the same extent. The difference is, if a woman wants sex, it actually happens. I think that's a Jimmy Carr routine.
I don't disagree. Go back to let's round out this evangelist thing. So we had a Japanese toilet. We had the air fryer.
I do take my Darwinism very literally, which is don't have a sense of proportion. Don't get worried about being distracted. Okay, I imagine on the Beagle, the guy spent 10 years of his life fucking around with earthworms. For God's sake. Okay, right.
Mustang Mach-E, which made a good Mustang Mach-E GT. What was the other thing? There was something you got for your dad, a telephone with massive buttons.
No, that was a very interesting thing, which was that the idea of designing for the disabled is actually a good business policy, even because you will actually find yourself with a target audience far larger than the one you originally anticipated.
Anyone who's got shopping in their hands.
It's rather like actually gluten-free. Okay, the number of people who are actually gluten intolerant to the extent of having celiac disease is pretty small, but there are a hell of a lot of people who are trying to avoid gluten who will also buy a gluten-free product. And in the same way, the example I would give is disability legislation mandates wheelchair ramps. They're also handy if you've got wheelie luggage. They mandate door handles rather than doorknobs because people who have bad arthritis can't use a doorknob. But actually, if you're carrying 2 bags of tea, you can open a door handle with your elbow, because when you're carrying 2 bags of tea, you effectively lost the use of your hands. And putting the shampoo bottle that opens at the top and the conditioner that opens at the bottom, you could argue that's just for people with severe visual impairment. But actually, no, because I'm in the shower. I've got severe visual impairment.
Yes.
Unless I've had your fancy laser eye surgery.
Which I can see absolutely everything.
So presumably you can see everything.
What else?
I can't see a fucking thing.
What are you evangelizing about at the moment?
That's very interesting. Actually, electric cars interest me a lot because one of the things that interests me is